The Myth of German Villainy. Benton L. Bradbury. Author House 1663 Liberty Drive, Bloomington, Indiana 47403 www.authorhouse.com. Phone 1-800-839-8640. Copyright 2012 Benton L. Bradbury. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted by any means without the written permission of the author. Published by Author House 6/29/2012 ISBN 9781 4772 3181 4, E, ISBN 9781 4772 3180 HC, ISBN 9781 4772 3183 8, SC, Library of Congress Control Number 2,012,911,498. Any people depicted in stock imagery provided by ThinkStock are models, and such images are being used for illustrative purposes only. Certain stock imagery copyright ThinkStock. Because of the dynamic nature of the Internet, any web addresses or links contained in this book may have changed since publication and may no longer be valid. The views expressed in this work are solely those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the publisher, and the publisher hereby disclaims any responsibility for them. Contents. Preface. Chapter 1 The Myth of Germany as an Evil Nation. Chapter 2 Aftermath of the War in Germany. Chapter 3 The Jewish Factor in the War. Chapter 4 The Russian Revolution of 1917. Chapter 5 The Red Terror. Chapter 6 The Bolshevik Revolution spreads throughout Europe. Chapter 7 The Nation of Israel. Chapter 8 Jews in Weimar Germany. Chapter 9 Hitler and National Socialists rise to power. Chapter 10 National Socialism versus Communism. Chapter 11 Jews declare war on Nazi Germany. Chapter 12 The Nazis and the Zionists actually work together for Jewish emigration out of Germany. Chapter 13 Life in Germany under Hitler. Chapter 14 Hitler begins reclamation of German territory. Chapter 15 The 1936 Olympics. Chapter 16 Ants class. The unification of Austria and Germany. Chapter 17 Germany annexes the Sudetenland. Chapter 18 War with Poland. Chapter 19 The Phony War. Chapter 20 Germany invades France through the Low Countries. The Phony War ends. Chapter 21 The Allied Goal. Destruction of Germany. Chapter 22 Germany as victim. Chapter 23 Winners and losers. Bibliography about the author. Preface. I served in the United States Navy from 1955 until 1977, mostly as a Navy pilot, and saw a lot of the world as a result. Aircraft carriers on which I served regularly visited European ports, as well as other ports around the world. I have also traveled extensively in the years since leaving the Navy. After traveling around most of Europe, Germany emerges as my favorite country. During our visits there, we found the German people to be pleasant, industrious, disciplined and civilized with many similarities to traditional Americans. They in no way resemble the stereotypes depicted in all the anti-Nazi movies, books and articles we have been subjected to over the years. I am 74 as I write these words. My generation grew up virtually inundated with anti-German propaganda. We were taught, quite literally, to hate the Germans as a people. Yet, Germans I have met or befriended through the years seem no different from other Europeans, or even Americans, and they seem no more inclined to violence and militarism than anyone else, if anything, less. I have never detected anything that might be considered intrinsically wrong with the German character. They are a highly cultured, highly civilized people in every respect. When studied objectively, even Germany's leaders of the 1930s and 40s were not very different from other European leaders. They were only made out to be different by the relentless hate propaganda directed against them. Germany suffered more than any other country by far as a result of World War II. Some 160 of her largest cities and towns were completely destroyed by the Allied bombing campaign, and perhaps as many as 20 million Germans lost their lives as a result of the war. Yet, no one wants to hear their tales of suffering, and no sympathy has been allowed the defeated and disgraced Germans. The anti-German propaganda has cultivated the general feeling that they got what they deserved. The entire responsibility for starting both wars and for all the death and destruction resulting from them has been assigned to the Germans, though the facts don't bear that out. Because they were the losers of both world wars, they were never permitted to present their case before the world court, nor to tell their side of the story through any medium. The winners of wars, after all, write the history books. Neither did the true story of what happened during the war come out in the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were nothing more than Soviet-style show trials which violated every standard of traditional British and American justice. Their purpose was not to discover guilt or innocence, but to spread a legal gloss over a decision which had already been made to execute Germany's leaders. The entire Nuremberg circus was a sham and a travesty. The anti-German propaganda, used to create the climate of hatred that made the massive destruction and the mass slaughter of German civilians possible, continued relentlessly long after the war was over, when it would seem natural for sober-minded historians to begin to moderate their extreme views about Germany. The fantastic atrocity stories continue even today. One needs only to tune into the History Channel to see them repeated again and again. In contrast, World War I was not long over before the atrocity stories attributed to the Germans during that war were exposed as the deliberate lies they were. Responsible men conducted thorough investigations and found that none of it was true. All the lurid stories were deliberately fabricated to win British public support for the war against Germany and also to bring America into the war. But a different factor was in play after World War II to keep the phony horror stories alive which did not exist after World War I. After the Jews exploited the anti-German world sentiment, which they themselves had largely created with their propaganda, to justify the creation of their long-sought-after State of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people. Through manipulation of the international information media, the Jews won worldwide sympathy for themselves with their sensational stories of unique Jewish suffering at the hands of the cruel Germans. They claimed that Germany had followed a systematic plan to exterminate all of Europe's Jews and that by war's end had managed to kill 6 million of them. The alleged method was to round the Jews up from all over Europe, haul them in trains to so-called death camps where they were herded into gas chambers and killed, and their bodies then burned in giant crematoria, with, conveniently, no forensic evidence of what had happened left behind. In the absence of forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, no matter how bizarre, sufficed to convict Germany and to make her the pariah of civilized nations. The judges at the Nuremberg trials were themselves not immune to the torrents of anti-German hate propaganda, and were already predisposed before the trials ever began to believe any horror story, no matter how fantastic, about the Germans. Another factor which preordained the outcome of the trials was that the accusers also served as investigators, prosecutors and final judges. The trials were also permeated throughout with an atmosphere of Jewish vengeance-seeking. Just behind the Gentile front men, most of the lawyers, prosecutors, and investigators were Jews. Hundreds of Jews who could barely speak English disported themselves in American Army officer uniforms. 2 of the 8 Nuremberg judges were Jews, Robert Falco of France, and Lieutenant Colonel A.F. Volchkov, real name Berkman, of the Soviet Union. The general prosecutor for the High Court was Dr. Jacob Mistner, a Jew. Their dominance and control of the trials was blatant. Even the hangman for the 10 Nazi leaders sentenced to death, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, was a Jew, and the hangings took place on October 16, 1946, the Jewish holiday of Purim. In the Book of Esther, the 10 sons of Haman, an enemy of the Jews, were hanged on Purim Day. According to Louis Marsacco, a wartime Hungarian journalist who wrote about the trials, out of 3,000 people employed on the staff at the Nuremberg courts, 2,400 were Jews. The Holocaust story that we all know so well today was developed during the Nuremberg trials. By skillfully cultivating and propagating this Holocaust story, the Jews have been able to extort hundreds of billions of dollars out of Germany and the United States, much of which was used to fund the new state of Israel. The claim that the Jews in Israel made the desert bloom was true. They did it with German and American money. They are now hard at work extorting more billions out of other European countries in what has been contemptuously but correctly called the Holocaust industry. Even now, more than 500,000 so-called Holocaust survivors living mainly in Israel and the United States receive lifetime pensions from the German government. And what is a Holocaust survivor? Any Jew who lived anywhere in German-controlled territory at any time during the war, whether living in a concentration camp or in the lap of luxury, is a Holocaust survivor and therefore eligible for a German pension. Moreover, any Jew who was forced to leave Europe during the Nazi era is a Holocaust survivor. Christian survivors of the war, no matter how horrific their experience, are not eligible for pensions. Show is the Hebrew word for Holocaust. It has been joked around that there's no business like show business. The entire Holocaust racket has become nothing so much as a vast shakedown of European countries, especially Germany. The Holocaust story has other uses as well. It is routinely invoked to disarm the general public from defending itself against Jewish predations. Prime Minister Netanyahu regularly invokes the Holocaust to justify Israeli attacks upon its neighbors. Keeping this gravy train moving requires the continued legitimization of Jews as history's ultimate victim group, which, in turn, requires an ultimate victimizer of the Jews, and Germany has been designated to fill that role in perpetuity. The Jewish-controlled History Channel, or the Hitler Channel, as it is sometimes derisively called, owes its success to endlessly repeating these anti-German propaganda programs. Any modification or revision of this carefully cultivated image of Germany as the evil monster of history, and particularly as the evil victimizer of the Jews, would threaten the entire Holocaust story. Therefore this image is jealously and carefully guarded by the Jewish-controlled press and information media, and woe upon anyone who dares to question it. Anyone who does so is immediately attacked and smeared as a deranged anti-Semite. The Jews are also unwilling to relinquish or even to moderate their quest for revenge. Old men who have suffered all their lives as fugitives, are still being tracked down as war criminals, and either brought to justice, or summarily murdered on the spot. They call it vengeance. The only crime these old men may be guilty of was being an officer or soldier in the German army during the war. But, why, one might ask, amidst all the carnage, death and destruction that occurred during World War II, has the so-called Holocaust emerged as the central atrocity story? Approximately 55 million people died during the war, only a tiny percentage of them Jews, surely only a fraction of the 6 million claimed. All other combatant nationalities have long since put the war behind them and have tried to make peace with their former enemies, but not the Jews. 2/3 of a century has gone by, but the Jews are still nourishing their grievances, still building Holocaust museums and memorials, at various governments' expense, incidentally, and still investigating new ways to extort money out of various countries as compensation. But why should only the Jews be compensated? Scores of millions of other people across Europe lost everything in the war. The Holocaust has evolved over the years to become the national myth of the Jewish people with all the characteristics of a religion, complete with its very own Satan, Hitler. The Holocaust myth is the glue that holds the Jewish people together as a distinct nationality, and because of that they carefully guard and protect it. As a consequence, the poor Germans are consigned in perpetuity to the role of history's evil monster, regardless of what the actual facts may be. But even if all the stories of German atrocities during Weimar were true in every detail, they would still not compare in their inhumanity to the atrocities committed against the Germans. The indiscriminate saturation bombing of German cities, the brutal expulsion of entire German populations after the war, the Allied imposed post-war deprivations, the Soviet massacres and political liquidations, simply dwarf the Holocaust in their destruction of human life and their destruction of the accumulated works of human civilization. Any final accounting and balancing of the conduct of all combatants during Weimar could only result in the exculpation of Germany as uniquely barbarous in her methods of waging war, or in her treatment of subject populations. The German people were devastated by the war, to a greater extent than any other participant, including the Jews, while at the same time they have been stigmatized as the evil, predatory perpetrators of the war. They have been made to pay a terrible price for atrocities during World War II which may never have occurred, or at least, never occur to the extent alleged. It is becoming clearer as time goes by that the Germans were the real victims of both world wars and continue to be. Chapter 1: The Myth of Germany as an Evil Nation. As the result of losing to apocalyptic world wars, Germany has acquired a reputation as the evil nation of Europe, and, perhaps the evil nation of all time. Just mentioning the word German still brings forth an image in the mind's eye of robotic, goose-stepping stormtroopers, under the command of stiff-necked Russian officers, ready to march off to inflict gratuitous murder and destruction upon their peace-loving neighbors. We have been brainwashed by relentless propaganda to regard the Germans as intrinsically militaristic, aggressive, brutish, racist and anti-Semitic, with a predilection for blind obedience to authority figures. Hundreds of Hollywood movies, relentless Holocaust propaganda, and countless books and magazine articles have permanently reinforced this negative image of Germany in the popular mind. Rational motives for the inexplicable horrors Germans are accused of having routinely committed are not required. It is axiomatic that their evil nature explains it all. Consider the movie, Schindler's List, by the Jewish director, Steven Spielberg, for example. The Nazi commandant of the concentration camp, supposedly the Plazow camp outside of Krakow, not far from Auschwitz, is standing shirtless on the balcony of his house with a hunting rifle over his bare shoulders. The rifle is equipped with a telescopic sight. In the movie, the house is located on a hill above the camp so that he can look down on the throngs of prisoners milling around in the compound below. He lifts the rifle to his shoulder and through the telescope begins casually scanning from one prisoner to another. The image through the telescope now fills the movie screen. The crosshairs of the scope stop on a randomly selected prisoner. He pulls the trigger and the prisoner drops to the ground, dead. The screen then cuts back to the Nazi commandant to show bored insouciance as he actuates the bolt of his rifle and casually raises it back to his shoulder. He fires again, and again a prisoner drops to the ground, dead. Bored with his target practice, he turns his attention to the beautiful, sexy, naked woman lying on a bed just inside the house from the balcony. The woman is purportedly one of his Jewish housemaids selected from the camp, who also apparently serves as his sex slave. His face expresses disdainful, though lackadaisical, cynicism. The point of the shootings, as well as bringing in the naked, Jewish housemaid, is to show the Nazi officer as totally depraved, without conscience, morality, or empathy for other humans, in short, a psychopath. It is presumed, of course, that the murdered prisoners were all Jews. Two popular Jewish themes are combined here, Nazi evil and Jewish persecution. This episode is entirely fictional, based on a novel by Thomas Keneally, an Australian, who only visited the concentration camps once in 1980. No such actual event as described above has ever been recorded, yet the vast majority of moviegoers swallow it whole and accept it as actual history. The real Plazow camp was located on the other side of a hill from the commandant's house, and completely out of sight from the commandant's balcony. It would have been impossible for him to shoot down into the compound as shown in the movie even if he had been inclined to do so, which is highly unlikely. The actual commandant of Plazow, Hermann Goeth, on which the character in the movie was based, lived in the house with his fiancée Ruth Calder, with whom he had a child. Ruth said that they intended to marry but were unable to do so due to the chaos at the end of the war. She had her name and the child's name changed to Goeth after the war with the help of Hermann Goeth's father. Hermann Goeth was hanged after the war by the Polish government primarily for being a member of the Nazi Party and a member of the Waffen-SS, not for shooting prisoners. Ruth described Hermann Goeth as a cultured man who had a beautiful singing voice. Goeth did, indeed, have two Jewish housemaids, selected from the camp while he was commandant, but there is no information that he had untoward relations with them. That story was only included to add spice to the movie. Another example is the movie, Sophie's Choice, by another Jewish director, Alan J. Pakula, in which Sophie and her two small children are sent to Auschwitz. Auschwitz is the holy temple of Holocaust law. During the selection process, the selection is now one of the stations of the cross of the Holocaust religion. Immediately after their arrival, Sophie is told by a stereotypically evil Nazi officer, supposedly Dr. Joseph Mengele of Auschwitz notoriety, that she can only keep one of her children and that the other must go to the gas chamber. She is forced to choose which one to keep and which one to be sent to the gas chamber, hence, Sophie's choice. The evil Nazi officer provides no reason or explanation for requiring one child to die or for forcing her to make this heart-rending choice. That he is an evil Nazi is presumed to be explanation enough. This preposterous movie was based on a novel by the American Southern writer William Styron, who had no first-hand knowledge of the camps. Auschwitz was simply used as the setting for a tale which came out of his imagination. Nothing of the sort ever happened in real life. Yet, evil Nazi stories such as these have long been a staple in Hollywood. The movie-going public has been so conditioned by this poppycock that fiction has become fact in the public mind. We have all been brainwashed to accept such absurdities without skepticism. Germans are evil, so they do evil things. No further explanation needed. Yet, Germany was not always seen in this light. The image of Germany as a sinister, predatory, warlike nation only took root in the 20th century. 19th century Germany, by contrast, was seen as a place of peace and enlightenment. The English historian, Frederick William Maitland, described the way the English people saw the Germans during the 19th century. It was usual and plausible to paint the German as an unpractical, dreamy, sentimental being, looking out with mild blue eyes into a cloud of music and metaphysics and tobacco smoke. The highly influential French writer and salon matron, Madame de Staël, portrayed the Germans during the period of the Napoleonic Wars as a nation of poets and thinkers, a race of kindly, impractical, otherworldly dreamers without national prejudices and disinclined to war. The Americans also held a benign opinion of the Germans prior to the 20th century. The American historian, Henry Cordmeyer, wrote, Whether seen in a newly united nation, Germany was united into one nation in 1871, or in this country, German immigrants in the United States. The Germans were generally regarded as methodical and energetic people who were models of progress, while in their devotion to music, education, science, and technology they aroused the admiration and emulation of Americans. In 1905 Andrew Dixon White, a noted American historian, educator, and United States ambassador to Germany, wrote just 9 years before the outbreak of World War I, Germany, from a great confused mass of warriors and thinkers and workers, militant at cross purposes, wearing themselves out in vain struggles, and preyed upon by malevolent neighbors, has become, after consolidation, a great power in arms, in art, in science, in literature, a fortress of high thought, a guardian of civilization, the natural ally of every nation which seeks the better development of humanity. The German people have historically made great contributions in every sphere of cultural, intellectual, and scientific achievement. In the field of music, there were such 18th-century geniuses as Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert and Schumann, to name a few. This musical genius continued in the 19th century with the Strausses, Mahler and Richard Wagner. There were the literary contributions of Goethe and Schiller, the historical works of Ranke and Niebuhr, the philosophical studies of Kant and Hegel, and the great scientific contributions of Alexander von Humboldt and William Conrad Röntgen. These are only a few examples of a very long list. The Prussian system of higher education and the cultural flowering which characterized Prussia during the years following the Napoleonic Wars greatly influenced both Europe and America. The American public school system as well as our university system was deliberately modeled after the Prussian public school system and university system. Germany was admired by the world as a center of learning, for its high culture and for its achievements in every field, but also for its culture of honesty, hard work, orderliness and thrift, which existed even at the lowest level of society. British scholars and journalists had been very favorably disposed toward all things German, including their history, culture, and institutions throughout the 19th century. The highly respected Cambridge historian Herbert Butterfield commented extensively on Britain's high regard for Germany. In England the view once prevailed that German history was particularly the history of freedom, for it was a story that comprised federation, parliament, autonomous cities, Protestantism, and a law of liberty carried by German colonies to the Slavonic East. In those days it was the Latin states which were considered to be congenial to authoritarianism, clinging to the papacy in Italy, the Inquisition in Spain and the Bonapartist dictatorships in militaristic France. The reversal of this view in the 20th century, and its replacement by a common opinion that Germany had been the aggressor and enemy of freedom throughout all the ages, will no doubt be the subject of historical research itself someday, especially as it seems to have coincided so closely with a change in British foreign policy. Up to the early 1900s when historical scholarship in England came to its peak in men like Acton and Maitland, words can hardly describe the admiration for Germany, and the confessed discipleship, which existed amongst English historians. And then British author Thomas Arnold, June 13, 1795, June 12, 1842, saw Germany not as a nation with a unique predisposition toward authoritarianism and regimentation, but rather as a cradle of law, virtue, and freedom, and considered it a distinction of the first rank that the English belonged to the Germanic family of peoples. The following photos and drawings represent the way in which the world saw Germany during the 18th and 19th centuries, right up to the beginning of World War I. Pre-war Germany was seen as a peaceful land of fairy tales and dreamy castles, and of industrious, law-abiding, disciplined people. A 19th century festival in a German town. May Day in Germany. German farm girls headed for the fields. Germany's positive image changes overnight. This view of Germany was to change almost overnight with the outbreak of World War I. After the war began in 1914, a grotesque image of a rapacious, bloodthirsty and uniquely aggressive Germany quickly took form and became the stereotypical image of Germany in Europe and America. This new image of Germany was the direct result of a virulent anti-German propaganda campaign conducted by the British government and later joined by the United States government, in which deliberate and systematic lies, distortions and false atrocity stories were disseminated to the British and American publics. The emotions of both the British and American publics were deliberately worked up to a fever pitch of hatred for the Hun. A pathological hostility towards all things German, which later became such a familiar and integral part of Western thinking about Germany, had its birth in this skillful propaganda campaign. After World War II, historian Harry Paxton Howard examined this transformation of Germany's reputation, which began immediately after the start of war. It was made out, he said, that Germany was not only evil but had always been that way, and that Germany, contrary to the facts, had always been the historical enemy of Europe and America. He wrote, actually, in the literal sense of the word, the biggest job of revising history was done during the First World War, when our histories were completely revised to show that Germany had always been our enemy, that Germany had started the war in 1914, that Germany had even started the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and that in the Revolutionary War we had not been fighting the British but the Hessians, not to mention such things as the Germans cutting the hands off Belgian babies, instead of the Belgians cutting off the hands of Congolese. This was a real revision of our histories which has distorted the American mind for more than 40 years. Harry Paxton Howard. All belligerents, of course, including Germany, used propaganda against their enemies, as all belligerents have done in all wars throughout history, but the propaganda efforts of Germany and the Central Powers were amateurish and ineffectual compared to the British. In their propaganda efforts, the Germans tended to appeal to reason instead of to the emotions. They never portrayed their enemies as bloodthirsty, inhuman beasts. The Allies, Great Britain in particular, by contrast, proved themselves masters at adroitly manipulating world opinion by widespread propagation of fantastic tales of German villainy. From the beginning of the war, stories of German atrocities filled British and American newspapers. American newspapers depended at that time on British news services for most of their news stories about Europe, which came across undersea cables controlled by Britain. The Germans had no access to the American media. Great Britain made sure of that by cutting Germany's 6 transatlantic cables to America. The first atrocity stories came out of the German march through Belgium at the beginning of the war. Germany's purpose was not to attack Belgium, per se, but to pass through Belgium in order to outflank French defenses and then make a drive toward Paris. This strategy was known as the Schlieffen Plan, which the Germans believed was the only way to achieve a quick victory over France. Germany's violation of neutral Belgium served as Britain's pretext for going to war against Germany, though the decision to go to war for other reasons, mainly economic, had already been made. Belgium was only a pretext. To enter the war, it was necessary to win public support, and the propaganda opportunities resulting from Germany's invasion of Belgium, as well as the fabricated stories of German atrocities in Belgium, served that purpose. Eyewitnesses were found who described hairy knuckled Huns in pickelhaube helmets tossing Belgian babies in the air and catching them on their bayonets as they marched along, singing war songs. Stories of German soldiers amputating the hands of Belgian boys were widely reported, reputedly to prevent them from firing rifles. Tales of women with their breasts cut off multiplied even faster. There were also tales of crucifixions of Allied soldiers. Europeans and Americans were more religious then than they are today, and the crucifixion stories aroused outrage. It should be mentioned that of all forms of evidence accepted in modern courts of law, eyewitness testimony is considered the least reliable. But rape stories were the favorite of all atrocity tales. One eyewitness described how the Germans dragged 20 young women out of their houses in a captured Belgian town and stretched them on tables in the village square, where each was raped by at least 12 Huns while the rest of the soldiers watched and cheered. After being fed a steady diet of this kind of propaganda, the British public veritably demanded revenge against the loathsome Hun. A group of Belgians toured the United States, at British government expense, telling these stories to Americans. Britain wanted to draw the United States into the war. President Woodrow Wilson solemnly received the group in the White House. The propaganda portrayed Britain as a knight on a white horse coming to the defense of violated, neutral Belgium. This was cynical manipulation of public opinion, of course, because if Germany had not violated Belgian neutrality, Britain would have done so without a second thought. Germany angrily denied all of these stories. So did American reporters who were with the German army and knew that they were lies. But these denials did not find their way into American newspapers. The British controlled what went into American papers, and it was the British who were generating the atrocity stories. To enhance the credibility of these fantastic atrocity stories, the British government asked Viscount Bryce early in 1915 to head a royal commission to conduct an investigation. The British government, of course, intended that Bryce would support this false propaganda, which he obediently did. Bryce was a well-known historian with a good reputation in America. He not only had served as the British ambassador in Washington, but had written several complimentary books about the American government. The British knew that he was highly respected and admired in America, and that he had a reputation for rectitude and honesty. America would believe whatever he said. Bryce was also intensely loyal to his own country and therefore perfect for the job. False anti-German propaganda poster of World War I. The propaganda poster shown at left and in the following pages are examples of the way in which the British portrayed their German foes, always as brutish, barbaric murderers of women and children. Following these British propaganda posters are German propaganda posters against the British, French and Russians. Note the different styles. The Germans do not portray their foes as barbaric murders. A German soldier cuts the hands off a Belgian child. An innocent Belgian girl about to be raped by a Hun. Following are German propaganda posters directed against the British, French and Russians. Note that the Germans use ridicule against their enemies but do not portray them as an inhuman beast. The cartoon characters represent L to R, Great Britain, France and Russia, and far right, Germany. Bryce and his 6 fellow commissioners, all lawyers, historians and legal scholars, analyzed, if you can call it that, 1,200 depositions of eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen these German atrocities firsthand. Almost all of the eyewitness accounts came from Belgians who had left Belgium for England as refugees, though some accounts also came from British soldiers in France. The commission never interrogated a single one of these eyewitnesses, but relied on their written statements instead, shades of the Nuremberg trials after the next war. Since there was a war on, there were no on-site investigations of any reported atrocity. Not a single witness was identified by name, including the soldiers who had provided written accounts. Yet, the commission officially confirmed that all the atrocity stories, no matter how fantastic, were true. This bogus investigation was just another part of Britain's anti-German propaganda campaign. The Bryce report was released on May 13, 1915, and the British government made sure it went to every newspaper in America. The impact was phenomenal, especially coming just after the torpedoing of the British liner Lusitania, which caused the deaths of 135 Americans. Americans from coast to coast were outraged. A wave of revulsion for all things German swept the country. Hatred of Germans reached fever pitch. Suddenly the American public was clamoring for war. There is well-founded suspicion that the Lusitania was set up as a decoy by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, deliberately exposing it to a German submarine attack for the purpose of bringing America into the war. But there were skeptics of the Bryce report. In England, Sir Roger Casement called the report a lie, and wrote a report of his own refuting it, though no one paid much attention to it. The American lawyer, Clarence Darrow, was so skeptical that he traveled to France in 1915 and searched in vain for a single eyewitness who could confirm even one of the Bryce stories. Increasingly dubious, Darrow announced that he would pay $1,000, equivalent to around $25,000 today, to anyone who could produce a Belgian boy whose hands had been amputated by a German soldier, or any other Belgian or French victim who had been mutilated by German troops. None were found. The proofs provided by the Bryce Committee in its investigation, as well as the methods employed in gathering them, violated every elementary rule of evidence. Careful scholars have long since demonstrated that the entire report was made up of nothing more than distortions and outright falsehoods. But Britain was determined to pull the United States into the war, and Bryce and his colleagues were willing accomplices in that effort. They justified their lies and exaggerations because it served the higher cause of Mother England. After the war, most historians dismissed 99% of Bryce's atrocities as fabrications. One called the report in itself one of the worst atrocities of the war. After the war, recounts Thomas Fleming in his book Illusion of Victory, historians who sought to examine the documentation for Bryce's stories were told that the files had mysteriously disappeared. As the war drew on, another fabricated story was widely circulated. It was reported that the Germans were operating a corpse factory where the bodies of both German and Allied soldiers killed in battle were supposedly melted down for fats and other products useful to the German war effort. The Germans were accused of making soap out of human fat. Human skins were used to make fine leather goods such as lampshades, driving gloves and riding breeches. The bones of these corpses were said to have been ground up and used as fertilizer on German farms. A detailed account of this so-called corpse factory appeared in the highly respected British newspaper, The Times, on April 17, 1917. According to the story, trains full of corpses arrived at a large factory. The bodies were attached to hooks connected to an endless chain. The article carefully described the process inside the corpse factory. The bodies are transported on this endless chain into a long, narrow compartment, where they pass through a bath which disinfects them. They then go through a drying chamber, and finally are automatically carried into a digester or great cauldron, in which they are dropped by an apparatus which detaches from the chain. In the digestive they remain from 6 to 8 hours, and are treated by steam, which breaks them up while they are slowly stirred by the machinery. From this treatment result several products. The fats are broken up into stearin, a form of tallow, and oils, which require to be redistilled before they can be used. The process of distillation is carried out by boiling the oil with carbonate of soda, and some of the byproducts resulting from this are used by German soap makers. The oil distillery and refinery lie in the southeastern corner of the works. The refined oil is sent out in small casks like those used for petroleum, and is of a yellowish-brown color. Note the meticulous detail. The story was a total fabrication, but it was a plausible story, especially with all the detail, and it was not possible for the Germans to completely refute it while the war was still going on. After the war, of course, the story was exposed as the lie it was. No such corpse factory existed. It is interesting that the story of making soap out of bodies emerged again during World War II when the Germans supposedly made soap out of Jewish corpses. That lie is still widely believed and remains a staple of Jewish Holocaust propaganda. The lampshades out of human skin story also had its origin in World War I and emerged again during World War II when Germans were supposedly making lampshades out of Jewish skin. There was nothing to it, yet it also remains a staple of Jewish Holocaust propaganda. The purpose of war propaganda, historian Thomas Fleming, in his book The Illusion of Victory, observes, as peddled by both the Anglo and American elite, was to create a widespread public image of Germans as monsters capable of appalling sadism, thereby coating an appeal to murderous collective hatred with a lacquer of sanctimony. The trick, said Fleming, is to leave the target audience at once shivering in horror at a spectacle of subhuman depravity, panting with a visceral desire for vengeance, and rapturously self-righteous about the purity of its humane motives. People who succumb to it are easily subsumed into a hive mind of officially sanctioned hatred, and prepared to perpetrate crimes even more hideous than those that they believe typify the enemy. The Bryce Report as well as all the other anti-German propaganda unquestionably helped England win the war. It convinced millions of Americans and other neutrals that the Germans were beasts in human form, and this, as much as anything else, helped bring America into the war. But there were adverse consequences to this lurid atrocity propaganda campaign. It poisoned public opinion against the Germans to such an extent that it could not be undone. It was an obvious factor, for example, in the British decision to maintain the total blockade of Germany for 7 months after the war was over, which, incidentally, was a violation of international law. The blockade caused 1 million German civilians to starve to death, and unbearable suffering of millions more. The blockade itself was far and away the greatest atrocity of World War I, though it receives very little publicity, and it was done, not by the evil Germans, but by the saintly British. By creating blind hatred of Germany, the anti-German propaganda campaign also contributed to the harsh peace terms imposed on Germany at the end of the war, which then sowed the seeds of World War II. Though historians and other scholars have exposed these German atrocity stories as nonsense, the image of German villainy has remained fixed. The benign world opinion of Germany which existed right up to 1914 was replaced overnight by the myth of unique German savagery which left a permanent residue of Germanophobia deep in Western minds. This explains why our boys were so willing to obliterate whole German cities and kill hundreds of thousands of German civilians with air bombardments during the Second World War. This hate propaganda, as false as it was, also had the effect of totally demoralizing the German people. Chapter 2: Aftermath of the War in Germany. The long stalemate which World War I became would most likely have ended in a negotiated peace with no winner and no loser if the United States had stayed out of it. But the combined weight of British, French and American armies in October 1918 was more than the Central Powers could withstand, and one after another began to seek a way to pull out of the war. Bulgaria signed an armistice on September 29, Turkey at the end of October, and Austria/Hungary signed on November 3. Stalemate, 1918. The British starvation blockade of Germany was taking a terrible toll, which eventually caused Germany to begin to crumble from within. Faced with the prospect of putting to sea to fight the British blockade, the sailors of the German High Seas Fleet stationed at Kiel mutinied on October 29. They had been persuaded by agitators that such an attack would be a suicide mission. Within a few days the entire city of Kiel was under their control and the revolution then spread throughout the country. On November 9 the Kaiser abdicated and slipped across the border into exile in the Netherlands. A German republic was declared to replace the monarchy and peace feelers were then extended to the Allies. At 5 a.m. on the morning of November 11, 1918 an armistice between Germany and the Allies was signed in a railway car parked in a French forest near the front lines. At 11 a.m. that same day, the armistice became effective. After more than 4 years of bloody fighting, the Great War had come to an end. Peace comes at last with the armistice of the 11th of November 1918 but what had it all been for? No combatant nation gained from it, at least nothing remotely worth. The sacrifices made. The accumulated wealth of Europe, the result of decades of peace, was completely dissipated and replaced by crushing national debt. The war had been a horrific experience unlike anything Europeans had ever experienced before, leaving them psychologically, economically and politically devastated. Before the war, all of Europe had come to believe that a steady, continuing improvement in the conditions of life was the inexorable trend of history. That generalized belief was replaced by a feeling of pessimism and cynicism. There was the feeling that Europe had been profoundly and permanently damaged, a feeling that turned out to be highly prescient, in retrospect. Ancient empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, crumbled as a result of the war. These empires had been the source of political and social stability, and now chaos reigned throughout Europe. The Paris Peace Conference after the war did a very imperfect job of putting it all back together again. It is clear from the perspective of today that World War I precipitated an irreversible decline in Western civilization. In addition to these adverse psychological and political consequences, there was also a considerable amount of physical destruction. Vast areas of northeastern France had been reduced to rubble. Flanders in Belgium had been all but destroyed, and the ancient city of Les was completely devastated. The homes of 750,000 French people had been destroyed and the infrastructure of the entire region had been severely damaged. Roads, coal mines and telegraph poles had been destroyed, greatly hindering the area's ability to recover and begin to function normally again. But all of that was insignificant compared to the massive, industrialized slaughter of human beings. Nearly every family in Europe had lost a family member, if not a father, son, brother or husband, then a cousin of one degree or another. All combatant countries suffered casualties never experienced before in all of history. The British, for example, suffered 50,000 casualties in a single afternoon at the Battle of Passchendaele and 350,000 casualties before the battle finally ended. The battle ended with no ground gained and no ground lost. The entire trench war was characterized by mass suicidal attacks against entrenched machine guns, and by massive artillery barrages which blew their targets to smithereens. This was mechanized, industrial death. Nothing on this scale had ever happened before. The scale of the slaughter can be appreciated by the lists presented below. Allied casualties. Britain, 885,000 soldiers killed, 1,663,000 wounded. France, 1,400,000 soldiers killed, 2,500,000 wounded. Belgium, 50,000 soldiers killed, 45,000 wounded. Italy, 651,000 soldiers killed, 954,000 wounded. Russia, 1,811,000 soldiers killed, 5 million wounded. America, 117,000 soldiers killed, 206,000 wounded. Central Powers casualties. Germany, 2,037,000 soldiers killed, 4,250,000 wounded. Austria/Hungary, 1,200,000 soldiers killed, 3,600,000 wounded. Turkey, 800,000 soldiers killed, 400,000 wounded. Bulgaria, 100,000 soldiers killed, 152,000 wounded. The number of soldiers killed on all sides totaled 9.7 million with 21 million wounded. Of the wounded, millions were maimed for life and unable to work. Nearly 7 million civilians on all sides lost their lives. The Versailles Treaty. The lurid anti-German propaganda campaign conducted by Britain and America throughout the war had created such hatred for the Germans that a harsh peace was virtually inevitable. Germany, rightly or wrongly, was to be held accountable for the war, including all the death and destruction resulting from it, and Germany would be required to pay for all of it. As if the war itself were not enough, during mid-1918, Europe was hit by Spanish flu, causing the deaths of an estimated 25 million more Europeans. That comes to some 41 million Europeans who died from all causes during the war, a sizable percentage of the European population. Death on this scale had not occurred in Europe since the Black Plague of the Middle Ages. This added to the feeling of bitterness and gloom that ran through Europe, and this anger was primarily directed at the hated and despised Germans, hated and despised as the result of the anti-German propaganda. Europe wanted to punish Germany and would do so with the Versailles Treaty. The terms of the treaty, as finally hammered out by the victors of the war, Britain, France and the United States, were harsh by any standard. The idealistic President Woodrow Wilson had presented his 14 points as the basis for a fair and just peace settlement, but they were mostly ignored after the armistice was signed, especially by the French. The French had no interest in a just peace. What the French wanted was revenge! That, and their 2 provinces back. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine had been taken from France by the victorious Prussians after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau considered Wilson sanctimonious and naïve, and privately ridiculed his 14 points. He sneered that God Almighty only had 10. Basically the terms of the Versailles Treaty were as follows: 28,000 square miles of Germany's territory and 6.5 million of her people were handed over to other countries. Alsace-Lorraine went to France, Eupen and Normandy were given to Belgium, Northern Schleswig went to Denmark, Helchin to Czechoslovakia, West Prussia, Posen, Upper Silesia and Danzig went to Poland. Danzig was placed under Polish management but was designated a free city under League of Nations supervision. Memel to Lithuania, and the Saar, Germany's industrial heartland, was put under the control of the League of Nations. All Germany's overseas colonies were taken away. Severe military limitations were imposed. Germany's army was reduced to 100,000 men, and was not allowed to have tanks or armored cars. Germany was not allowed an air force, and was allowed to have only 6 capital naval ships and no submarines. The west of the Rhineland and 50 kilometers, 31 miles, east of the Rhine River was made into a demilitarized zone. No German soldier or weapon was allowed into this zone. The Allies, meaning Britain and France, were to keep an army of occupation on the west bank of the Rhine for 15 years. Financial penalties were equally severe. The loss of vital industrial territory would impede all attempts by Germany to rebuild her economy. Coal from the Saar and Upper Silesia in particular was a vital economic loss. The coal went to France and England. Germany's richest farmland was given to Poland. Reparations were to be paid to the Allies in an amount to be decided by the Allies at a later time. It seemed clear to Germany that the Allies intended to bankrupt the country. Germany was also forbidden to unite with Austria to form one large German state, even though both Germany and Austria wanted it, in an attempt to keep her economic potential to a minimum. General terms of the treaty included 3 vital clauses. 1. Germany had to admit full responsibility for starting the war guilt clause, clause 231. 2. Germany was thereby responsible for all the damage caused by the war, and was therefore required to pay reparations, the bulk of which was to go to France and Belgium. The amount of reparations was not set at Versailles, but was to be determined later. In other words, Germany was to sign a blank check which the Allies would cash when it suited them in whatever amount they decided. The amount was eventually put at $33 billion, in 1919 dollars. 3. A League of Nations was set up to keep world peace, though Germany was not allowed in as a member. After agreeing to the armistice in November 1918, the Germans believed that the peace treaty to follow would be based on President Wilson's 14 points which would have ensured a fair and just peace, and that they would participate in drawing up the peace treaty. They had, in fact, signed the armistice and laid down their arms with that understanding. Instead, the treaty was drawn up without German participation and then handed to them as a diktat, which the Germans were required to sign without discussion. The term armistice is generally understood to mean a cessation of hostilities while a peace treaty is worked out. That is what Germany signed onto. But the Allies treated Germany as a defeated foe instead. According to the accepted meaning of an armistice, Germany should have had full participation in the peace conference. The German delegation to Versailles. They were forced to sign the treaty. The German delegation was astonished at the harshness of the treaty. They were particularly offended by the charge that Germany had started the war. In the minds of Germans, Germany had been fighting a defensive war imposed upon her by Russia and France, and soon afterwards by Britain. The way Germany saw it, France and Russia started the war. The officer sent to sign the Versailles Treaty refused to do so. To say such a thing would be a lie, he said. The German Chancellor Philipp Sidman resigned rather than accept the treaty, saying, "May the hand wither that signs this treaty." He characterized the terms of the treaty as unbearable, unrealizable and unacceptable, and proclaimed that the treaty would make the German people slaves and helots. The German people were both shocked and outraged over the terms of the treaty. As a symbolic protest against it, all forms of public entertainment throughout Germany were suspended for a week. Flags across the country were lowered to half-mast. Some wanted to start the war again, but Germany's leaders knew that that was impossible. There was nothing they could do. The German army had disintegrated and gone home after the armistice was signed, and Britain was maintaining a starvation blockade around Germany, letting nothing in and nothing out, causing the deaths of thousands of German civilians every day. Britain declared that the blockade would be maintained until the German representatives signed the treaty. Finally, Britain and France gave the Germans an ultimatum. Sign the treaty within 4 days or be invaded. The British and French armies were still intact. A German representative finally signed the treaty in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles on June 28, 1919. He was later assassinated under mysterious circumstances, no doubt the result of having signed the treaty. The treaty was signed, but only reluctantly, and without the slightest intention of actually cooperating in its imposition. In the words of the British historian, Aj Taylor, in his book, The History of the First World War, 1963, though the Germans accepted the treaty in the formal sense of agreeing to sign it, none took the signature seriously. The treaty seemed to them to be wicked, unfair, dictation, a slave treaty. All Germans intended to repudiate it at some time in the future, if it did not fall to pieces of its own absurdity. In one last gesture of defiance, after the treaty was signed, the captured German naval ships held at Scapa Flow were scuttled by their crews. Effect of the treaty on the German economy. The German economy was the most powerful in Europe going into the war, but like all the other combatant countries, except the United States, Germany was bankrupt by the end of it. Reconstructing her ruined economy after the war would have been a daunting task under the best of circumstances, but it was made doubly hard by the crushing impact of the Versailles Treaty. Under the treaty, Germany was forced to pay exorbitant reparations payments to the victorious powers at the same time that her ability to do so was drastically reduced by other terms of the treaty. Under the treaty, Germany lost 13% of her territory, 10% of her population, 25% of her potato and wheat production, 80% of iron ore, 68% of zinc ore, 33% of coal production, the entire Alsatian potash and textile industries, and the communications system built around Alsace-Lorraine and Upper Silesia. Her entire merchant fleet was confiscated along with numerous map showing German territory taken by the Versailles Treaty. The dark or shaded areas were taken from Germany. Shipping facilities. Moreover, for 5 years, Germany's shipyards were required to produce ships to be given to the victorious powers. She was also required to surrender 5,000 locomotives, 150,000 railway cars and 10,000 trucks. All German property abroad was confiscated. Because of Germany's weakened state, the reparations payments demanded by the victorious powers were completely beyond her ability to pay. The confiscation of Germany's coal mines was particularly devastating because the resultant coal shortage severely limited industrial production. Her agricultural production was also drastically reduced because she had no merchant fleet with which to import the phosphates necessary to produce fertilizers. She could not import other necessary raw materials because her colonies had been taken away as well as her merchant fleet. This caused factories to shut down, resulting in increased unemployment. All those who had previously worked in shipping and trade were also now unemployed. 1 million German civilians, mainly women, children and old people, starved to death as a result of the British naval blockade. 1 million Germans, mainly women, children and old people, starved to death as the result of the Royal Navy's food blockade, but millions of others were reduced to a weakened state from lack of food. A plague of malnutrition caused diseases affected Germany's children, many with permanently stunted growth, and disfiguring bone development. The war was over, but the starvation blockade continued to be imposed on an entirely helpless civilian population for 7 more months, to force the unwilling Germans to sign the peace treaty. It was cruel beyond belief, yet it was imposed by the saintly British against the savage Hun. In fact, the main force behind the blockade was the much-admired Winston Churchill. The confiscation of Germany's merchant fleet exacerbated an already disastrous situation. Germany was an industrial nation with a very dense population, closely integrated into the economic system of the world. She was therefore required to import enormous quantities of food and raw materials. The loss of her merchant fleet and the restrictions on trade imposed by the Versailles Treaty produced chaos in Germany, and served to extend the famine which existed as a result of the blockade. Adolf Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, Germany suffered most as a consequence of this peace treaty and the general insecurity which was bound to arise from it. The unemployment figures rose to 1/3 of the number usually employed in the nation, which means, however, that by counting the families of the unemployed as well there were 26 million people in Germany out of a population of 65 million faced by an absolutely hopeless future. Was the war guilt clause fair? Did Germany really start the war? The chain of cause and effect in international relations is interminable, but if one is to make a point, one must begin somewhere. To a considerable extent, why had its genesis in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. But the Franco-Prussian War itself was the culmination of years of tension between the two states, which finally came to a head over the issue of a Hohenzollern candidate for the vacant Spanish throne. France believed it was being surrounded by Prussian Hohenzollerns, and declared war on Prussia to prevent it. Prussia, under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, won the war, and without going into detail here, that victory made it possible for Bismarck to unite all the various German states, principalities, and estates into one unified German confederation. Included in this new German confederation were the 2 provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, taken from France as war booty and annexed to Germany. There was, of course, historical justification for Germany's annexation of the 2 provinces, as France had previously taken them from Germany during the reign of Louis XI. Moreover, the populations of Alsace and Lorraine were still majority German-speaking, ethnic Germans. As mentioned above, the chain of cause and effect is interminable. The German annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, whether justified or not, left France humiliated and seething with anger over their loss. France had grown accustomed during her 400 years of war-making and aggression to humiliating others, Germany in particular, and this role reversal was hard for France to swallow. Revenge, policy to regain lost territory, became a major French goal, and revenge against Germany became a French national obsession, particularly among the political and military elite. France's determination to have a war of revenge against Germany was a factor in all of the diplomatic maneuvers that ultimately led to war in 1914. According to J.S. Wart, in his book, The Roots and Causes of War, 1925, the Alsace-Lorraine annexation by Prussia in 1871 was the principal factor in the counter-alliances, ententes, and antagonisms which perturbed continental Europe for 43 years. Not France only, but all Europe, kept in mind, between 1871 and 1914, with varying intensity, the prospect, one might say the assumed certainty, of the recurrence of the Franco-Prussian War. After unification into a single state in 1871, Germany experienced an extraordinary period of economic growth and development. Industrialization progressed rapidly and German manufacturers began to take markets away from Britain. Germany produced more and more of her own consumer products, and imported less and less of British-made products. But Germany also began to compete with British commerce abroad, particularly in the United States. German textile production and steel production quickly surpassed those of Britain. Germany invested heavily in research and development, to a far greater extent than Britain, which produced impressive technological advances, especially in chemistry, electricity and electric motors, and in devices driven by electric motors. Germany was dominant in physics and chemistry to the extent that 1/3 of all Nobel Prizes went to German inventors and researchers. By 1913 Germany produced 90% of the world's dyestuffs and began to excel in other areas of chemistry such as pharmaceuticals, photographic film, agricultural chemicals and electrochemicals. With a population of 65 million, Germany became the dominant economic power on the continent and was the world's second largest exporting nation after Britain. The populations of Britain and France were 45 million and 40 million respectively. No one had worried much about Germany prior to its unification in 1871. Up to then Germany was only a geographic expression, referring to the multiplicity of German-speaking kingdoms, principalities, city-states and sovereign estates located in Central Europe. But Germany's rapid rise in power after unification created anxiety amongst her neighbors. The old balance of power system, worked out by Prince Metternich at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, had served as the basis for European relations until thrown off kilter by Germany's growing power after unification. Germany quickly displaced France as the dominant power on the European continent, causing consternation among the British elite. Britain had always seen France as her traditional enemy and rival on the continent, but British power had already long eclipsed that of France, and France was no longer in a position to challenge British dominance. The extraordinary growth of Germany as an industrial power, however, was beginning to challenge that of Britain. As a result, Britain began making efforts to develop friendly relations with France as leverage against Germany. It appeared to Britain that the entire continent was about to become organized as a single economic union under an all-powerful Germany, which threatened to sideline Britain into insignificance. The more powerful Germany became, the more apprehensive British leaders became, to the point that they began to speculate on how to cut the upstart Germany down to size. An eventual war with Germany began to seem inevitable. On April 8, 1904 Britain entered an entente cordiale with France, followed by an Anglo-Russian entente. France and Russia then forged the Franco-Russian alliance. Thus the Triple Entente of Britain, France and Russia was formed for the purpose of containing the growing power of Germany. To ameliorate this developing hostility against her, Germany made vigorous efforts in the years before World War I to arrive at an understanding with Russia and France, and particularly with Britain, but got nowhere because the real problem was Germany's very existence as a growing superpower. Each had interests of their own which put them in conflict with Germany. First, Russia wanted control of the Bosporus Straits leading out of the Black Sea, as a warm water outlet for her navy and the merchant fleet, and was willing to go to war to get it. The Bosporus Straits were at the time controlled by Germany through her alliance with the Ottoman Empire. Next, Britain saw Germany as a threat to her economic dominance and wanted only to reduce Germany's power. Then, France wanted revenge for the loss of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, and also wanted her two provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, back. All three powers wanted to reduce Germany's economic power, and the only way they saw to achieve that was by military force. All Germany's diplomatic efforts were frustrated by these factors. Germany's very existence as a unified nation-state was the problem, and it seemed that nothing short of dissolving itself would satisfy these rival nations. France and Russia together began to scheme against Germany and to develop plans for an eventual war. Britain was also looking for a pretext for war against Germany. Yet, Germany was guilty of nothing except becoming too successful. Left, a cartoon in 1904 from the German perspective. John Bull, as the symbol of Britain, is walking off with the harlot, Ariane, symbol of France, in what is supposed to be a tricolour dress, turning their backs on the Kaiser. Britain and Germany have often been called the identical twins of Europe. They were the same race, with similar, highly organized, high-achieving cultures, both Protestant, in the main, both aggressive in pursuing their aims, and both with a history of constitutional monarchies. Britain had no quarrel with Germany, nor Germany with Britain, except that Britain became obsessed with Germany's growing economic power. Britain, though smaller than Germany in size and population, headed the largest empire in the world, in fact, the largest empire in history. Yet, Germany was eclipsing Britain as an industrial power. Moreover, Germany was building a navy which threatened to rival that of Britain. Britain was also painfully aware of the comparative trajectories of the economic power of Britain and Germany. Britain's was trending downward, while Germany's was trending upwards, and this did not bode well for Britain's future. The British believed that they needed to act against Germany while they were still powerful enough to do so. Between 1912 and 1914, the Russian ambassador in Paris, Alexander Rozvalsky, and President Raymond Poincaré of France entered into an agreement to go to war against Germany, in event of any diplomatic crisis that would bring Britain in on their side. Such a crisis soon erupted with the Serbian assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June, 1914. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia after obtaining Germany's unqualified backing, the blank check. The blank check was given because Germany's governing elite believed that by doing so, Russia would be discouraged from intervening against Austria-Hungary on behalf of Serbia. Germany reasoned that if Austria-Hungary were to be defeated by Serbia and Russia, then Germany would be left completely surrounded by enemies. Propping up Austria-Hungary was crucial to Germany's security. But Russia, who considered herself Serbia's mentor and protector, Serbia was Russia's little Slavic brother, ignored Germany's blank check and threatened war against Austria-Hungary anyway. Germany tried mediating with Russia to prevent war, but Russia and her ally France, seeing this as the opportunity they had been waiting for, refused to be conciliatory. Instead, Russia abruptly ordered a general mobilization. Such a mobilization had long been recognized in European capitals as tantamount to a declaration of war. After urgent demands for Russia to cancel her mobilization, to no avail, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1 and immediately began her own mobilization. France began mobilizing 3 days later, but, in fact, had already informed the Russians that she had decided on war a day before Germany declared war on Russia and 3 days before Germany declared war on France. France's mobilization was not, therefore, the result of Germany's declaration of war on Russia. The mobilization had already been decided on. Germany, instead of being the aggressor in this case, was reacting to Russian and French initiatives. Germany is located on a flat plain in the heart of Europe without natural defenses, completely surrounded by potential enemies, and therefore uniquely vulnerable to invasion from 2 or more sides. She was in no position, therefore, to wait and see before mobilizing her own armed forces. Germany was well aware of the plotting and scheming between France and Russia to create a pretext for war against her, and was, therefore, on continuous alert. The worst nightmare for Germany's military leaders was a two-front war with France on one side and Russia on the other. To counter the likelihood, Germany had worked out a military strategy called the Schlieffen Plan. The plan called for rapid mobilization, concentration of Germany's armed forces, and a lightning attack through Belgium to first knock France out of the war, after which the German army would wheel around and take on Russia, thus avoiding a two-front war. Even though the Schlieffen Plan called for a preemptive attack, first on France and then Russia, the plan was, at bottom, a defensive strategy and not an aggressive one. To wait to be attacked first, from 2 sides, would be suicidal. On August 3, 1914, when war seemed unavoidable, Germany swept through Belgium and into France, but was unable to deal France the quick, knockout blow strategized in the Schlieffen Plan. Britain then declared war on Germany on August 4 on the pretext that Germany had violated Belgian neutrality, though Britain's actual reason for war against Germany was to destroy Germany as an economic rival. On that basis alone, Britain's leaders decided to join France and Russia in a war against Germany. In reality, Belgium had not figured into the British cabinet's discussion at all when war with Germany was decided upon. Belgium was used only as a pretext for war. Moreover, had Germany not invaded Belgium, Britain would have done so without a second thought. Soon after pouring into France through Belgium, Germany became bogged down in the Battle of the Marne, just short of her goal of reaching Paris, which quickly brought an end to the war of movement. Stalemate and trench warfare followed in which neither side could predominate. This condition remained until the American forces came in to break the deadlock. Germany eventually lost the war, and for that reason alone, was blamed for starting it. Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty formally blamed Germany for starting the war, which then served as the basis for all of the punitive measures taken against Germany. After the war was over and passions began to cool, a number of historians, known as revisionists, began to look through the intemperate propaganda to uncover the real facts. Scholars like Harry Elmer Barnes, Charles Beard, et al., began to tell a different story. Barnes argued in his book, The Genesis of the World War, 1926, that, on the record, Serbia, Russia and France bore a greater responsibility for starting the war than did Austria and Germany's responsibility was less than Austria-Hungary's. In Barnes' view, German war guilt was about equal to that of Britain. The most pro-German view was that Germany was forced into a war she did not want and was required to defend herself against rapacious foes out to destroy Germany as an economic power. President Wilson had sent his personal representative, Colonel Edward Mandell House, to Europe to study the situation 3 months before the war began. The view that Germany was being threatened by military aggression from Russia, France and Britain was supported by Colonel House's report. He wrote in his report that, when England consents, France and Russia will close in on Germany, which is precisely what eventually happened. Germany was, in fact, the defender against Allied aggression. Germany did not want war, had nothing to gain from war, and everything to lose from it. After all, Germany was obtaining everything she wanted without war, that is, economic expansion and the acquisition of colonies from which to obtain raw materials and to which to sell industrial products. But France did want war, as revenge against Germany for the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 and to regain her lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. Russia also did want war with Germany in order to obtain the warm water Bosporus Straits which Germany controlled, and Britain did want war in order to crush a commercial competitor. All 3 of these allied powers believed that Germany was becoming too big and too powerful. The Versailles Treaty itself proves that, in that its main effect was to reduce the physical size of Germany and to reduce her economic and military power. The treaty took away large portions of German territory and gave it to other countries, along with 6.5 million German people. A separate clause barred Austria from combining with Germany. During the peace deliberations, Georges Clemenceau, President of France, is supposed to have said, "Germany has 20 million too many people." Germany not only did not want war in the beginning, but put out peace feelers as early as 1916 to try to bring the war to an end, even though Germany appeared at that time to be about to win the war, but the Allies had no interest in bringing the war to an end. What the Allies wanted was to destroy Germany, as they had set out to do from the beginning, and so, Germany's peace feelers were ignored. Clearly Germany was the victim and not the perpetrator of aggression. The United States had no reason whatever to enter the war against Germany. Germany had done nothing to the United States and was not a threat to the United States in any way. Moreover, German Americans along with British Americans constituted the very core of the American culture. The United States had had only good relations with Germany, and American citizens had always looked upon Germany with warmth and admiration. Though the British anti-German propaganda campaign conducted in the United States had influenced public opinion, the vast majority of Americans were still opposed to entering the war. That could not be said, however, of America's ruling elite. America's ruling elite was strongly Anglophilic, with an attitude towards Great Britain not unlike that of Canada and Australia, innately predisposed to go to the aid of the mother country. America was virtually a vassal state to Great Britain in those days. These were all factors, but the deciding influence in taking America into the war was the pressure on President Wilson by American Jewish financiers. It was these powerful Jews who had financed Wilson's political career. Without their financial and media support, he probably would never have become president. These Jews exerted extreme pressure on Wilson to take the United States into the war on the side of Britain to ensure an Allied victory, in exchange for the Balfour Declaration which promised the Jews a homeland in Palestine after the war, of which more in the following chapter. Jews controlled most of the large newspapers and they controlled Hollywood, so they had all the means necessary to control American public opinion. The sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmermann telegram, etc. were not reasons to go to war, only fabricated pretexts. The German people had every reason to be outraged over the shameful peace treaty imposed upon them by the victorious powers. The Versailles Treaty was unfair and immoral, and had been imposed by force by the victors upon the vanquished. Germany was forced into signing the hated treaty by a food blockade imposed by the British Navy, which caused 1 million Germans to starve to death, and by a threat of military invasion of Germany. Therefore, the imposed treaty had no moral or legal force and Germany was in no way obligated to adhere to the treaty and had every moral right to abandon it as soon as she was militarily able to do so. Though America's entry brought a quick end to the carnage, entering the war was actually disastrous in its long-term consequences for Western, Christian civilization. Had America stayed out of it, it is almost certain that the war would have ended in a negotiated peace with neither side achieving a victory. There would therefore have been no Versailles Treaty. Germany would not have been dismembered. Germany would have maintained her army intact and would have maintained her peace agreement with Russia, Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Tsar would likely not have abdicated and the German Empire would have remained intact. Bolshevism would most likely have been nipped in the bud instead of taking control of Russia. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would have remained intact. So, also, would the Ottoman Empire, which would have precluded the creation of the State of Israel and all of the negative consequences resulting from that. There would have been no communist revolution in Germany, Hungary or Italy. The Spanish Civil War would not have occurred. There would have been no World War II, no Cold War, and communism would not have taken control of Central and Eastern Europe. A unified Europe, not unlike the European Union of today, except much larger and much more prosperous, would almost certainly have formed with Germany as its dominant member. In short, Europe would have stabilized and become a dynamic economic power in the world. America's entry into the war was perhaps the greatest disaster in European history in its unintended consequences. Chapter 3 The Jewish Factor in the War. On December 12, 1916, 2.5 years into the war, Germany made a peace offer to the Allies to end the war on a status quo ante basis. That is, no one wins and no one loses, and no one pays reparations, everyone just stops fighting and goes back home. Germany had never wanted the war in the first place. By that time in the course of the war, Germany seemed on the verge of victory. Germany's submarine force had effectively stopped the supply convoys coming from America to Britain, creating critical shortages of all war material in Britain. France had already lost 600,000 men in the battles of Verdun and the Somme, and French soldiers were beginning to mutiny. The Italian army had collapsed completely and Russian soldiers were deserting in droves and returning home. Germany appeared to be winning on both fronts. But the slaughter had been too great and the British and the French were unwilling to stop fighting short of a victory. The only way to justify the carnage and the horrific loss of life was to fight on until victory could be obtained. Moreover, as explained in the previous chapter, Britain had entered the war to destroy Germany as an industrial and commercial rival, and that remained her goal. British leaders were determined to find a way to break the stalemate and win the war, and they knew that the one sure way of doing so was to bring America in on their side. A relentless effort was already underway to bring that about, but so far, without success. Zionist Jews and the British government had already been finagling behind the scenes over a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In October 1916, 2 months prior to the German peace offer, a group of Zionist Jews led by Chaim Weizmann, later the first president of Israel, had met with British leaders with a proposition. If Britain would guarantee the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine after the war, the Jews would use their influence through powerful Jews in America to bring America into the war on the side of Britain and the Allies, which would assure an Allied victory. These Jews were so confident of their power and influence that they virtually guaranteed that they would be able to achieve this. At that time, Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which was allied to Germany. If Germany were to win the war, the Ottoman Empire would have remained intact with no possibility of a Jewish homeland there, but if the Allies were to win the war, then Britain would control Palestine and be in position to hand it over to the Jews. Whether or not Britain had the right to give other people's land to the Jews is another issue. With the offer of the Zionists Jews to bring America into the war in hand, Britain rejected Germany's peace offer and decided to take the Zionists up on their proposition. The British promised the Jews that if they could, indeed, bring America into the war, that Palestine would be theirs. The Zionist Jews went to work immediately. The tiny group of elites who ran the United States, including President Wilson and his administration, all resided on the East Coast, and all were enthusiastic Anglophiles and already predisposed to enter the war on the side of Mother England. They only needed a push and a pretext, which could easily be manufactured. But the great heartland of America, which included millions of ethnic Germans, wanted nothing to do with the war. The job at hand, then, was to bring public opinion around from opposing entry into the war to supporting it. That would be achieved through propaganda. The British had already been waging a very sophisticated anti-German propaganda campaign of their own in America since the war first began, and had considerable success in turning American public opinion against Germany, but they by no means yet had a majority. The Jews were very powerful in America. In addition to owning most of the big banking firms, they also owned most of the newspapers, and they owned Hollywood. They controlled all the means of running an effective propaganda campaign. Because of their wealth and their willingness to support the campaigns of politicians, they also had enormous political influence and would have little trouble in persuading politicians to see things their way. Jewish motivations in international affairs were complicated at the time, which requires a bit of explaining. Jews, then as now, lived as minorities in numerous other host countries, without a state of their own. But all considered themselves to be a part of the international nation of Israel, a single nation, encompassing all Jews everywhere. What happens to Jews in one corner of the world is a concern of Jews worldwide. As a nation of its own, international Jewry has national interests, and one of their national interests at that time was the eventual destruction of the Tsarist regime in Russia. Jews in Russia had long been restricted and suppressed by one Tsarist regime after another, to the extent that millions of Jews had left Russian-controlled areas for other European countries, but mainly to America. Tsarist Russia was the avowed enemy of the international Jewish nation, and since Germany was at war with Russia, international Jewry tended to support Germany in the war on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. At the same time, they restricted their support of all kinds to Britain and France because Britain and France were allied with Russia. Jacob Siff, the German-born head of the Kuhn Loeb Bank in New York, and the most influential figure of his day in American Jewish life, wrote in the Menorah Journal of April 1915, "It is well known that I am a German sympathizer. England has been contaminated by her alliance with Russia. I'm quite convinced that in Germany anti-Semitism is a thing of the past." Siff's pro-Germany sympathies were shared by Jews everywhere, particularly by Zionist Jews. Nevertheless, after the Zionists saw their chance of obtaining Palestine as a Jewish homeland by switching their support to Britain, international Jewry switched sides overnight, and Germany then became their avowed enemy. They not only withdrew their financial support, they also began a vicious propaganda attack against Germany. American and British Jews joined the British government's already intense anti-German propaganda campaign. All the Jewish-owned newspapers and other publications, as well as Jewish-owned Hollywood, joined in the attack. The Germans who had so recently been the Jews-favored nationality, suddenly became brutal, knuckle-dragging, baby-killing Huns in the international Jewish press. International Jewish bankers cut off financial support to Germany and began to pour their money into France and Britain instead. Even Jewish banks in Germany refused further financing of the German war effort. Prior to the war, Germany had been a hospitable country for Jews. Due to the absence of any kind of restrictions on them, Jews became very powerful in Germany, and through their dominance of banking and finance, they were able to control much of Germany's industrial power. Once Palestine had been promised to the Jews by Britain, even German Jews were no longer willing to support the German war effort. Instead, they became something of an allied fifth column inside Germany, betraying the country they lived in. Jewish newspapers in Germany began to criticize and condemn the war. Jewish labor leaders in Germany began to agitate for strikes and work stoppages, and Jewish communist leaders began to agitate for revolution. This combined effort of Jewish groups in undermining war production and in creating unrest among the German people proved very detrimental to Germany's war effort. The Jews had taken the British bribe, and proved once again that their primary interest in all events is what is good for Jews, and that their loyalty is first and foremost to the international nation of Israel. Immediately after the British promise of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, American Jews began pressuring the Wilson administration to enter the war against Germany. President Woodrow Wilson was highly malleable in the hands of the Jews, as his political career had been a product of Jewish financial and media support, and he remained closely associated with Jews throughout his political career. Even his non-Jewish right-hand man, Colonel Edward Mandell House, had been closely associated with Jews prior to his association with Wilson. House had been employed as an agent for the Jewish House of Rothschild, negotiating U.S. cotton purchases for them before he linked up with Wilson. Wilson's campaign for governor of New Jersey was financed by a group of Jewish bankers and financiers, including Jacob Sif, president of the Kuhn Loeb Bank, Paul Warburg, brother-in-law to Sif and Wilson appointee to the Federal Reserve Board, and by Henry Mogentha, S.R., a financier and Wilson appointee as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. These same Jews, as well as others, financed his run for the presidency. Other Jews who influenced Wilson included the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, whom Wilson had appointed, Bernard Baruch, the wealthy and powerful financier, Rabbi Stephen Wise, founder of the Federation of American Zionists in 1897, who later became Wilson's most trusted advisor, and Felix Frankfurter, a crypto-communist, who was later appointed to the Supreme Court by FDR. These Jews virtually controlled Wilson because they had been responsible for his career. All of them applied relentless pressure on Wilson to enter the war against Germany, which, as previously mentioned, he was already predisposed to do. Meanwhile, these powerful American Jews financed, and therefore controlled President Woodrow Wilson's political career. They used that influence to pressure Wilson into entering the war against Germany. The Jewish information and entertainment media had completely converted American public opinion from opposition to the war to virtually demanding it. Wilson, himself, made the decision that America would enter the war, and he then went before Congress and persuaded Congress to declare war on Germany. On April 6, 1917, less than 6 months after the meeting between Weizmann and the British leaders during which these Zionist Jews promised to bring America into the war, the United States Congress declared war on Germany. On November 2, 1917, as a quid pro quo, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration in the form of a letter from the British government to Zionist, Baron Walter Rothschild, promising Palestine to the Jews as a national homeland. The war ended on November 11, 1918 after an armistice was signed, based on President Wilson's 14 points. If the peace conference which met in Paris to work out the peace treaty after the war had kept its word and used Wilson's 14 points as the basis for the treaty, all would have been different, but as outlined in the previous chapter, that is not what happened. The peace conference ignored Wilson's 14 points, which would have guaranteed a just peace for all sides. Germany was blamed for the war and a harsh, punitive treaty was drawn up which turned out to be anything but a just peace. It was destructive and demoralizing for the German people. The treaty was presented to Germany as a diktat which Germany was forced to sign under duress. The German people were astounded when they learned of the contents of the treaty. They were outraged and wanted someone to blame for it. Their wrath became focused on the Jews. Thus, the stab-in-the-back theory was established, blaming communists and Jews for the loss of the war, as well as for the harsh peace treaty. There was enough truth in these allegations for it to be widely believed. International Jewry did, in fact, take sides against Germany in exchange for the promise of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which only the British were in position to grant. Jews also poured money into the British and French war effort and used their international banking influence to cut off financing to Germany. Moreover, many of these Jews were German Jews who wound up undermining their own country. Jews at the Paris Peace Conference. The extent of Jewish influence at the Paris Peace Conference after the war is not very well known today, but the fact is that Jews flocked there from all over the globe. They came from Russia, Eastern Europe, France, and particularly from the United States and Britain. From Britain came Lord Walter Rothschild, Lionel de Rothschild, Chaim Weizmann, Lucian Wolff, Moses Montefiore, Nachum Sokolov, Julius Kahn, Professor Sylvan Levi, and M. Bigar, among others. From the United States came Rabbi Stephen Wise, Felix Frankfurter, Oscar Strauss, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, Walter Lippmann, the historian Simon Dubnow, Harry Friedenwald, Jacob Dahrs, Mary Fels, Louis Robison, Bernard Flexner, and Judge Julian Mack of Philadelphia, among others. 10 additional Jews came as members of the American Jewish Congress, formed in 1918 specifically for the Paris Peace Conference. From France came a group of Jews representing the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a Paris-based international Jewish organization founded in 1860 to safeguard the human rights of Jews around the world. Representing the American banking interests was the Jewish banker Paul Warburg, chairman of the Federal Reserve. His brother Max Warburg, head of the German banking firm of Warburg and Company, was there, along with other German Jews, as a representative of German banking interests, but not representing Germany, per se, only Germany's Jewish banking interests. These groups were joined by large numbers of Jews from Bolshevik Russia, Poland and Ukraine. Though they ostensibly represented several different countries, all the Jewish delegates congregated together as one group, first and foremost to secure the interests of international Jewry. The interests of the various countries they represented were only secondary, and of a much lower priority, if considered at all. Astonishingly, each of the Allied leaders at the peace talks had a Jew as his primary advisor. President Wilson had Bernard Baruch. Francis Clemenceau had Jeroboam Rothschild, also known as George's Mandel. Britain's David Lloyd George had Sir Philip Sassoon. Italy's representative at the talks, Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, was himself half Jewish, and self-identified as a Jew. All of these Jews were comprehensively involved at every level in the numerous decisions which had to be made by the conference, particularly those pertaining to their own interests. Jewish interests were given an inexplicably high priority in the final drafting of the peace settlement known as the Versailles Treaty. The Jews had a number of interests which they vigorously pursued, but they were especially determined to have the following three requirements included in the final treaty. 1. A League of Nations as the first step toward world government. 2. The recognition of Jewish minority rights in Eastern Europe, and 3. The creation of a British mandate in Arab Palestine as the necessary first step toward an eventual Jewish state there. They accomplished all three. It seems remarkable that Jewish interests could have so predominated at the conclusion of a war in which Jews had not participated as a separate corporate entity. And yet, there they were, at war's end, having come from countries on both sides of the conflict, fully participating in the peace conference, and securing for themselves a major share of the spoils. Jewish power has never been more overtly demonstrated. They achieved everything they had set out to obtain. Jews in Britain. The Jews have long been powerful in Britain. So powerful that the British social critic Hilaire Belloc, in his book, The Jews, 1922, described the British Empire as a partnership between Jewish finance and the British aristocracy. Britain was the financial capital of the world, and the Rothschilds dominated British finance. Belloc goes on to say that the Jews, in spite of their small numbers, colour every English institution, especially the universities and the House of Commons through their control of the politicians by Jewish finance. The same can be said of the United States today. In his book, Tales of the British Aristocracy, 1956, L. G. Pine claims that the British aristocracy is thoroughly mixed with Jewish blood. In fact, Pine says, the British aristocracy is about half Jewish. Ancient estates fell on hard times after the Industrial Revolution as the shift of financial power slipped away from agriculture and the great landed estates and went over to manufacturing. Jews controlled the money in Britain and even financed the British government through the Rothschild-controlled Bank of England, and they financed British industry. Down-and-out gentry with ancient titles and large estates, but no money, began marrying the daughters of rich Jews, so the marriage of Jewish finance and British aristocracy took place literally. Pine gives as an example the marriage of the 5th Earl of Rosebery, who married the only daughter and heiress of Baron Meyer de Rothschild, head of the Bank of England. Rosebery went on to become Prime Minister in 1894. Rosebery's Rothschild wife stayed in the Jewish religion, but her children were educated as Christians. The alliances between Jewish ladies and British lords are mostly of this type, the wife providing large sums while the aristocrat has the title and ancient estate. The children are able to look back upon a varied bag of ancestors. Other wealthy and powerful Jewish families who penetrated into British aristocracy included the Sassoons, the Castles, the Montefries, the Montagues, and the Goldsmiths, among others. These Jews were the money men behind important politicians and political leaders on the make, especially so in the case of Winston Churchill. Churchill had no money, yet he lived like an Oriental pasha, thanks to a group of wealthy Jewish backers known among themselves as the Focus. This group backed Churchill throughout his entire career, and were particularly instrumental in making him Prime Minister. All of these wealthy Jews were socially intertwined with the most powerful men of Britain, including the King himself. Castle's daughter married Lord Louis Mountbatten, a member of the royal family. Castle was related to the Rothschilds, the preeminent Jewish family in Europe. Thus, the marriage of a Castle to a Mountbatten tied the Rothschilds to the royal family by marriage. Before the First World War, much of the British aristocracy was Jewish, and the rest was thoroughly mixed with Jewish blood. Britain even had a Jewish Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, who wrote, "The Jews have made themselves so closely connected with the British peerage that the two classes are unlikely to suffer loss which is not mutual." Thus, the Jews had a powerful influence upon every aspect of British policy, including entry into World War I against Germany. Chapter 4: The Russian Revolution of 1917. Germany actually won World War I on the Eastern Front, though that aspect of the war is less well known than the war on the Western Front, which Germany lost. The war on the Eastern Front began on August 17, 1914, when Russia invaded East Prussia with a full-scale offensive. The Russian attack was launched a little more than 2 weeks after Germany had crossed into Belgium in its drive on France, which marked the beginning of the war. To meet the Russian invasion of East Prussia, Germany immediately diverted large numbers of soldiers from the Western Front. The massive German troop transfer from the Western Front to the Eastern Front is one of the reasons the Western Front bogged down in stalemate so soon after the war began. Germany's Schlieffen Plan called for a lightning attack through Belgium, into France, to knock France out of the war, whereupon the German army would wheel around and take on the Russians on the Eastern Front. A two-fronts war was to be avoided at all cost. When Germany's attack on France did not produce the expected quick victory, the German army dug trenches and assumed a defensive position until the war on the Eastern Front could be resolved. Germany fought a defensive war on the Western Front with reduced forces through most of the war while aggressively engaging the Russians on the Eastern Front. Germany was now fighting the two-front war the Schlieffen Plan had been designed to avoid. Russia and Germany clashed in a series of bloody battles on the Eastern Front, in which Russia came out second best in all of them. In East Prussia the Russian armies were crushed by German forces at both the Battle of Tannenberg and the Battle of Masurian Lakes. In the disastrous Battle of Tannenberg, only 10,000 of General Samsonov's Russian Second Army managed to escape. The remainder of his 150,000 troops were either killed or captured. General Samsonov then shot himself rather than face the humiliation of his disastrous defeat. The Russians were then pushed completely out of East Prussia by the victorious Germans. Russian forces fared better in their invasion of the Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia by winning an important victory at the Battle of Lemberg, now Lvov, but the German army came quickly to the rescue and drove the Russians back into Russia. In just 6 months' time, the Russian army had gained nothing, yet lost over 2 million men, either killed or captured. German troops then seized the initiative by advancing into Russian-held territory, seizing Warsaw in early August, 1915, Brest-Litovsk on August 25 and Vilna, Lithuania on September 19. These battles resulted in the loss of another 1 million Russian soldiers. The heavy losses sustained in these battles literally wiped out the old Russian officer corps and nearly destroyed the entire pre-war Russian army. Military commanders were thereafter forced to rely on inexperienced and reluctant conscripts, most of whom were simple peasants. The situation deteriorated to the point that Tsar Nicholas I felt it necessary to take personal command of the army, effective on August 22, 1915. Because of his lack of experience in military matters, the Tsar was indecisive and vacillating, and managed only to exacerbate an already deteriorating situation. German troops in East Prussia. Morale in the Russian army deteriorated rapidly. Soldiers began deserting the front and returning home in droves. These conscripted peasant soldiers refused to accept orders from their officers, and even shot their officers in many cases. They were not professional soldiers and had no feeling of commitment to either the army or to the war. The German army crosses into Russia, September, 1917. Russian soldiers flee advancing Germans by January 1917. It was clear that Tsar Nicholas had lost control of the situation in the field and that Russia was losing the war. Back home, food supplies were low throughout Russia, unemployment was high, and inflation was spiraling out of control, all a result of the war. Widespread strikes had shut down factories, throwing even more people out of work. Leftist revolutionaries took full advantage of the chaos to incite the people to revolt. Street demonstrations were organized in which workers, peasants and soldiers demanded bread, redistribution of land, and an end to the war. Workers' soviets, councils were organized by the revolutionaries. The situation became so explosive that the Tsar abdicated and a provisional government was put in his place, headed by Alexander Kerensky. Significantly, as a sign of things to come, Kerensky was a Jew. In March 1917, one of the first measures of the provisional government under Kerensky was to abolish all restrictions on Jews throughout Russia. This was to prove disastrous for traditional Russia, for it had the effect of opening any and all public offices to revolutionary Jews, which they quickly flooded into. Alexander Kerensky, head of the new provisional government. When the provisional government took power, the Workers' Soviets councils remained in existence, so for a time there was a sort of duality of power. Workers' Soviets were a Marxist Jewish creation, and their principal accomplishment was to immediately free all political prisoners and to lift the ban on political exiles to permit them to return to Russia. This brought some of the most radical, revolutionary-minded leaders back into the capital city of Petrograd from Russian prisons, the great majority of whom were Jews. This was a momentous event for old Russia, the significance of which was not immediately recognized. By this invasion of revolutionary Jews, the Russian body politic was fatally infected, and old Russia was doomed. Altogether, some 90,000 exiles returned from all over Europe and America, and from as far away as Argentina. These 90,000 exiles constituted the heart of the approaching Bolshevik revolution. They were almost to the last man professional revolutionaries, and with few exceptions they were Jews. Stalin, Sverdlov, and Zinoviev were among the exiles who returned from Siberia. Lenin, Martov, Radke, and Kamenev returned from Switzerland. Trotsky returned with hundreds of his Yiddish brethren from New York's Lower East Side. Until their return the revolution had been under the leadership of second-string Bolsheviks who happened to be on hand. Now the elite with international reputations had returned and began to take charge. Bolsheviks take control. This group, the Bolsheviks, overthrew the provisional government in October 1917, in what amounted to a Jewish coup d'état of the Russian government. Kerensky had wanted to gradually implement a mild form of socialism within a structure of democracy, but this was much too mild and much too slow for the Bolsheviks' taste. Lenin and Trotsky wanted to completely remake Russian society, and they knew that that could only be done through violence. These men were Jacobins, and what they wanted was a French revolutionary-style reign of terror. One of the first acts of these Jewish Bolsheviks after seizing control of the government was to enact a law forbidding anti-Semitism, violation of which carried the death penalty. Lenin addresses a crowd on a street in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Leon Trotsky stands just to the right of the podium. Jews and the Russian Revolution. The fact that Jews constituted the majority of the Bolshevik leadership in the Russian Revolution of 1917, as well as in the numerous Bolshevik revolutions that erupted throughout Europe afterwards, is carefully suppressed today. As a result, Jewish involvement has largely been erased from modern academic historiography. Contemporary historians today are virtually compelled, on pain of professional ruin, to support the view that not only did the Jews play no special role in Bolshevism, but that they were actually victimized by it. This, of course, is a cover-up and a contradiction of the actual facts. Statesmen and journalists of that time were well aware of the Jewish nature of the Russian Revolution, and that the revolution amounted to a Jewish coup d'état of the Russian state. It was also well known that the Bolshevik regime that came into power as a result of the revolution was made up mostly of Jews. Moreover, the communist revolutions throughout Europe that soon followed the Russian Revolution were orchestrated by Jews whose goal was to do the same in other European countries that they had done in Russia, that is, to overthrow existing regimes and replace them with Soviet socialist republics controlled by Jews. It is significant that in every single case where communists managed to take control of a European country, however temporary, one of their first acts was to outlaw anti-Semitism and to lift all restrictions on Jews. To obtain the real facts of the matter, one only needs to read the newspapers, magazine articles, and books written at that time, all of which are now available on the internet. Two attempts were made by international Jewry to take control of the Russian government, the first in 1905, which did not succeed, and the second in 1917, which did. Both coup attempts were planned and organized by revolutionary Jews, both inside and outside Russia, and both attempts were financed by outside Jewish banking houses. To associate Jews with the Russian Revolution in any way is strictly taboo today, but to understand what actually happened in Russia during and after the revolution, and also to understand the impact of the revolution on other nations at the time, it is essential to understand the role Jews played, both in the revolution and in the Russian government thereafter, as well as in the Bolshevik revolutions throughout Europe which followed the Russian Revolution. It is also necessary to understand the nature of the mutual hostility which had long existed between the Tsarist government in Russia and its Jewish subjects. It is necessary, as well, to understand the nature of the mutual animosity that Jews and the ordinary Russian people felt for each other. And finally, it is necessary to understand the vengeful enmity held by Jews throughout the world for the Tsarist regime in Russia, and their relentless determination to one day bring it down. Origin of East European Jews. At the end of the 19th century, the majority of the world's Jews lived in Eastern Europe in a region designated by the Russian government as the Pale of Settlement, a region made up of Poland, Belarus, Ukraine and Lithuania, all a part of the Russian Empire, but not of Russia itself. Just how these Jews got there is an interesting question all its own. The answer is that they were always there. They did not immigrate in from someplace else, this was their native land. These Jews were not the same as the biblical Jews of the Holy Land. They were, rather, the descendants of the Khazar people who had lived since ancient times in the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which is today predominantly occupied by the country of Georgia. The Khazars converted en masse to Judaism during the late 8th century. There is no biological connection between these Yiddish-speaking Khazar Jews and the ancient Semitic Jews of the Holy Land. The descendants of the Khazars are the Ashkenazi Jews of today. 85% of the world's Jews today, and 90% of Jews who live in the United States are Ashkenazi Jews. Yiddish was a sort of Creole language which the Khazars developed and used in their trade and business dealings with Central Europe. Some say that Yiddish is a German dialect, but not quite. The grammatical structure is different from German, though about half of the words of Yiddish are German words. Numerous words in Yiddish are Khazarian in origin. Kagan, for example, a common Jewish last name is a Khazar word for king. The Jewish last name, Kazan, as in Elia Kazan, is a Khazar name. Khazaria, home of the Khazars who are the ancestors of today's Ashkenazi Jews. 85% of the world's Jews today are Ashkenazis. The Khazar people ranged widely over the steppes between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, north to the Ukrainian city of Kiev, and were a mixture of two ethnic types. According to Arthur Koestler, in his book, The 13th Tribe, the southern Khazars tended to be a swarthy, Turkish-Mongol type, while the northern Khazars near at Kiev tended to be blonde and blue-eyed, or more European in appearance. Those two strains can be seen in the Ashkenazi Jews of today. The Khazars adopted Judaism as their national religion at about the same time the Russians adopted the Greek Orthodox religion as their national religion. Both peoples went about their mass conversions in approximately the same way. The Russians brought in numerous Orthodox priests from Constantinople to help build churches and to teach the new religion to the Russian people. The Khazars, likewise, brought in numerous rabbis to teach Judaism to the Khazar people and to help them build synagogues. The Khazar Jews adopted the Talmud, the central text of mainstream Judaism which incorporates Jewish law, ethics, philosophy, customs and Jewish history, and took the whole package as their own. They also adopted all Jewish holy days, as well as all the traditional Jewish rituals and ceremonies. In other words, they adopted Judaism in its entirety, including the Jewish custom of race purity, and forbidding marriage outside of Judaism. These warlike people once ruled the entire region but eventually lost power and then settled in as a religious and ethnic minority amongst the Viking Rus and the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. The Jews of 19th and 20th century Eastern and Central Europe were all descendants of the Khazars. These Khazar Jews, or Ashkenazi Jews, formed the largest ethnic minority in the Russian Empire, totaling 5.2 million according to the 1897 census. Almost all of the Jews of Europe, contrary to popular opinion, migrated into Europe from Khaz area in the east, not from Palestine or the Mediterranean. Though concentrated in Eastern Europe, they also spread throughout Europe and formed small minority populations within the cities and towns of host countries, and formed a sort of parasite-slash-host relationship with the majority Christian populations. They tended to establish themselves in parasitic occupations such as merchant, middleman, trader, and moneylender, and avoided agriculture and labor-intensive occupations. They also tended to isolate themselves in closed communities which became known as ghettos, and they did not marry outside their race. These Ashkenazi Jews were characterized by high intelligence and highly cohesive social organizations with close cooperation and mutual support between themselves, usually at the expense of their non-Jewish host populations. The Jews also had their own laws and code of ethics to govern their lives. The Talmud permits Jews to treat non-Jews differently than they treat fellow Jews. They are instructed to be fair and honest with each other, but are not required to be so with Gentiles. Consequently, they developed a reputation for sharp practice and for taking advantage of well-meaning, unassuming Gentiles. Wherever Jews lived, they were invariably accused of being a parasitic people who created nothing of their own, but lived off the industry of their host populations. Reason for the Russian pogroms against the Jews at the turn of the 20th century: most of the world's Jews lived within the territory controlled by the Russian Empire. At that time, there existed some 650 anti-Jewish statutes as official law in Imperial Russia, deemed necessary to protect the Russian people from Jewish rapaciousness. In no other country in the world was anti-Semitism so deeply ingrained, from the lowest-level bureaucrats and ordinary Russian soldiers who formed the Imperial Army, to the Russian Orthodox Church, the government, and the Tsar himself. Those who filled these organizations, and who therefore regulated and controlled the lives of the millions who fell under their authority, were nearly unanimous in their suspicion, fear, and outright hatred of Russia's Jews. The Jews had a reputation for being mutinous troublemakers, as well as avaricious, aggressive exploiters of their Christian, Gentile host populations. Because they perceived themselves as defenders of the Christian faith and protectors of the Russian people, the Tsars had kept the Jews out of Russia since the Middle Ages. But after the partition of Poland in 1772, at which time the eastern part of Poland was ceded to Russia, most East European Jews became incorporated into the Russian Empire. Even more Jewish subjects were added when Catherine the Great annexed the Ukraine and Crimea. In order to deal with this new Jewish problem, the infamous Pale of Settlement was established in 1791. The Pale of Settlement was a region which began at the western edge of Russia, and included Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belorussia and Bessarabia. This is where the undesirables of the Russian Empire, which included the Jews, were required to live. The Russian government regarded the Jews as a perpetual menace to the continued well-being of the Russian state. This view of the Jews as perpetual troublemakers grew even stronger after the French Revolution of 1789, when the large Jewish role in bringing about that revolution became known. The Jacobins who instigated the French Revolution were predominantly, if not entirely, Jewish. It was also the Jews who financed the French Revolution, men such as Benjamin Goldsmid and his brother Abraham Goldsmid, their partner Moses Mokata and his nephew Moses Montefiore, all of London, along with Daniel Itzig and his son-in-law David Friedlander of Berlin, and Herz Surfbier of Alsace, among others. The Tsars were worried about the stability of the Russian Empire and worried about this Jewish tendency to foment revolution. The draconian restrictions on Jews were imposed in defense of Russia, not just to make life difficult for Jews. Alexander Ray, a kindly and compassionate man by all accounts, came to the Russian throne in 1855 and began to implement fundamental changes in Russia, notably the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, but with the best of intentions he also lifted many of the restrictions on Jews. Jews considered useful, like merchants, doctors and some artisans, were permitted to settle in Russia on a limited basis. Opening Russia's borders to Jewish immigration, even on a limited basis, proved difficult to control, however, and Jews flooded into Russia in large numbers. The Jewish communities in St. Petersburg, Moscow and Odessa especially grew rapidly. Through their close, in-group cooperation, their emphasis on acquiring higher educations, and their pattern of working together to advance themselves and their fellow Jews at the exclusion of Gentiles, they soon began to dominate certain professions such as medicine, journalism, the law, finance and entrepreneurship. Jews also gradually achieved monopolies over the liquor, tobacco and retail industries, as the Gentiles were elbowed out. This pattern of behavior created hostility among the Russian people, and a predictable wave of anti-Semitism then ensued. Jews were accused of creating a state within a state for the purpose of dominating and exploiting Russia. A Jewish town, in the Pale of Settlement. Ashkenazi Jews in the Pale of Settlement, a large region which included Poland, Ukraine, Belorussia and Lithuania and Bessarabia. Ashkenazi Jews were the descendants of the Khazarians. Konstantin Petrovich Bobednostsev, who was a political advisor to both Alexander Ria and Nicholas I, wrote in a letter to the openly anti-Semitic writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, "What you write about the Yids is completely just. They have engrossed everything, they have undermined everything, but the spirit of the century supports them. They are at the root of the revolutionary socialist movement and of regicide. They own a periodical press, they have in their hands the financial markets. The people as a whole fall into financial slavery to them. They even control the principles of contemporary science and strive to place it outside of Christianity. Despite the prosperity they were able to achieve in Russia, and the fair treatment accorded them by Russian czars, the Jews began fomenting unrest, particularly labor unrest, and they involved themselves in revolutionary activities. The Jews formed the Social Revolutionary Party, for example, for the specific purpose of overthrowing the Tsar. Both anarchism and nihilism were Jewish movements. In 1881 Tsar Alexander was assassinated by a group of Jewish revolutionaries. Soon thereafter, this same group began a series of assassinations of other government or public officials. In 1901 they murdered the Tsar's Minister of Education, in 1902 they killed the Minister of the Interior, in 1903 the Governor of Ufa was assassinated, in 1904 the Premier of Russia was killed, in 1905 Grand Duke Sergei, the Tsar's uncle, was killed. Then, in 1905 the Jews attempted a revolution to overthrow the Tsarist government, though it did not succeed. In 1906 the Jews assassinated General Dubrasov. In 1911, the Jewish terrorist Mordechai Bogrov assassinated Prime Minister Peter Stolypin. He shot him in the back of the head during a gala in Kiev, which was also attended by the Tsar. Assassination of those who stand in the way of Jewish interests has a long tradition amongst the Jews. The Israeli Mossad carries out routine assassinations today. 5. Iranian nuclear scientists have most recently been assassinated by the Mossad. See, also, the movie Munich, in which Mossad assassinations are carried out. These Jewish assassinations, as well as other Jewish revolutionary activities, so infuriated the new Tsar, Alexander II, especially the assassination of his own father, that he issued the following statement: "For some time the government has given its attention to the Jews and to their relations with the rest of the inhabitants of the empire, with a view of ascertaining the sad condition of the Christian inhabitants brought about by the conduct of the Jews in business matters. During the last 20 years, the Jews have gradually possessed themselves of not only every trade and business in all its branches, but also of a great part of the land by buying or farming it. With few exceptions, they have as a body devoted their attention, not to enriching or benefiting the country, but to defrauding, by their wiles, its inhabitants, and particularly its poor inhabitants. This conduct of theirs has called forth protests on the part of the people, has manifested in acts of violence. The government, while on the one hand doing its best to put down the disturbances and to deliver the Jews from oppression and slaughter, has also on the other hand, thought it a matter of urgency and justice to adopt stringent measures in order to put an end to the oppression practiced by the Jews on the inhabitants, and to free the country from their malpractices, which were, as is known, the cause of the agitation. The Tsarist government ordered a crackdown, and one by one, most of these Jews were rounded up and brought to trial. Though more than justified, the Tsar's retaliation against these Jewish assassins produced the usual outcries of anti-Semitism and persecution, as well as predictions of extermination, which were then trumpeted throughout the international Jewish press. The Russian people eventually became fed up with the Jews, and a wave of pogroms spread throughout the southwestern regions of Russia where Jews were most populous. More than 250 pogroms, varying in length and severity, occurred in 1881 alone. These were for the most part spontaneous attacks on Jews by ethnic Christian Russians, and not the work of the Tsarist government. These pogroms received extensive coverage in international Jewish magazines and newspapers at the time, with the usual sensational exaggerations and dire predictions of planned genocide. International Jewry's desire to retaliate against Russia was extremely intensified by these breathless exaggerations and by the malicious propaganda attacks on the Tsar. The truth is that it was the Russian people, themselves, who were behind the pogroms, not the Tsarist government. The Tsarist government even conducted an investigation to find out who was behind them, and did all it could to prevent them. The investigation concluded that the pogroms were the result of Jewish financial exploitation of the peasants and the accumulated resentment among the peasants as a result of it. The Jews constantly fomented trouble of one kind or another throughout Russia. As already described, they assassinated Russian officials, they incited labor unrest by pitting workers against their employers, they organized demonstrations, and they made continuous attempts to stir up revolution. To contain this revolutionary activity, the government began a policy of repression of the Jews in 1882 which continued right up to the Russian Revolution in 1917. In 1888, Alexander II began to push the Jews out of Russia, back into the Pale of Settlement. Jews were forbidden to buy or rent property in Russia. They were denied jobs in the civil service, and they were forbidden to trade on Sundays and Christian holidays. Nicholas I succeeded his father Alexander II in 1894, and he continued his father's strict rules against the Jews. He felt the repressive rules were necessary to protect the Russian people against the schemes and intrigues of the Jews, and also to prevent public disorder. But he was unable to stop the pogroms against the Jews which were being carried out by ordinary Russian people. These seemed to erupt spontaneously on a regular basis out of hostility and hatred of the Jews, and could not be contained. Jews leave Russia for America. The Jews accepted no responsibility for any of this, but saw it instead as just more of the usual unjustified persecution of guiltless Jews by hostile Gentiles. As a result of this hostility and hatred, Jews saw the Russian Empire as an inhospitable and dangerous land for Jews. Their plight was made worse by an explosive population growth rate, the highest of any ethnic group in Europe, which further limited economic possibilities for them. There were too many Jews and too few opportunities for them in Russia. At the end of the 19th century they decided to leave Russia, en masse, for the New World, that is, the United States of America. Between 1881 and 1924, more than 2 million Russian and East European Jews immigrated to the United States, the largest mass migration of Jews in history. A great number also spread out over Western Europe. The two great Jewish movements of Zionism and communism had been developed and nurtured within the Pale of Settlement, and when they migrated to America, they took these two movements with them. Communism was introduced to America for the first time by these new immigrant Jews. The United States turned out to be everything they had hoped for. It proved to be the land of opportunity for Jews, with no constraints or restrictions on them of any kind. The American people had no experience with Jews, and therefore had formed no negative attitudes towards them. After becoming settled in the New World, mainly in New York City, they quickly began to fill up the universities, find positions in banking and finance, start up newspapers, and they began to flood into the professions. The German Jewish immigrants who had preceded them were already powerful in all of these areas, and they gave their fellow tribesmen from Russia a hand up. By employing their usual methods of intense networking, in-group cooperation and mutual support, these new Jewish immigrants began to rise to positions of dominance in America. Following their usual pattern, once ensconced in a position of power, a Jew will then invariably bring in only other Jews until all the non-Jews who preceded them are gradually displaced. By these methods, they soon came to dominate journalism, academia and particularly banking and finance. But these nouveau-riche American Jews still remained an integral part of the international Jewish nation, and they were more than willing to use their newfound wealth to support and defend the interests of international Jewry. Their visceral hatred of Russia remained a part of the Jewish psyche, which was only exacerbated by frantic stories of continued repression of their brethren who had remained in Russia. As their power and influence in America grew, they plotted and schemed about ways to use their power to undermine and destroy the Tsarist government. Jewish bankers in both Europe and America were ready to provide any funding necessary to bring about the downfall of the Tsar and his regime. Russian officials were well aware of this Jewish scheming against Russia, and frequently commented on the fact that Jewish power and influence in Western countries was directed at undermining Russia and the Tsar. The German-born Jew, Jacob Schiff, one of the wealthiest bankers in the world, and head of the international bank, Kuhn-Loeb & Company based in New York, had a particularly virulent hatred for Russia and was determined to do all he could to bring down the Tsar. In 1905, Russia and Japan went to war over control of Manchuria in northern China. Schiff and his Kuhn-Loeb bank floated a huge loan to finance Japan in the war, while at the same time, using his international banking influence to block funding of Russia. The result was a shocking Japanese victory. Japan defeated the Russian army at Port Arthur in Manchuria, and then sank the Russian fleet in the Battle of Tsushima in the waters between Korea and Japan. This was to be the first defeat of a European power by a non-European power, but it could not have been achieved without the backing and support of international Jewry. The attempted Russian Revolution of 1905 was planned by Jewish revolutionaries, financed by Jewish banks, and staged to coincide with Russia's war with Japan. The official Jewish Communal Register of New York City of 1917 to 1918 carried the following statement: the firm of Kuhn-Loeb & Company, Jacob Schiff's bank, floated the large Japanese war loans of 1904 to 5, thus making possible the Japanese victory over Russia. Mr. Schiff has always used his wealth and influence in the best interest of his people, Jews. He financed the enemies of autocratic Russia and used his influence to keep Russia from the money market of the United States. Financing the 1917 revolution. Two great blocks of Jewish bankers, the London and Paris-based Rothschilds with their extensive network of banks, and the so-called German-American bankers, under the control of Jacob Schiff, cooperated together to finance the Russian Revolution. Schiff, a German-born Jew, was an international banker of Wall Street, closely allied with other German and American Jewish bankers, including the German-born Warbecks of New York and Hamburg, the Guggenheims, the Hanauers, the Kahns, and others. The Warbecks, both in Germany and in the US, were actually related to Jacob Schiff. One was his brother-in-law and the other a son-in-law. Other international Jewish financiers allied with Jacob Schiff and the Kuhn-Loeb Bank included the Westphalian Land Syndicate in Germany, the Lazar Brothers of Paris, the Ginsbergs of Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, Tokyo and Paris, Speyer and Company of London, New York and Frankfurt am Main, and, significantly, the Nyabanken of Stockholm, Sweden, under a Swedish Jew, Olof Eskeberg. These banking blocks were international in the truest sense, owned and operated by international Jews who were loyal to no nation except international Jewry. In their mission to bring down the Tsar, the two banking groups jointly financed a propaganda campaign against Tsarist Russia which had the effect, as intended, of creating worldwide hostility toward the Russian Empire. This anti-Tsarist propaganda campaign was propagated through and trumpeted by all the major newspapers throughout Europe and America, as well as through all other information media, almost all of which was under Jewish control. They were to conduct this same kind of propaganda campaign, except on a much larger scale, against Germany after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. As mentioned above, Jacob Schiff hated Tsarist Russia and was especially active in attempts to undermine the Tsarist government. But it was the Rothschilds who were behind the dethroning of Tsar Nicholas I in 1917, after which a provisional government was established, with Prince Georgy Lvov as its prime minister, soon thereafter to be replaced by the Jew Alexander Kerensky, mother's name, Nadezhda. As mentioned previously, one of the first acts of the provisional government under Kerensky, March 16, 1917, was to abolish all restrictions on Jews throughout Russia. Up to that time Jews had been barred from government jobs, but suddenly they were allowed to take positions in any available government office in Russia. With all restrictions against them removed, Jews quickly became active in every aspect of the revolution, obtaining leadership positions in several political parties. Seeing opportunity for themselves, Jews in large numbers began to flood into St. Petersburg and Moscow from the shtetls in the Pale of Settlement, from Europe, and from America. Shtetl is a Yiddish word meaning town. Shtetl life was depicted in the movie Fiddler on the Roof. These rural Jewish towns, shtetls, were spread throughout the Pale of Settlement, that is, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Lithuania. Now that the Tsar was gone, Lenin and 32 other Bolsheviks, nearly all Jews, were brought into Petrograd by the German General Staff by train from Switzerland for the purpose of destabilizing the Russian government. The intent was to take Russia out of the war. Lenin had opposed Russia's entry into the war from the beginning, and even called for ordinary soldiers to turn their guns against the officers who had led them into the slaughter. Lenin and his entourage arrived at the Finland station in Leningrad on April 16, 1917. The Germans were well aware of the Jewish character of this revolutionary movement and recruited a Jew, Alexander Helfand, who took the name of Pavas, to act as an intermediary between the German government and the Bolsheviks. Large sums of money were sent into Lenin and the Bolsheviks by the German government through Helfand. Helfand was born in Ust in Belarus, got a Ph.D. in economics, moved to Berlin and became an associate of the Jewish Communist Revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg. Lenin received funding from both the German government and international Jewish banks. With secret German funding, Lenin immediately went to work setting up some 41 newspapers and other periodicals in Russia, including the newspaper Pravda, which was to eventually become the official mouthpiece of the Bolshevik government, through which to trumpet the communist line to the Russian public. Germany's interest in funding Lenin, as stated above, was to take Russia out of the war. But the international Jewish bankers had another agenda. Their interest in funding Lenin was to bring down the Tsarist government and replace it with a Jewish revolutionary government. Germany was later to learn that she had made a pact with the devil. A member of the German General Staff later wrote, "We neither knew nor foresaw the danger to humanity from the consequences of this journey of the Bolsheviks to Russia." It was Jacob Schiff and the Kuhn-Loeb Bank, together with the Warburg banks, both in America and in Germany, who engineered Trotsky's return to Russia. Trotsky's revolutionary activities were financed through the Nyarbanken in Stockholm, Sweden, headed by the Jew, Olaf Askberg, who had close ties with Max Warburg and Jacob von Furstenberg, both Jewish bankers. A trust account was set up at Nyarbanken into which millions of Kuhn-Loeb's dollars were deposited. Nyarbanken became known as the Bolshevik Bank. The Jewish ambassador from America to Sweden, R. Nelson Morris, served as a virtual conduit between Kuhn-Loeb in New York and Nyarbanken in Stockholm. Ambassador Morris ostensibly represented American interests in Sweden, but as a Jew, he used his office to serve the interests of international Jewry. Trotsky and 267 Russian, Yiddish-speaking Jews from the Jewish immigrant community in New York City made their way to Petrograd with Schiff's help to join Lenin in the revolution. Numerous other New York Jews were to follow. Trotsky arrived on April 17, the day after Lenin's arrival. Though Trotsky and the other Jews who came with him were not American citizens, they had obtained American passports which facilitated their re-entry into Russia. This was done by the intervention of the Jewish U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. Brandeis was very close to President Wilson, and he persuaded Wilson to direct the State Department to issue the passports. After arriving in Petrograd, Lenin and Trotsky joined forces. With the money provided by Jacob Schiff, combined with the money from the German government, Trotsky and Lenin organized an armed Bolshevik uprising. The provisional government was overthrown and on November 7, 1917, October 25 according to the Russian calendar, a Soviet Socialist Republic was established. Trotsky soon took control of the Russian army and set about to reorganize it into the Red Army of the proletariat. One of his first acts was to set up Soviets councils of soldiers for every detachment, battalion, regiment, and division in the army. The old Tsarist officers were then purged out of the army. Eventually these Soviets took the places of all the commanding officers and their staffs. This turned out to be unworkable and had a demoralizing effect on the army. To make matters worse, inexperienced Jewish officers filled the important vacancies left by the purged Tsarist officers. Chaos reigned. This new Red Army was no match for the German army and was unable to resist the German offensive of February 1918, which finally took Russia out of the war. Trotsky and the Red Army to correct the problems he had created, Trotsky formed a military council of former Russian generals that would function as an advisory body. He was eventually forced to bring former Tsarist officers back into the army, but this was fiercely resented by the new Bolshevik leaders of the army. They believed that the Red Army should consist only of dedicated revolutionaries. They viewed the former imperial officers and generals as potential traitors who should be kept out of the new military, much less put in charge of it. Trotsky solved this problem by creating a corps of political commissars, one of which would be attached to each and every unit in the Red Army and who then reported directly to Trotsky. The commissars were to be supreme in all matters, even superior to the commanding officers, but their main job was to keep an eye on the regular army officers and report back on their attitudes, utterances and activities to Trotsky himself. The commissars set up a spy network which made it impossible for anyone to oppose Trotsky. Trotsky saw to it that any individual or group even suspected of disloyalty was ruthlessly exterminated. Nearly all of the commissars were Jews. Of the few who were not, almost none were ethnic Russians. It was by this method that Trotsky and his fellow Jews gained complete control of every branch of the army and navy. The Bolsheviks' hold on Russia was still tenuous at this point and opposition rose against them from every quarter. Civil war broke out when the White Army, composed of Cossacks and former Tsarist officers, rose up against the Bolsheviks and the new Red Army under Trotsky and his Jews. The White Army was Christian and virulently anti-Semitic. Their slogan was "Strike the Jews and Save Russia." Young Jewish men from all over Russia, as well as from surrounding countries, rushed into the ranks of the Red Army, many of whom could not even speak Russian. Several hundred Jews even came from the United States to join the new Red Army, most from the Lower East Side of New York City. The Christian White Army lost the Civil War to the Jewish-controlled Red Army for one reason and one reason only. Jewish financiers controlled the money supply in Europe and the United States, as well as in much of the rest of the world, and they provided the Red Army with unlimited funding as well as unlimited supplies of arms and ammunition, while at the same time refusing funding to the White Army. They also used their influence to block funding to the White Army from many other sources. Anthony C. Sutton wrote in his book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, New Rochelle, 1974, a number of very wealthy Jews in Wall Street firms contributed to the communist regime during its early years when it was already soaked with the blood of innocent people who were being killed, exiled and expropriated simply because of their former class status. The largely Jewish government was taking a terrible vengeance against those who had prospered in the days of the Tsars. The Wall Street capitalists were aiding the mostly Jewish rulers of Russia in a government dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism is vivid proof of the solidarity of a race with a long record of being perpetual aliens, no matter in what land they happen to be residing. Blood is thicker than water. Jews comprised less than 2% of the Russian population, yet they now had total control of every branch of the government as well as the armed forces. Jews in the government of Bolshevik Russia, according to British newspaperman Robert Wilton, in his book, The Last Days of the Romanovs, 1920, the Bolshevik government in Russia was totally dominated by Jews. Wilton had been the Times of London's man in Moscow from 1902 through 1919 and was in position to witness everything that happened in the revolution and who was behind it, and he regularly reported back on it. Wilton was in Russia during her shocking defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, through all the stresses and strains of internal Russian politics, the violent Potemkin and Bloody Sunday events of 1905, and the ominous revolutionary activities, from exile, of Lenin and Trotsky. He was there through the Great War of 1914 to 1918, and witnessed the chaotic conditions that followed. He witnessed and reported on the Russian Revolution. He knew the facts as few others did. He knew and reported the fact that it was the Jews who were behind the revolution and the Jews who had taken over the Russian state. In 1919, the Soviet press provided a list of 556 important figures of the Soviet government, identifying their ethnicity. Wilton obtained this list and reported it back to London. He also included it as an appendix in his book, The Last Days of the Romanovs, 1920, of which this author has a copy. The list included 17 Russians, 2 Ukrainians, 11 Armenians, 35 Lets, 15 Germans, 1 Hungarian, 10 Georgians, 3 Poles, 3 Finns, 1 Czech, 1 Karaim, Jewish sect, and 457 Jews. This list is provided below, so there can be no refuting the fact that Jews dominated the communist government of the Soviet Union. Central Committee. 62 members name. 42 Jews nationality. 20 Gentiles Jew Armenian Let, Latvian, Jew Russian Jew German Jew Czech, probably Jew Georgian Jew Russian Jew Let Russian, Past Jew Russian Let Jew. Svtlov, President, Avanasov, Secretary, Bruno Babchinsky Buka in Galis Gansberg Danishevsky Starkson Middling Landau Linda Dimenstein and Kukidzerman Jovkar Klein Nijison Rosenfeld, Kamenev, Upfelbaum, Zinoviev, Kryenko Krasikov Saks Kaprik Kalayanov, Lenin, Letizis Landalanscharsky Peterson Peters Rudsters Rosin. Smidovich Stouchka Nakumks, Steklov, Sosnovsky Skritnik Bronstein, Trotsky, Dodovich Terianowritsky Telichkin Feldman Frumkine Sauri Upachavchavads Sikman Rosenthal Akinazi Karakin Rose Sabelson, Radk, Schlechter Sokolinich Kliensky Levine. 15. Extraordinary Commission of Moscow. Jew Let Jew Jew Armenian Jew Russian Jew Ukrainian Georgian Jew Mauritian Jew Karaim Jew 36 members name. 20 for Jews. 12 Gentiles nationality. Dzyinski, President, Peters, Vice President, Chklovsky Kafis Zystine Razmirovich Kronberg Kakina Carlson Schulman. Pole, Jew, Let Jew S. Let Jew. Leontovich Jacob Goldine Lapestein Nezen Latsis Silinkas Jansen Rivki Nadonov Delafaba Sidkine Rosk Irovich G. Svdlov B. Izansky Blyumkine Alexandrovich I. Model Rutenberg Pine Sax Dable Soundalkanin Liebert Bogelzakis The Council of the People's Commissars. Jew Let Jew Russian Jew Russian Jew Let Armenian Let apostrophe Jew German Let. 22 members ministry. 17 Jews name. 5 Gentiles nationality. President Foreign Affairs Nationalities Agriculture Economic Council Food Army and Navy. Ulyanov, Lenin, Chitrin Jagashvili, Stalin, Prishin Lurie, Lerin, Schlechter Bronstein, Trotsky Russian, Part Jew, Russian Georgian Armenian Jew. State control State lands works social relief public instructions religions interior hygiene finance press elections justice refugees assist. Refugees, assist. Lander Kaufman v. Schmidt E. Lalina, Nijison, Launacharsky Spitsberger Felbaum, Zinoviev, Anvaltazidor Gukovsky Volarski Aritsky I. Steinberg Fenigstein Savich Zaslovsky. Jew S. Russian Jew. Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party. 12 members name. 10 Jews. The Gentiles nationality. Bronstein, Trotsky, Felbaum, Zinoviev, Lurie, Lerin, Aritsky Volarski Rosenthal, Kamenev, Smidovich Svtlov, Yankel, Nakumks, Steklov, Ulyanov, Lenin, Krymko Launacharsky Central Committees. Jew Russian, Part Jew, Russian 11 members, all Jews 6 members, 5 Jews 15 members, 13 Jews 12 members, 10 Jews 5 members, 4 Jews. Mensheviks Communists of the People's Socialist Reverend Party, Right Wing, Socialist Reverend Party, Left Wing, Committee of the Anarchists. Polish Communist Party Ministry of the Commissariat. 12 members, all Jews 5 Gentiles 20 Gentiles. 22 members Central Executive Committee. 17 Jews 41 Jews. 61 members. It has often been noted that Jews are the only ethnic group who routinely change their names. One of their methods of gaining power and control is to insinuate themselves into high office insidiously, while concealing the fact that they are Jewish. Adopting a Russian name in Russia or an English name in America is done for that purpose. That accounts for the adoption of different names by so many of the Jewish Bolsheviks involved in the Russian Revolution. According to Albert Lindemann, in his book Esau's Tears, Modern Anti-Semitism and the Rise of the Jews, 1997, several of the leading non-Jews in the Bolshevik movement, including Lenin, might be termed Jewified non-Jews. For example, he writes, Lenin openly and repeatedly praised the role of Jews in the revolutionary movement. He was married to a Jew, spoke Yiddish and his children spoke Yiddish. Lenin once said, an intelligent Russian is almost always a Jew or someone with Jewish blood in their veins. Even if he was only 1/4 Jew, Lenin lived as a Jew and surrounded himself with Jews. A British government white paper, of April, 1919 stated, it was an open secret that the overthrow of the Russian government and the seizure of power with incalculable consequences for the rest of the world was largely organized by international Jewish revolutionaries. The world's greatest land mass was being hijacked. Mr. M. Dendijk, the representative of the Netherlands government in St. Petersburg, who was in charge of British interests after the liquidation of the British embassy by the Bolsheviks, sent in a report to Foreign Secretary Sir Arthur Balfour. I consider that the immediate suppression of Bolshevism is the greatest issue now before the world, not even excluding the war which is still raging, and unless Bolshevism is nipped in the bud immediately it is bound to spread in one form or another over Europe, and the whole world, as it is organized and worked by Jews, who have no nationality, and whose one object is to destroy for their own ends the existing order of things. Winston Churchill agreed with this view, in an article he wrote for the Illustrated Sunday Herald, February 8, 1920, it may well be that this same astounding race, Jews, may at the present time be in the actual process of providing another system of morals and philosophy, as malevolent as Christianity was benevolent, which if not arrested, would shatter irretrievably all that Christianity has rendered possible. This movement among the Jews is not new. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century, and now at last this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire. Hilaire Belloc wrote in the British G.K. Weekly, on February 4, 1937, as for anyone who does not know that the present revolutionary movement is Jewish in Russia, I can only say that he must be a man who is taken in by the suppression of our despicable press. Even the Jews did not deny it. An article in the Jewish Chronicle on April 4, 1919 stated, "The conceptions of Bolshevism are in harmony in most points with the ideas of Judaism." In his book, The Jewish Century, Yuri Slezkine describes the astonishing rise of Jews to elite status in all areas of Soviet society after the revolution, in culture, the universities, professional occupations, the media, and government. Slezkine, a Russian Jew himself, immigrated to America in 1983 and became a professor at UC Berkeley. After the revolution, he wrote, millions of Jews left the shtetl towns of Russia to move to Moscow and other Russian cities to take up elite positions in the new Soviet state. Claire Sheridan, the notorious cousin of Winston Churchill, and a well-known sculptress, and friend of Leon Trotsky, traveled to Russia in the autumn of 1920 to create sculptures of prominent Bolsheviks, including Lenin, Trotsky, Dzynsky and Kanev. She said, "The communists are Jews, and Russia is being entirely administered by them. They are in every government office. They are driving out the Russians." The Jewish Chronicle of January 6, 1933 stated, "Over one-third of Jews in Russia have become officials." M. Cohen wrote, in The Communist, April 12, 1919, "The Great Russian Revolution was indeed accomplished by the hands of the Jews. There are no Jews in the ranks of the Red Army as far as privates are concerned. But in the committees, and in the Soviet organizations commissars, the Jews are gallantly leading the masses." The symbol of Jewry has become the symbol of the Russian proletariat, which can be seen in the fact of the adoption of the five-pointed star, which in former times was the symbol of Zionism and Jewry. Adriana Tokova-Williams, in her book, From Liberty to Brest-Litovsk, Macmillan, 1919, wrote, "There are few Russians among the Bolshevist war pullers, that is few men imbued with the all-Russian culture and interests of the Russian people. None of them have been in any way prominent in any stage of former Russian life. Besides obvious foreigners, Bolshevism recruited many adherents from among migrants who had spent many years abroad. Some of them had never been to Russia before. They especially numbered a great many Jews. They spoke Russian badly. The nation over which they had seized power was a stranger to them, and besides, they behaved as invaders in a conquered country. Throughout the revolution generally and Bolshevism in particular, the Jews occupied a very influential position. This phenomenon is both curious and complex." An article in a widely known French journal, Illustration, of September 14, 1918, carried this comment, "When one lives in constant contact with the functionaries who are serving the Bolshevik government, one feature strikes the attention, which is that almost all of them are Jews. I am not at all anti-Semitic, but I must state what strikes the eye, everywhere in Petrograd, in Moscow, in provincial districts, in commissariats, in district offices, in Smolny, in the Soviets, I have met nothing but Jews and again Jews." And this, in a speech by Adolf Hitler, September 1937, in 1936 we proved by means of a whole series of astounding statistics that in Russia today more than 98% of the leading positions are occupied by Jews. Who were the leaders in our Bavarian Workers' Republic? Who were the leaders of the Spartacist movement? Who were the real leaders and financiers of the Communist Party? Jews, every one of them. The position was the same in Hungary and in the red parts of Spain. And Churchill, again, in an article he wrote for the Illustrated Sunday Herald, in London, on February 8, 1920, "There is no need to exaggerate the part played in the creation of Bolshevism and in the actual bringing about of the Russian Revolution by these international, and for the most part, atheistical, Jews. It is certainly a very great one, it probably outweighs all others. With the notable exception of Lenin. Lenin was 1/4 Jew, spoke Yiddish and had a Jewish wife. The majority of the leading figures are Jews. Moreover, the principal inspiration and driving power comes from the Jewish leaders. In the Soviet institutions the predominance of Jews is even more astounding. And the principal part in the system of terrorism applied by the Extraordinary Commissions for Combating Counter-Revolution, Cheka, has been taken by Jews. Proof of the Jewish nature of the Russian Revolution and of the preponderance of Jews in the Bolshevik government, as well as their role in the communist revolutions which swept Europe afterwards, is irrefutable. Nevertheless, one will not find this information in modern textbooks in either American nor European universities. No scholar may state these facts or write them in a book if he hopes to have his book published and promoted in the mainstream publishing industry, or if he hopes to have a career as a scholar. No politician dares utter these facts if he hopes to remain a politician. The only permissible story is that the Jews are now and always have been Western Christian civilization's blameless victims. To say otherwise makes one an anti-Semite, worthy only to be cast out of civilized society. This is the nature of Jewish power. Chapter 5 The Red Terror. The Jewish-controlled media uses the word Holocaust with a capital H, today in reference to what purportedly happened to Jews at the hands of Nazi Germany during World War II. But the real Holocaust of the 20th century was that which the Jews inflicted upon the Russian people during and after the Russian Revolution of 1917. This was one of the bloodiest episodes in history during which vast millions of Russian Christians were murdered. The aim of the new Jewish overlords was to completely eliminate the upper classes, or the possessing classes, collectively known as the bourgeoisie, including men, women and children. The most intelligent, most able, most high-achieving segment of the population was wiped out, leaving a population of ignorant workers and peasants. Even the Tsar and his family were murdered by the Jews. In order to bring about their new Marxist utopia, the old Russian culture would have to be completely deracinated and replaced by the new Marxist culture. By the time the Bolshevik Jews completed the extermination of these classes, the old Russia portrayed in the novels of Tolstoy, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Chekhov and Gorky simply did not exist anymore. After gaining control of the state, the Jews began to extend their control to every corner of the Russian government and of Russian society. In order to overcome opposition and to subdue the Russian population, a secret police organization was established in December 1917, called the Extraordinary Commission for Combat in Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, known by its acronym, Cheka. At this time, a half-dozen other political parties were in existence, in addition to the Bolshevik Party, all of which were also controlled by Jews. One of them was the Socialist Revolutionary Party, or the Left SR Party. When the Left SR Party revolted against the Bolsheviks, the Cheka rounded 350 of them up and summarily shot them. Ironically, most of the members of the SR Party were also Jews. On August 17, 1918, a young military cadet assassinated the Jewish head of the Petrograd Cheka, Moiritsky, in retaliation for the execution of his friend and fellow cadet. Soon afterwards, on August 28, 1918, the Jewess, Fania Kaplan, a member of the Left SR Party, incensed over the execution of her fellow party members by the Cheka, nearly succeeded in assassinating Lenin. In reaction to these two events, the Bolsheviks began a bloody wave of persecutions which became known as the Red Terror. The Red Terror was set in motion within hours of the attempted assassination of Lenin by the Jewish chairman of the Central Executive Committee, Yakov Svitlov, in an official decree. The decree called for a merciless mass terror against all the enemies of the revolution. All political parties were banned, and some 800 members of the Soviet Socialist parties, both the Left SR and the Right SR, were rounded up and shot. In addition, 6,300 other political enemies were also reported to have been shot within the first year, though this number is almost certainly greatly understated. Left, Yakov Svitlov, the Jewish chairman of the Central Executive Committee, initiated the Red Terror. He also ordered the murder of the Tsar and his family. An unrestrained orgy of rape, torture, summary executions and murder all over Russia on an unheard-of scale then ensued, carried out by the Cheka. Whole populations were liquidated, including independent farmers known as gulags, ethnic minorities, the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, the landed gentry, senior military officers, intellectuals, artists, clergy, opposition members and anyone who aroused the slightest suspicion. Bolshevik leaders openly proclaimed that the Red Terror was necessary for the extermination of entire social groups, especially the former ruling classes, in order to make way for the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Jew, Martin Latsis, chief of the Ukrainian Cheka, explained in the newspaper, Red Terror, we are engaged in exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Do not look in the file of incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs, what is his background, his education, his profession. These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused. That is the meaning and essence of the Red Terror. The Cheka grew rapidly and became a very large, very cruel state security organization. Its organizational structure was changed several times over the following years, as was its name, from Cheka to GPU, to NKVD, and finally to KGB, but its mission remained essentially the same. Cheka offices were set up in every city and town. By 1921 a single branch of the Cheka called the Troops for the Internal Defense of the Republic, numbering 200,000, was given the responsibility of policing and actually running the massive gulag system of labor camps. There is no way to know the precise number of deaths the Cheka was responsible for, but it surely ran into the scores of millions. This would include victims of forced collectivization, the forced famine, of which more later, large purges, expulsions, banishments, executions, and mass death in the Gulag. Harvard historian Richard Pipes, himself a Jew, in his book The Russian Revolution 1990, verifies that 3/4 of the staff of the Cheka were Jews, many of them riffraff, incapable of any other work, cut off from the Jewish community, although careful to spare fellow Jews. Russian poet and writer, Vladimir Sologin, in Bloodlust of Bolshevism wrote that 50% of the Cheka were Jews with Jewish names, while 25% were Jews who had taken Russian names. The remaining 25% was made up of Lets, Latvians, Poles, Georgians, and other minorities, but very few members of the Cheka were ethnic Russians. Moreover, of the non-Jewish members, left, Cheka head, Felix Dzynsky, a significant number of them had Jewish wives. Conclusion: the Cheka was a Jewish organization, formed as the enforcement branch of the now Jewish-controlled state. These Cheka members had no compunctions about killing Russians, as they were not ethnic Russians themselves. In fact, they harbored a deep, burning hatred for the Russians and eagerly looked forward to the opportunity for revenge. Every single one of those in supervisory positions in the Cheka were Jews. The first head of the Cheka was Moses Ritsky, a Jew, who was soon assassinated. His successor was a Polish communist revolutionary from a noble family named Felix Dzyński. Dzyński was a non-practicing Roman Catholic, but was what has been called a Jewified non-Jew. Some sources say he was half Jew. He spoke Yiddish and his family spoke Yiddish, so he may well have been. Dzyński's second-in-command was the Jew, I.S. Unschlicht. The torture branch of the Cheka was controlled over the years by Henryk Jagoda and Yuri Andropov, both Jews, and finally by Lavrenti Beria, who was also not Russian, but Georgian, as was his boss Stalin. About the Cheka, Felix Dzyński was quoted as saying, "The Cheka is not a court. We stand for organized terror. The Cheka is obligated to defend the revolution and conquer the enemy even if its sword by chance sometimes falls upon the heads of the innocent." Creation of the Gulag. Matvey Berman and Nadfi Frenkel, both Jews and both members of the Cheka, created the infamous Gulag, which was the largest concentration camp system and the most horrendous slave labor system in history, in which millions of Russian Christians were slaughtered. The Nazi system of concentration camps and slave labor camps which came later was minuscule by comparison. Yet, the term concentration camp is universally associated, not with communist Russia under the Jews. These three men in succession ran the torture branch of the Cheka over the years, and were responsible for the deaths of millions of Russians. Jagoda and Andropov were Jewish. Beria was a Georgian, as Stalin was, and one of the few top Cheka leaders who was not a Jew. Beria later became head of the NKVD. But with Nazi Germany. Everybody knows about Auschwitz today, but who has ever heard of Kolyma, Magadan, the Solovetsky Islands, or the great centers of massive death in Siberia? Only those who have read the works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. There is no mention of them in the mainstream media. Yet, exponentially more people died in those camps than died at Auschwitz, or all of the Nazi camps combined. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that all the camps were commanded by Jews with names like Rapoport, Solz, and Spiegelders. But international Jewry has gone to great lengths to make sure that this kind of information does not become common knowledge. When Solzhenitsyn's books, The Gulag Archipelago, and One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, among others, were published back during the Cold War, Solzhenitsyn not only received the Nobel Prize, but also world acclaim for exposing the brutality and inhumanity of the Soviet system, though the Jewish role in it was never emphasized. All of his books were published in several languages, including English, and were highly promoted both in Britain and the United States. Not so his latest book, 200 Years Together, first published in Russia in 2003, which is about the 200 years the Jews lived in Russia amongst the Russian people. In this book, Solzhenitsyn exposes the Jewish nature of the Russian Revolution and identifies the Jews as the perpetrators of the mass murder of scores of millions of Russian Christians during the revolution and afterwards. This book, unlike all his others, has yet to be published in English, and no interest has yet been shown by any publishing house in doing so. Jews control the publishing industry in the English-speaking world, and they have no intention of publishing this book in English. Moreover, they have exerted extreme pressure to prevent non-Jewish publishers from doing so. This kind of information is taboo today and its suppression is strictly enforced. Nevertheless, facts are facts, and sooner or later, someone will translate this book into English. Some parts of it have already been translated into English and posted on the internet. Bolsheviks killed the Tsar on July 17, 1918. The Tsar and his family were murdered by a group of Jewish Bolsheviks. After the Tsar's abdication, the Bolsheviks took him and his family to the Ural mountain town of Ekaterinburg, where they remained for several months as political prisoners, living in a house under guard by the Cheka. The Tsar, his wife Alexandra, their 14-year-old son Alexis, their 4 daughters, their doctor, their cook and 2 other attendants were finally taken to the cellar of the house and shot. The bodies were then wrapped in sheets and dumped into a remote mine shaft. They were later retrieved when word got out about their murders. Tsar Nicholas A. and his family. Yakov Svtlov, real name Yankel Solomon, L., Jewish chairman of the Central Executive Committee, ordered the execution of the Tsar and his family. Yakov Yurovsky, real name Yankel, R., Jewish head of the Cheka squad which carried out the murders. All involved were Jews. The Tsar's face was smashed in an effort to make it unrecognizable. They tried burning the bodies, but that took too long. They then doused the bodies with sulfuric acid and buried them in a shallow grave in a forest outside the city. The murderers were Yakov, Yankel, Yurovsky, Alexander Bilibaradov and Philip Galashtukin, all Jews. The execution of the Tsar and his family was ordered by the Jewish chairman of the Soviet Central Executive, Yakov Svtlov, real name Yankel Solomon. The Jews had finally achieved their aim. They brought down the Tsarist regime with their revolution, and now they had killed the hated Tsar himself. As discussed previously, long lists of groups were designated for slaughter. Hundreds of thousands of Cossacks were rounded up and killed. The order was to kill every single one of them, and those who. A group of Czech agents standing by an armored car in St. Petersburg. Note the all-leather garb. The unofficial uniform of Czech agents was all leather, boots, pants, jackets, gloves and hats, causing them, according to one observer, to resemble a fetish club. The style was called glisten and squeak. Almost all were Jews, most nothing more than brutish thugs recruited from the shtetls, who enjoyed nothing more than torturing and killing Christian Russians. escaped initial roundups were tracked down and killed like animals. The same for the aristocracy. 200,000 members of the clergy, priests, monks and nuns, were systematically murdered in a horrific orgy of bestial tortures. They were reportedly scalped, strangled, drowned, crucified, and subjected to any other horrific death their murderers could dream up. Tsarist officers were forced to board sealed barges by the hundreds. The barges were then towed out to sea and sunk with all aboard drowning. The Jews now controlled everything and were free to indulge their most cherished revenge fantasies against the hated, though now helpless Russians. Local branches of the Cheka, comprised mainly of Jews, many of the lowest kind, and many of them violent, sadistic psychopaths, had total autonomy and were not required to report to anyone in carrying out this nightmare of torture and slaughter. Any Cheka member was completely free, without fear of censure or punishment, to kill, rape or torture anyone he chose, outside the government, that is, and he could do it in the most sadistic manner imaginable. They not only were not required to justify it, they were encouraged by the highest leaders, including Lenin himself, to show no mercy and to kill as many as possible. The Cheka was an incredibly brutal organization, with standing orders to execute at will. What distinguished killings by the Cheka, according to one observer, was that they were rage-fueled. The Cheka agents didn't just kill class enemies, they went at them in orgiastic frenzies, beating, stabbing, chopping and mutilated them, including men, women and children. An article in Defender magazine, of October, 1933 describes their orgy of killing. Christians were dragged from their beds, tortured and killed. Some were sliced to pieces, bit by bit, while others were branded with hot irons, their eyes poked out to induce unbearable pain. Others were placed in boxes with only their heads, hands and legs sticking out. Then hungry rats were placed in the boxes to gnaw upon their bodies. Some were nailed to the ceiling by their hands or by their feet and left hanging until they died of exhaustion. Others had hot lead poured in their mouths. Many were tied to horses and dragged through the streets of the city, while Jewish mobs attacked them with rocks and kicked them to death. Pregnant women were chained to trees and their babies cut out of their bodies. During the second half of 1919, the Red Army was driven out of the Ukraine by the White Army. A number of investigations of the mass murders were then carried out by special commissions under the White Army's occupation, one of which was the Bach Commission of Inquiry. There were numerous places of public execution during the Red Army occupation. After the city of Kiev was taken by the White Army in August 1919, Paul Roach was sent by the British government to conduct an investigation. When the members of the Bach Commission entered the execution hall of the Cheka of Kiev, they found the whole cement floor was flooded with blood. It formed a level of several inches and had stopped flowing, coagulated. It was a horrible mixture of blood, brains and pieces of skull with tufts of hair and other human remains. All of the walls were riddled with thousands of bullets and bespattered with blood. Pieces of brains and of scalps were sticking to them. A gutter of 25 centimeters, 10 inches, wide by 25 centimeters deep, 10 inches, and about 10 meters, 33 feet, long was along its length full to the top with blood. Some bodies were disemboweled, others had limbs chopped off, some were literally hacked to pieces. Some had their eyes put out, the head, face and neck and trunk were covered with deep wounds. Further on, we found a corpse with a wedge driven into its chest. Some had no tongues. In a corner we discovered a quantity of dismembered arms and legs belonging to nobodies that we could locate. In his book, The Secret Powers Behind Revolution, French author Vicomte Léon de Bonsens, published in the 1920s, wrote, "The Red Terror became so widespread that it is impossible to give here all the details of the principal means employed by the Cheka to master resistance. One of the most important is that of hostages, taken among all social classes. These are held responsible for any anti-Bolshevist movements, revolts, the White Army, strikes, refusal of a village to give its harvest, etc. and are immediately executed." Thus, for the assassination of the Jew Aritsky, member of the Extraordinary Commission of Petrograd, several thousands of them were put to death, and many of these unfortunate men and women suffered before death various tortures inflicted by cold-blooded cruelty in the prisons of the Cheka. In his book, The Bloodlust of Bolshevism, Vladimir Sotin wrote that these Jewish Chekists were especially interested in handsome boys and pretty girls. These were the first to be killed. It was believed that there would be more intellectuals among attractive people. He wrote that the Semites, jealous of white beauty, massacred beautiful whites. The Jewish Chekists favored murder with various torture methods. In his documentary film, The Russia We Lost, director Stanislav Govorukhin related how the priesthood in Kherson were crucified. The Archbishop Andronikov of Perm was tortured, his eyes were poked out, his ears and nose were cut off. In Kharkov the priest Dmitry was undressed. When he tried to make the sign of the cross, a Chekist cut off his right hand. Several sources, Govorukhin said, tell how the Chekists in Kharkov placed victims in a round, nailed their hands to a table, cut around their wrists with a knife, poured boiling water over their hands and pulled the skin off. This was called pulling off the glove. In other places, the victim's head was placed on an anvil and slowly crushed with a steam hammer. Those due to undergo the same punishment the next day were forced to watch. The eyes of church dignitaries were poked out, their tongues were cut off and they were buried alive. There were Chekists who used to cut open the stomachs of their victims, following which they pulled out the length of the small intestine and nailed it to a telegraph pole and, with a whip, forced the unlucky victim to run around the pole until the whole intestine had been unraveled and the victim died. The Bishop of Voronezh was boiled alive in a big pot, after which the monks, with revolvers aimed at their heads, were forced to drink the soup. Other Chekists crushed the heads of their victims with special head screws, or drilled them through with dental tools. The upper part of the skull was sawn off and the nearest in line was forced to eat the brains, following which the procedure would be repeated to the end of the line. The Chekists often arrested whole families and tortured the children before the eyes of their parents, and the wives before their husbands. Mikhail Vysensky, a former Soviet functionary, described some of the cruel methods used by Chekists in his book, Nomenclatura, Stockholm, 1982. In Kharkiv, people were scalped. In Voronezh, the torture victims were placed in barrels into which nails were hammered so that they stuck out on the inside, upon which the barrels were set rolling. A pentacle, usually a 5-pointed star formerly used in magic, was burned into the foreheads of the victims. In Tsaritsyn and Kamyshin, the hands of victims were amputated with a saw. In Poltava and Kremenchug, the victims were impaled. In Odessa, they were roasted alive or ripped to pieces. In Kiev, the victims were placed in coffins with a decomposing body and buried alive, only to be dug up again after half an hour. These Chekist Jews took sadistic pleasure in torturing the hated Russians who were now helplessly under their control. Their methods of torture were limited only by their depraved imaginations. The landowners and estate owners were one of the first targeted classes to be eliminated. In town after town, convoys of Chekist trucks left for the countryside as night began to fall, stopping at one estate or landowner's house after another to collect every member of each family, men, women, children and infants, including the servants. Any who resisted or tried to run away were shot. In those days of no telephones, there was no way to give forewarning to these families, so they were caught completely by surprise. They were brutally beaten with rifle butts and truncheons as they were herded onto the trucks, many of them injured and bleeding. These large trucks, a dozen or more at a time, then returned completely filled with their traumatized victims who had no idea what was in store for them. They were, in fact, being taken to clearings in the forest outside of town where bulldozers had already dug their mass graves. These frightened civilians, who were guilty of nothing except of being members of a condemned class, were forced to line up in front of the pits where they were machine-gunned, after which the bulldozers covered them up. The following night, and every night thereafter, the trucks went out again, until all were captured and killed. Only those landowners lucky enough to make it out of the country escaped this fate. These victims were the people who had filled the pages as characters in stories by Pushkin, Tolstoy and Chekhov and who embodied the culture of old Russia. Now they were being systematically wiped out by the alien Jews who had seized control of the country. In 1926, a Russian migrant known as Dr. Gregor published a 12,000-word pamphlet in Munich, Germany in which he provided statistics on the numbers killed by the Cheka during the Red Terror. These statistics, he said, came from the Cheka's own published statistics. According to Dr. Gregor, by 1921 the Cheka reported that they had killed 28 bishops, 1,215 priests and 6,000 monks. The Russian Orthodox Church was one of the first targets for destruction by the Jewish Bolsheviks. Next to be killed were all those Russian classes who had any kind of education or any kind of leadership role within the old Russian society. Of these groups and classes who were rounded up and killed, there were 8,800 Russian doctors and medical assistants, 54,650 army and navy officers, 10,500 police officers, lieutenant and above, 48,500 lower-ranking policemen, and 260,000 ordinary soldiers. 361,825 members of the intelligentsia, including teachers, professors, engineers, building contractors, writers and judges were killed, and 12,950 large landowners were killed. In these cases of mass murder, there were no explanations or reasons given for their murder. The simple fact that they belonged to one of the above classes was the one and only reason. The tragedy of all this cannot be measured by numbers alone. These people were the best people that Russia had. They were the leader class. They were the priests, and lawyers, and merchants, and army officers, and university professors. They were the cream of Russian civilization. A poster of Leon Trotsky as director of the Red Terror. The total effect was much the same as it would be in any country. With its small middle and upper class exterminated, Russia's peasant and worker population accepted Jewish Bolshevism without protest. The Russian masses, deprived of its spokesmen and leaders, were simply incapable of counter-revolution. That was what the Red Terror had set out to accomplish. After these elite groups were disposed of, the Cheka turned its attention to the workers and peasants, killing 192,350 workers and 815,000 peasants, according to their own records. These killings occurred between the years 1917 and 1921, and were only those reported killed by the Cheka, according to Dr. Gregor. Certainly there were vast numbers killed by the Cheka and not reported. Dr. Gregor's statistics are only for the Cheka and do not include the millions who died of disease and starvation, or those killed by forces other than the Cheka. In the years following 1921, such killings were to increase exponentially. Jews as a hostile elite. After killing off the old Russian elite, the Jews simply took their places as the new ruling elite, albeit without the elegance and grace of the old elite. Beyond the baggy suits, uncouth manners, and malevolent scowls, there was another important difference between the new Jewish ruling elite and the traditional Russian ruling elite. Professor Kevin MacDonald of the University of California writes that because the Jews had traditionally been restricted and repressed in Tsarist Russia, the Jews had a long-standing visceral antipathy, out of past historical grievances, both real and imagined, toward the people and culture they came to administer. Vladimir Purishkevich, the leader of Michael the Archangel Russian People's Union, accused the Jews of irreconcilable hatred of Russia and everything Russian. The Jews disliked Christians because of the traditional antagonistic relationship between Judaism and Christianity in Russia. According to Kevin MacDonald, when Jews achieved power in Russia, it was a hostile elite with a deep sense of historic grievance. As a result, they became willing executioners of both the people and culture they came to rule. The Jew, Anatoly Vasilyevich Lunacharsky, Lenin's Soviet People's Commissar of Enlightenment, wrote, "We hate Christianity and Christians. Even the best of them must be regarded as our worst enemies. They preach love of one's neighbor and mercy, which is contrary to our principles. Christian love is an obstacle to the development of the revolution. Down with love of one's neighbor. What we need is hatred, only thus shall we conquer the universe." Professor MacDonald writes, after the revolution there was active suppression of any remnant of the older order and their descendants. Jews have always shown a tendency to rise because of their natural proclivities, for example high intelligence and powerful ethnic networking, but here they also benefited from entage quotas in educational institutions and other forms of discrimination against the middle class and aristocratic elements of the old regime that would have provided more competition with Jews. The bourgeois elements from the previous regime would have no future. Thus the mass murder of peasants and nationalists was combined with the systematic exclusion of the previously existing non-Jewish middle class. On October 9, 1920, while Trotsky was still head of the Red Army and laying waste to old Russia, an article in the American Hebrew, published in New York, stated, "What Jewish idealism and discontent so powerfully contributed to accomplishing in Russia, the same historic qualities of the Jewish mind and heart are tending to promote in other countries." In other words, what the Jewish Bolsheviks had done to Russia, they were working assiduously to do to Europe. Vladimir Lenin said, "We Bolsheviks are going to bring the social revolution as much to America as to Europe. It is coming systematically, step by step. The struggle will be long, cruel and sanguinary, bloody. What matters the loss of 90% by executions if 10% of communists remain to carry on the revolution? Bolshevism is not a seminary for young ladies. All children should be present at the executions and rejoice at the death of the enemies of the proletariat." The Ukrainian famine, Holodomor, in 1929. The Bolsheviks under Stalin announced their first 5-year plan for rapid industrialization of Russia and collectivization of agriculture throughout the Soviet Union. All the owners of vast estates across Russia had already been killed along with their families during the 1917 revolution. But now the Bolsheviks would turn their attention to gaining control over the millions of independent land-owning peasant farmers. Their intent was to eliminate private farms altogether and create giant collective farms in their place. All the peasants were to become employees of the state, working on the collective farms. The Ukraine was the most productive agricultural region of the Soviet Union, and was known as the breadbasket of Europe. Ukraine's prosperous, self-reliant peasant farmers were accustomed to a high degree of independence, and had long harbored sentiments of Ukrainian nationalism. After the fall of the Tsar, there was widespread support for revival of the Ukrainian culture and of the Ukrainian language, which was similar to Russian, but not the same. The aim of the Ukrainian people, most of whom were peasant farmers, was, if not outright independence, then a high degree of autonomy within the Soviet Empire. By this time, Lenin had died, Trotsky was in exile, and Stalin was in control of the Soviet Union. Stalin was not a Jew himself, he was also not a Russian, but a Georgian, but the vast majority of the positions within the communist bureaucracy were filled by Jews, and most of those who surrounded Stalin were Jewish, including his main associate, Lazar Kaganovich. Stalin and Kaganovich were determined to crush this Ukrainian independence movement and collectivize Ukrainian agriculture with as much speed as possible. What Stalin and Kaganovich intended was the complete destruction of the traditional way of life in the Soviet Union, particularly in the Ukraine, and replace it with Marxist collectivism. The collectivization process was enormously disruptive for everyone, and extremely unpopular. Though the collectivization process proceeded more or less on schedule in Russia, the Ukrainians resisted it, to the point that the entire collectivization process in the Ukraine was brought to a standstill. The Ukrainian peasants refused to cooperate and even slaughtered their farm animals rather than hand them over to the state. Stalin and Kaganovich would not stand for this. In 1932 they unleashed a terror campaign against the Ukrainians, the brutality of which was unprecedented. 25,000 fanatical young party militants were sent in to force the 10 million Ukrainian peasants onto the collective farms. When these 25,000 young militants proved insufficient for the job, a large Cheka force was ordered in to begin mass executions in order to intimidate the population. The resistance continued unabated, so an orgy of indiscriminate mass killing ensued. Quotas were even set for the numbers to be killed. When the Chekists failed to meet weekly execution quotas, Stalin, the Bolshevik Jew, Lazar Kaganovich, headed up the project to starve the Ukrainians into submission to collectivization. 9 million Ukrainians starved to death in Kaganovich's manufactured famine of 1932-33. Sent in Lazar Kaganovich, his Jewish assistant, along with a cadre of other Jews, to take charge of the situation. The Jew Yakov Lev Epstein was put in charge specifically of collectivization. Kaganovich set the shooting quota at 10,000 Ukrainians per week. But there were not enough Chekists to shoot that many people, so Kaganovich and Stalin decided on a much cheaper and much more efficient method of mass murder: starvation. Troops were sent in, and all seed stocks, grain, silage, and farm animals were confiscated from Ukrainian farms. Chekist agents and Red Army troops sealed all roads and rail lines, letting nothing in and nothing out. Anyone trying to leave was shot. Farms were searched and all food and fuel was confiscated. There was nothing left to eat. Anyone caught stealing food, even a handful of grain, was shot. Ukrainians began to die of hunger, cold and sickness in large numbers. The American journalist Eugene Leon was sent to Russia in 1928 as chief correspondent for UPI. Arriving as an enthusiastic communist, he was able to experience the Soviet experiment at first hand, and became totally disillusioned by what he saw. He described the famine in his book Assignment in Utopia, published in 1937, as follows: Hell broke loose in 70,000 Russian villages. A population as large as all of Switzerland's or Denmark's was stripped clean of all their belongings. They were herded with bayonets at railroad stations, packed indiscriminately into cattle cars and freight cars, and dumped weeks later in the lumber regions of the frozen north, the deserts, or Central Asia, wherever labor was needed, to live or die. Leon, himself Jewish, attributes the responsibility for this crime against humanity directly to Kaganovich, Lazar Kaganovich. It was his mind that invented the political departments to lead collectivized agriculture, his iron hand that applied Bolshevik mercilessness. Stalin merely enforced Kaganovich's plan. During the frigid winter of 1932-33, mass starvation created by Kaganovich took a drastic toll. Ukrainians ate anything they could find, including their pets, leather boots and belts, tree bark, grass and roots. Cannibalism became common. Parents even ate their children. The precise number of Ukrainians who died in this deliberate famine, as well as by Cheka shootings, remains unknown. But the KGB's own archives, which have recently been opened, show that at least 7 million Ukrainians died. Ukrainian historians say it was worse than that, and put the figure at 9 million. Fully 25% of the Ukrainian population was wiped out by this deliberate, man-made extermination famine. Starving Ukrainian peasants leave villages in search of food. People were lying down and dying on the streets. A starvation victim. On top of this grim number in the Ukraine, millions of other peasant farmers across the rest of the Soviet Union were also starved to death or shot during this collectivization program. Stalin admitted to Churchill at one of their meetings during Weimar that he had been forced to liquidate 10 million uncooperative peasants during the 1930s in order to achieve collectivization. When mass executions by the Cheka in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are added in, the genocide of 3 million Muslims of the USSR, massacres of Cossacks and Volga Germans are added, the total comes to at least 40 million Christians murdered by the Bolshevik Jews during the time they controlled Russia. This orgy of mass murder in Russia was well publicized throughout Germany as well as the rest of Europe while it was happening, and it was also well known that it was done largely by the hand of the Jews. Bolshevism, communism and Judaism were correctly conflated in the German mind to mean one and the same thing. It is little wonder that the German people felt fear and hostility toward the Jews and saw them as a threat to their own existence. Chapter 6: The Bolshevik Revolution spreads throughout Europe. The Russian Revolution was seismic in its impact upon the world. Nothing had happened on this scale since the French Revolution, with which the Russian Revolution shared many characteristics. This revolutionary struggle was not confined to Russia, but soon began to explode all over Europe. With much of Europe on the verge of economic and political collapse in the aftermath of the war, revolutionary feelings began bubbling up from the lower classes in 100 different places. The old order of monarchies and aristocracies was gone and something else would take its place. What? No one was precisely sure. The likely contenders were either some form of representative democracy, or some form of socialism, the extreme of which was Bolshevik communism, which had just taken control of Russia. The lower classes of Europe were enthralled by the idea of communism, as it promised them unaccustomed power and control, but it struck fear in the hearts of the upper and middle classes who were determined to suppress it and prevent its spread into Europe. Even though the Bolsheviks headed by Lenin and Trotsky were in complete control in Russia, they did not yet feel secure. They believed that unless socialist revolution swept over all of Europe, they could be rolled back and crushed by the military might of world capitalism. To this end, a communist international or Comintern was organized, which was funded by the Russian government and backed by Jewish banks in America and Europe. The purpose of the Comintern was to foment communist revolution throughout Europe to bring down traditional regimes which would then be replaced by Soviet socialist republics. The largest communist party and the principal member of the Comintern outside of Russia was in Germany, the membership of which was, significantly, 78% Jewish. A network of communist parties was established in every country in Europe, with its headquarters in Moscow, with the intention of seizing control of all of Europe and then the world. In each of these communist parties, Jews dominated and made up a majority of its membership, and they reported back to the Jewish Bolsheviks who now ran Russia. It seemed clear that two cultures were now in a titanic struggle to determine the socio-economic and cultural future of Europe, one Jewish, under the flag of communism, and the other, traditional Western Christian civilization. Jews in the Hungarian Revolution. The first country outside of Russia to fall to the communists was Hungary. As a result of World War I, the ancient Austro-Hungarian Empire had dissolved into its constituent parts, leaving much of it in total disarray. Jewish Bolsheviks, funded and controlled by the Soviet Union-based Comintern, took advantage of the chaos in Hungary. By enlisting the cooperation of the Jewish population in Hungary, almost all of whom were either communists or sympathetic to communism, they overthrew the government in March 1919. They then imposed a reign of terror over Hungary which lasted until August 12 of that same year under the leadership of the Jew, Béla Kun, real name, Moritz Cohen, a native Hungarian, but an agent of Lenin. Kun had been a Hungarian soldier during the war and taken prisoner by the Russians. After the Bolsheviks took over Russia, because he was a Jew, Kun was released from prison and became a member of the Cheka. He was then sent to the Ukraine where he participated in the murder of scores of thousands of Christian Ukrainians. Kun was then selected to undergo training to become a Bolshevik agent back in his home country of Hungary. Left, Béla Kun, real name, Moritz Cohen. The new Bolshevik regime now in control of Hungary under Kun's leadership was Jewish to a man, amounting to yet another Jewish coup d'état of a sovereign state. Among these new Jewish rulers of Hungary were Otto Corvin, Klein, Belis Zanto, Tippus Zamuli, Gino Varga, Joseph Bogany, Joseph Swartz, Gino Landler, Georg Lukács, and Gino Hamburger, as unsavory a lot as it was possible to find. Hungary was then divided up into districts and Jews were appointed as commissars of each district. Many of these Jews were crude thugs of the lowest type. One had been a janitor in a synagogue, and now a commissar of a district, like a governor of a state in the US. Terror squads were organized and a Red Terror began in full swing, mimicking that which was occurring in Russia at the same time. All private property was nationalized, all industry was nationalized, grain was expropriated from peasants by force, and the peasants were all herded onto collective farms. The army and the police force were eliminated and replaced by new Bolshevik terror squads. These Jewish Bolsheviks then began a reign of terror against the Christian clergy, burning churches and murdering priests and pastors all over Hungary. Landowners and their families, as well as other bourgeoisie, were hauled away in trucks and murdered by the thousands. Rape became endemic. Red Army soldiers went around to the private homes of the upper class and forcefully took the most beautiful girls and young women, married or not, with them back to the barracks where they kept them for weeks at a time. Inside the barracks, all the soldiers took their turns with them until they grew tired of them, whereupon they were replaced by a new roundup of captive sex slaves. Any who resisted were killed. Many of the girls committed suicide rather than face their families again. The full scope of this Jewish Bolshevik terror in Hungary can be understood by the following order given by one of the commissars. All the commissars were Jews. Do not shrink from the shedding of blood, for nothing worthwhile can be obtained without it. Without blood there can be no terror, and without terror there can be no dictatorship of the proletariat. This quote came from the book, The Evolution of Hungary and Its Place in European History, by Count Paul Teleki, former Prime Minister of Hungary. The Bolsheviks abolished the right of trial and the right of defense. The charge of counter-revolutionary resulted in immediate execution no matter how spurious the charge. Jewish tyranny was wreaking a terrible revenge upon Christian Hungary. Kun resorted to the usual Jewish Bolshevik propaganda methods to break down the sanctity of religion, patriotism and the morality in order to undermine the Hungarian culture. The conservative, Christian morals of the Hungarian people were ridiculed while debauchery and pornography were given full license. Miklos Horthy saves Hungary. Hungarian Rear Admiral Miklos Horthy formed a national army to fight the Bolsheviks who had taken over the country. In response to Béla Kun's Red Terror, Horthy launched his White Terror campaign against the Bolsheviks. With the aid of the Romanian army, Horthy managed to overthrow Kun and the Bolsheviks on August 1, 1919 and set up a new government under the Social Democratic Party, headed by Horthy. Kun managed to escape back to Russia. The Red Terror was over and the Christians took control of their country back from the Jewish Bolsheviks, but the Jews had taken a dreadful toll on the country during the brief period they were in power. Admiral Miklos Horthy takes Hungary back from the communists. The brutality of the Jews toward the Hungarian people set off a virulent wave of anti-Semitism and a wholesale massacre of Jews ensued across Hungary once they were removed from power. Jews numbered 5% of the population of Hungary, but held around half of the positions in trade, banking, and the professions. They completely dominated theatre and film production and controlled most of the newspapers. In 1939 the Hungarian government enacted an anti-Jewish law that restricted Jewish participation in business and industry to 12%, and to only 6% within the professions. Jews were also banned from holding public office, and from holding leading positions in journalism, the theatre or in film. Jews in the German Revolution. As the social and economic order began to crumble in Germany near war's end in 1918, the working classes, including many soldiers and sailors in uniform, began to question their unthinking patriotism that had tied them to the war effort up until then. A sense of frustration and anger was rising in the armed forces, but also in the factories and the mills back home over the German government's refusal to end the war. This developing attitude of rebelliousness was encouraged and egged on by communist revolutionary provocateurs, the majority of whom, as in all other cases, were Jews. From the beginning of the war, the British Navy had maintained a total naval blockade, preventing all food from entering Germany. By 1916 the German people began to starve. This starvation blockade eventually caused the deaths of 1 million German people, and the horrific suffering of millions more. On 30th of October, 1918, the German High Command issued an order for a final, desperate naval assault to break this inhuman starvation blockade. This was an independent decision by the Navy and was not sanctioned by the government, but it was the spark that set off the revolution in Germany. The war-weary German sailors in the northern port of Kiel were becoming rebellious as the result of communist agitators. Such an attack against the much more powerful British Navy, they believed, would have been suicidal. They were not willing to squander their lives in a pointless, futile Gotterdamn rung, and rose in mutiny against their officers. Over 1,000 of the rebellious sailors were arrested, but 4 days later the workers of Kiel, led by communist Jews, came to their rescue. A general strike was launched and a mass demonstration freed the sailors. Following this success, 2,000 armed workers and sailors marched to the town hall, occupied it and established a Workers' and Sailors' Council or Soviet, and took control of the city. The German Revolution had begun. From Kiel the Workers' and Soldiers' Council movement, inspired by the Russian Revolution and instigated largely by Jews who were in close communication with their brethren in Russia, spread rapidly throughout Germany. In the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of the country, factories, armed units of the army, and even whole towns, were brought under the control of councils, like the Soviets in Russia, an indication of Jewish influence. By November 7 the revolution had reached Berlin. Strikes and marches in the capital culminated in a massive demonstration outside the Reichstag on November 9. The old rulers were terrified by the scope and strength of the revolutionary movement, and began to panic. The Kaiser finally saw the hopelessness of the situation. Under pressure from leftist politicians, he abdicated and slipped across the border into forced exile in the Netherlands. The old rulers turned to the Social Democratic Party, SPD, to save them from the insurgent masses. The SPD was Germany's largest political party which purported to represent the workers. Eager to placate the mass demonstration which was developing, SPD leader, Philipp Sedman, declared on November 9, 1918, the creation of a German republic to replace the old monarchy. It was a calculated attempt to demobilize the mass movement by giving them what they wanted. On November 10 the provisional government of various socialist groups was established, nominally answerable to the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils. The provisional government included both the far-left Independent Social Democratic Party, USPD, as well as the more centrist SPD. Combining these radically different groups within the same government, moreover, nominally subordinate to the Workers' and Soldiers' Council, was inherently an unstable situation, and the struggle that followed was dominated by the conflict between these factions. The USPD was led by two Jews, Hugo Haas, real name Allenstein, and Karl Kautsky. The USPD was a coalition of leftist groups, which included the Communists. The USPD soon broke apart and disbanded, with the far-left group known as the Spartacists leaving to form the Communist Party, while its more moderate members joined the SPD. The Spartacist group, the forerunner of the Communist Party, was led by the Jews, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who received their funding from the Communist International, Comintern, based in Moscow. The Spartacists represented the vanguard of the revolution, especially in Berlin. The Spartacists found their support amongst the urban working class, but the great majority of the Germany people, especially the middle and upper classes, as well as the rural farmers, were conservative and unsympathetic to socialists of all stripes, and were totally against the communists. The political instability in Germany caused the old political structure to begin to fall apart all across the country. On November 7, 1918 the 700-year-old Wittelsbach monarchy fell in Bavaria, after which Bavaria was declared a free state by the communist Jew, Kurt Isner, of the USPD. Isner then became Minister-President of Bavaria. But on 21 February, 1919, he was shot and killed by a German patriot, Count. Communist Jew Kurt Isner, L., the new president of Bavaria, was assassinated by Count Anton von Arkhwolf-Valley, R., a German patriot. Anton von Arkhwolf-Valley, who said of Isner, "Isner is a Bolshevist, a Jew. He isn't German. He doesn't feel German. He subverts all patriotic thoughts and feelings. He is a traitor to this land." The killing of Isner made the Count a hero to many Bavarians, though it did not stop the communists. After Isner's assassination, the communists and anarchists seized power in Bavaria. Left, Eugene Levine, a Jew, heads the Bavarian Soviet Republic after Isner's assassination. A Soviet Republic was formally proclaimed on April 6, 1919, but collapsed within 6 days due to the ineptitude of its leaders. But another communist Jew, Eugene Levine, was waiting in the wings and became the new head of the Soviet government. Levine took the usual communist steps, which included expropriating luxurious apartments and giving them to the homeless and placing factories under the ownership and control of the workers. Levine organized his own army, called the Red Army. What else? Similar to the Red Army in Russia, hordes of unemployed workers swarmed into the new Red Army until its numbers swelled to 20,000. Red Guards then began arresting suspected counter-revolutionaries, that is, those who opposed the communist takeover of the government, and executing them. Among those executed were Prince Gustav von Thurn und Taxis and Countess Hella von Westarp. Bavaria's Red Terror was about to begin in imitation of those in Russia and Hungary. But before their Russian-like Red Terror could get off the ground, they were brought down by right-wing, patriotic forces. On May 3, 1919, a force of 9,000 German army soldiers, operating independently of the government, combined with Freikorps units, volunteer paramilitary units made up of officers and soldiers who had returned home from the war, totaling 30,000, entered Munich and quickly put an end to the Soviet Socialist Republic of Bavaria. Some 1,000 Red Army soldiers were killed, and around 700 of those associated with the Soviet Republic were executed by the Freikorps, including Levine himself. The Freikorps saved Bavaria. Units of the army and the Freikorps entered Munich to take on the Reds. The Spartacist uprising in Berlin. On January 5, 1919, the Communist Spartacist uprising began in Berlin, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, both Jews. The Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, both Jews, headed the Spartacists of Berlin, a communist organization. Communists formed paramilitary units, which they called the Red Army, modeled as usual after the Bolshevik Red Army in Russia. These units were made up mainly of armed revolutionary gangs of workers with no military experience. Bloody street fighting raged throughout the city between the Spartacists and the police. The government was moved to the city of Weimar because of the fighting in Berlin. Freikorps units were then brought in to put down the rebellion. The revolution quickly took on the character of a civil war, with the communists and Bolsheviks on one side, and conservative, traditional, middle and upper-class Germans on the other. Bloody street battles also occurred in other German cities and towns between the Communist Red Army and the police and the Freikorps. The communists, in typical fashion, began to assassinate political leaders and government officials, and to organize strikes designed to cause the maximum damage to the already struggling economy. Barracks and naval dockyards, as well as other state properties, were seized and street barricades divided Germany's cities and towns into politico-criminal fiefdoms. Workers' and soldiers' councils were formed in all of these cities, and officers and officials of the old regime were arrested and imprisoned. Kings and princes all over Germany abdicated and disappeared into exile. The untrained communist fighters were no match, however, for the disciplined, combat-experienced Freikorps, so the rebellion was quickly brought down. No mercy was shown the communist revolutionaries. Thousands were killed and both Luxemburg and Liebknecht were executed by the Freikorps. As a result of this defeat, the communist movement temporarily collapsed, and the revolution ended in August 1919 with the inauguration of the Weimar Republic headed by Friedrich Ebert of the Social Democratic Party, SDP. These communist uprisings had been put down, not by the Weimar government, but by independently operating paramilitary groups of patriotic Germans, known as the Freikorps. Freikorps units had sprung up all over Germany in reaction to the communist threat to the country, and, as stated above, were comprised mainly of soldiers who had returned from the war. They were led by ex-officers intended to. Freikorps troops sent in to suppress the Spartacists were ex-soldiers from the German army. The Freikorps saves Germany from a communist takeover. They're nationalistic, patriotic and ultra-conservative in character. Unlike their Red Army opponents, the Freikorps were highly organized, and the officers who led them had the unswerving loyalty of the enlisted members. They were united in their hostility towards the communists and were used unofficially by the Weimar government to put down left-wing revolts and uprisings in cities throughout Germany. Some of these units were eventually absorbed into the National Socialist movement. Though the revolution was over, Germany was left in the grip of paranoia caused by the bitter reality of defeat in the World War, as well as the vindictive and punitive peace treaty which followed, but also by the frightening specter of a Bolshevik takeover of Germany like that which had occurred in Russia. The German people were well aware of the role played by Jews in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, as well in Hungary, and they were well aware of the overrepresentation of Jews in the Communist Revolution in Germany which had only just ended. After the Bolsheviks had seized control in Russia, an opposing army was raised led by Tsarist officers. They called themselves the White Army, in opposition to the Bolshevik Red Army. Their slogan became "Kill the Jews and Save Russia." Russia was now engaged in a civil war, the brutality of which knew no bounds, and the tentacles of the emerging internationalism of communism were spreading out of Russia like a giant octopus into every corner of Europe. The revolution which had just been put down by the Freikorps could well have ended with the Bolshevik takeover of Germany. The German people were convinced of a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy against Western Christian civilization, and of its existential threat to Germany. A widespread surge of anti-Semitism developed among the German people as a result, combined with a distinct shift to the right in German public opinion. On July 2, 1922, in an interview while in exile with a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, Kaiser Wilhelm said, "The Jews are responsible for Bolshevism in Russia, and Germany too. I was far too indulgent with them during my reign, and I bitterly regret the favors I showed to prominent Jewish bankers." British intelligence had discerned a coordinated Jewish, communist revolutionary effort even before the beginning of World War I. In the July 16, 1913 issue of the Great Britain Directorate of Intelligence, a monthly review of the progress of revolutionary movements abroad, an article stated, "There is now definite evidence that Bolshevism is an international movement controlled by Jews. Communications are passing between the leaders in America, France, Russia, and England, with a view to concerted action." The Jews had traditionally maintained well-established, highly efficient, international networks through which information of interest to Jews was quickly passed. Adolf Hitler looked back on the period several years later and described the situation in Germany in this way: "Germany, with more than 6 million communists, was on the verge of a catastrophe which none but those wanting in common sense can possibly ignore." If red terrorism was to have swept over Germany, the Western countries of Europe would probably also have realized that it is not a matter of indifference to them whether the outposts of a destructive Asian world power stand guard on the Rhine and on the North Sea, or whether the land is populated by peaceful German peasants and working men whose only wish is to make an honest living and to be on friendly terms with other nations. By averting this disaster which was threatening to ruin Germany, the National Socialist movement saved not only the German people, but also rendered the rest of Europe a service of historical merit. The National Socialist Revolution has but one aim: to restore order in our country, to provide work and bread for our starving masses, and to lay down the ideas of honor, loyalty and decency as being the basis of our moral code, which, far from doing harm to other nations, can be for the benefit of all. Jewish Bolsheviks attempt to take Italy after the war. Why? Bolshevism also threatened Italy. Jewish, communist agitators, supported and paid for by Red Russia's Comintern, provoked conflicts and committed terrorist acts in an attempt to bring down the Italian government and establish a Bolshevik government in its place. Mussolini formed his fascist party to oppose the communists, and the struggle between the communists and the fascists cost thousands of lives in Italy. Jewish-led communists committed mass murders in Sarana, Modena, Bologna, Tito, Diana, and Milan, but were eventually defeated by Mussolini's fascist forces. The final defeat of the Bolsheviks in Italy culminated in Mussolini's famous March on Rome. Mussolini, like all other fascists, have been defamed by war propaganda and by the Jewish-controlled mainstream media, but he was well thought of and widely admired by world leaders prior to the war. Typically, in the Jewish propaganda, he was portrayed as a bombastic, barbaric buffoon. One of fascism's bitterest enemies during World War II, Winston Churchill, could not praise the fascists enough before the war began. He was especially impressed with Mussolini. Of Italian fascism, Italy has. Mussolini saves Italy from the communists, shown that there is a way of fighting the subversive forces which can rally the masses of the people, properly led, to value and wish to defend the honor and stability of civilized society. Hereafter no great nation will be unprovided with an ultimate means of protection against the cancerous growth of Bolshevism. Winston Churchill, 11th, November 1938, a group of British citizens living in Italy at the time of Mussolini's rise issued the following statement to contradict the false propaganda spewed out in the international Jewish press against Mussolini and the fascists. "We wish to state most clearly and emphatically that there exists here today nothing that can be justly termed either tyranny or suppression of personal freedom as guaranteed by constitutional law in any civilized land. We believe that Mussolini enjoys the enthusiastic support and admiration of the Italian people, who are contented, orderly and prosperous to a degree hitherto unknown in Italy, and probably without parallel at the present time among other great European nations still suffering from the war." Committee of British Residents, Florence. Financial Times, 1926 Jewish Bolsheviks attempt to take Spain, the Spanish Civil War. Red Russia's Comintern began arming and funding communism in Spain in 1936, which led to the bloody Spanish Civil War. Taking advantage of numerous national misfortunes, they transformed what had been the most conservative, staunchly Catholic monarchy in Europe into a nightmarish, atheistic, communist republic propped up by the Soviet Union. Communist activity in Spain, as in previous communist revolutions in Europe, was organized and led by Jews. Volunteers from all over the world, including Poland, France, Britain, Germany, Canada, and Palestine, joined the International Brigade to fight in Spain on the side of the communists. An inordinately high percentage of these were Jews. Jewish women volunteered as nurses. Yiddish-language publications such as Der Freiheitskämpfer and Botwin were published for all the Jewish volunteers in Spain. German volunteers formed the Thälmann Brigade, Italians; the Garibaldi Brigade, French; the Commune de Paris, Americans formed the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. A highly disproportionate percentage of all of these brigades were Jews. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade from America was led by the Jew, Milton Wolfe. Moe Fishman was the leader of the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade for years after the war. 70% of medical personnel in the International Brigade were Jewish. Milton Wolfe, American Jewish leader of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Most of the Russian commanders were also Jews. Yakov Shmushkevich organized the Spanish Republican Air Force. He was a Jew. Grigori Stern was the chief military advisor to the Spanish Republic, General Manfred Stern was the commander of the International Brigade, and Lieber Lazarevic Feldbin, Alexander Orlov, was chief of Soviet security. All were Jews. Feldbin, Orlov, supervised the massacres of Catholic priests and nuns in Spain. The Jew Mikhail Koltsov was correspondent in Spain for Pravda, and Moses Rosenberg was the Soviet ambassador to Spain. Jewish-led communists execute Sacred Heart Shrine in Spain during their assault on the Catholic Church in the Spanish Civil War. The Red Terror in Spain took on the same character as the Red Terrors in Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, and Italy. The Jewish-led communists launched an orgy of mass murder, rape and destruction. As they had attempted to wipe out Christianity in previous Red Terrors, they went after the Catholic Church in Spain with a vengeance. Over 20,000 churches across Spain were destroyed, 6,832 Spanish priests were murdered, 3,000 monks, 300 nuns and 13 bishops were killed. In addition, some 4,000 laymen were murdered for helping or hiding nuns or priests. These murders were carried out with the usual torture and mutilation characteristic of other Red Terrors. General Francisco Franco, a staunch loyalist, and devout Roman Catholic, stepped up to prevent the country from becoming another. General Francisco Franco saves Spain from the communists. Victim of communist revolution. He merged the Falangists and the Carlists, traditional Catholic monarchist rebels, into a united nationalist group and waged civil war against the so-called Republicans who were now controlled by Moscow. In the Civil War, he had the support of Antonio Salazar in Portugal, Benito Mussolini in Italy, and Adolf Hitler in Germany. He overthrew the Republican Bolsheviks and saved Spain from Jewish Bolshevism. Franco has been branded a fascist by the international Jewish press, which means only that he opposed Jewish dominance and control of his country. In reality, he was the savior of Spain. Czechoslovakia in danger of communist takeover. Czechoslovakia was an artificial state created by the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. Its population was made up of several incompatible and contentious nationalities, including Czechs, Germans, Hungarians, Slovaks, Ruthens, Slavs and Jews, and was therefore unstable from the start. The capital city of Prague was home to 118,000 Jews, most of whom were communists or communist sympathizers. These Prague Jews were highly organized, and openly sympathetic to Bolshevik Russia. The Czechoslovakian Communist Party, under the leadership of Vladimir Smrel, Clement Gottwald, Rudolf Slansky, Vaclav Kopecki, and Joseph Gutmann, et al., all Jews, was a member of the Moscow-based Communist International, Comintern, and stood ready to instigate a communist revolution in Czechoslovakia whenever the opportunity arose. After the German annexation of the Sudetenland in September 1938, Czechoslovakia fell apart along ethnic lines with large populations and territories joining surrounding countries. The remaining remnant of the former Czechoslovakia, Bohemia and Moravia, with its capital city of Prague, was totally defenseless and extremely vulnerable to a communist takeover. To prevent such a calamity, Hitler made Bohemia and Moravia a German protectorate. The warmongers in Britain, France and the United States chose to see this move by Hitler as further proof of his ambitions to dominate all of Europe, and even to conquer the world, instead of seeing it for what it was, a measure to hold communism in check. Adolf Hitler saves Czechoslovakia from the communists. Here he receives an enthusiastic welcome in the city of Prague after making Bohemia and Moravia a protectorate of the Reich. The Comintern's aim? World domination. All of the European struggles against communism were of the same pattern, that is, each was a struggle of nationalist forces in each country against revolution instigated and led by Jewish communists, paid for and supported by the Soviet Union's Communist International, Comintern, which was itself a Jewish organization. World domination as the goal of the Communist International was made clear in its documents, in which it was declared, the Communist International is the union of the communist parties of varying lands into a unified communist world party. As leader and organizer of the revolutionary movement of the world proletariat, the Communist International fights for the establishment of a worldwide dictatorship of the proletariat, for the establishment of a world union of socialist Soviet republics. The communist movement was unequivocally a Jewish movement, directed, controlled and supported out of Moscow by the Jewish Bolsheviks who ruled Russia. Their goal was not only world domination, or at least domination of Western civilization, but also the complete eradication of Christianity and the deracination of Western culture. The Russian writer, Dostoevsky had this to say, in his book Diary of a Writer, published more than 40 years earlier in 1877, "It is not for nothing that everywhere in Europe the Jews are reigning over the stock exchanges, not for nothing that they control capital, not for nothing that they are masters of credit, and not for nothing, I repeat, that they are the masters of all international politics. What is coming is the complete triumph of Jewish ideas, before which, sentiments of humanity, the thirst for truth, Christian feelings, and the national and popular pride of Europe must bow. And what will be the future is known also to the Jews themselves. Their reign is approaching, their complete reign." Dostoevsky. In his 1920 article, Zionism versus Bolshevism, A Struggle for the Soul of the Jewish People, Winston Churchill stated his belief that international Jews were seeking a worldwide communistic state under Jewish domination. But with the exception of Russia, the Jewish communist assault on Western Christian civilization was unsuccessful in every case where it was attempted, thanks to stalwarts like Horthy, Mussolini, Franco and Hitler. They stopped communism in its tracks. Instead of being vilified and dismissed as repugnant fascists, as they are today, the result of Jewish propaganda, these men should be held up as heroes and champions of Western Christian civilization, for that is what they were. It was inevitable that this great contest for the dominance of Europe would eventually culminate in a war between the Soviet Union, representing world Jewry, and Germany, as the champion of Western Christian civilization. If Britain, France and the United States had given Germany a free hand, or better yet, had supported Germany, then world communism would have been destroyed in its cradle, in which case, the world would look very different today. Chapter 7 The Nation of Israel. Jews have lived as alien minorities amongst indigenous majorities in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa since Roman times. Despite not having a country, or a state, of their own, Jews nevertheless have always considered themselves to be a single nation with national interests of their own. Long before the advent of the State of Israel, the Jews called themselves the Nation of Israel. Spread out in numerous other countries, the diaspora, though they were, and still are, they nevertheless have always maintained highly organized networks that tie the numerous Jewish communities together. There is an international organization of synagogues, for example, through which rabbis travel to and from, and communicate with other synagogues around the world. International Jewish bankers form another highly organized network. Jewish-owned newspapers and other journals form another. Both the United Press International, UPI, and Reuters, the two primary sources of international news for all newspapers, television and radio news, are owned and controlled by Jews. Hundreds of other Jewish organizations, such as B'nai B'rith, the Anti-Defamation League, and the World Jewish Congress, etc., form tight intertwining and overlapping networks through which Jews everywhere maintain close contact with each other. Jewish leaders are kept abreast of what is happening in Jewish communities throughout the diaspora. Any Jew from anywhere in the world can always find a congenial stopover at any synagogue or Jewish center in any country and use it as a base for doing business there. That is how St. Paul was able to create all those Christian churches and then maintain communication with them. He did it as a rabbi communicating through these Jewish networks to the churches he created. As he traveled around the Mediterranean world preaching Christianity, he used synagogues as his base, which also provided him ready-made audiences for his preaching. Christianity at the time of St. Paul was considered a sect of Judaism. Paul's letters to these churches, which became such a substantial part of the Christian New Testament, also passed through these Jewish networks. Jews have never been interested in agriculture and only engaged in it when forced to do so by circumstance. They have always been an urban people, congregating in cities, often in Jewish ghettos, therefore making themselves more visible than their small numbers would indicate. Venice, Italy is an archipelago of little islands, each with a different name. Murano is one of these islands, where Venetian glass is made, hence Murano glass. Ghetto is the name of another island. The term ghetto originated in Venice, Ghetto Island, where the Jews lived, by their own choice, incidentally. Later, the term came to mean the Jewish quarter. They preferred earning their livings as petty traders, middlemen, shopkeepers, peddlers, shoemakers, tailors, and other similar crafts. Most of them worked for themselves in their own businesses. Out of these small enterprises eventually grew large businesses, such as department store chains. They were also the money changers. Western Christianity as well as the Muslim world considered usury a sin and therefore Christians and Muslims were forbidden to lend money at interest. Yet, money lending is essential for economic growth and development. Jews have no such compunctions about usury and were more than willing to step in to provide that service. Out of such local money lending grew the international banking system, which has always been controlled by Jews. Jews, generally speaking, are not, and never have been, wealth creators, in the economies they lived within. Rather, they have been wealth extractors. They are rarely involved in wealth-creating industries such as farming, forestry, mining, fishing and manufacturing, preferring to be middlemen and financiers. Even today, wealthy and powerful Jewish financiers don't create wealth, they extract wealth out of the economy, usually in the form of interest, or brokerage fees, or from their cut of the profit as middlemen. That is why they have gained a reputation as a parasitic people, living amongst majority populations which serve as their hosts. As alien minorities in other people's countries, Jews congregate together to form closed societies, ghettos, and tend to view the outside majorities as unsympathetic others, creating among Jews an us against them frame of mind. They form business networks and exclusive trading consortiums between themselves exclusively, and cooperate with each other in competing with the Gentile world outside. Jewish banks extend loans to Jewish businesses that a Gentile under similar circumstances would not be able to obtain, and then they back those Jewish businesses in difficult times to prevent failures. Jews throughout the diaspora have access to international Jewish capital, which gives them a huge advantage in competing with their Gentile neighbors. Jews have a collectivist culture, whereas Christians are individualistic. Jews work together for the benefit of all Jews, at the exclusion of non-Jews. The Christian Gentile is the lone hunter, while Jews tend to pack hunt. They gang up to put the lone Gentile out of business by the use of cooperative commercial strategies. Jews thereby tend to achieve monopolies in their fields of endeavor, pushing the Gentiles out. Even the Jewish Holy Book of Laws, the Talmud, does not forbid Jews from taking unfair advantage of Gentiles. The Talmud does require Jews, however, to treat other Jews fairly. By these methods, Jews have always achieved a dominant position within the traditional societies they happen to live in, and they have shown no qualms about using their elite positions to exploit the host populations. A constant charge against them is that their loyalty to the host country they happen to live in is always secondary to their loyalty to other Jews and to the international nation of Israel. German Jews, at the time of the Russian Revolution, were accused of being more loyal to Russian Jews than to the nation of Germany in which they lived. That pattern has always been the same. American Jews today are accused of being more loyal to Israel than to America. During Weimar, nearly all of the American spies for the Soviet Union were Jews, Algerhis and Whittaker Chambers being notable exceptions. Of the 11 American scientists who built the atomic bomb during World War II, 10 were Jews, and the only non-Jew, Enrico Fermi, had a Jewish wife. All had left Europe for America after the Nazis took control, so they were only nominally American. Their loyalty was to the international Jewish nation, not to the country they lived in, America. The headquarters of world Jewry at the time was Soviet Russia. Russia's atomic bomb scientists were also Jews. The head of the Soviet atomic bomb project was Solomon Abrahamovich Rybak, a Jew. Atomic bomb development everywhere was totally in the hands of Jews. It should have been anticipated that American atom bomb secrets would be passed to the Jewish scientists in Russia, and that is exactly what happened. Top-secret atomic bomb technological innovations worked out at the Manhattan Project in America were in the hands of Russian Jewish scientists in mere days or weeks afterwards. The information simply passed through the well-established international Jewish networks to their fellow Jewish scientists in Russia. All of the atomic spies without exception were Jews, with obvious Jewish names: Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, George Goval, David Greenglass, Morris Cohen, et al. Jewish spying for Russia was actually far more extensive than was reported. Even Jews in the movie industry cooperated. The film director Irving Lerner was caught photographing the cyclotron at University of California, Berkeley in 1944. He was subsequently blacklisted. British Jewish scientists were also a part of the International Atomic Spy Network. But Jewish spying for Russia was by no means limited to atomic secrets. Jewish spies infiltrated every branch of the American government during the Roosevelt administration. The British government too, and fed secret information of every kind back to Russia via these Jewish information networks. Even the Jewish Undersecretary of the Treasury, Harry Dexter White, Wise, was a Soviet secret agent. His boss, Henry Morgenthau, Junior Secretary of the Treasury, was also Jewish. White died before he could be prosecuted, else he would surely have gone to prison. White was the first head of the International Monetary Fund and helped set up the World Bank, both of which have since been controlled exclusively by Jews. Jews are still spying on the United States and passing secret information through these Jewish networks, but now for Israel instead of the Soviet Union. This issue of doubtful loyalty as well as their aggressive business and financial exploitation of their host populations has been the root of most of the anti-Semitism over the centuries. History of the expulsion of Jews. Sooner or later, Jews have invariably provoked the hostility and hatred of their host populations, causing the host populations to turn on them. Over the course of the past 2,000 years, Jews have been expelled from virtually every country in Europe and the Middle East at least once and in some cases, multiple times. They were expelled from the German states 5 times, the last time by the Nazis, from parts of Italy 5 times, from France 4 times, from England 3 times. England expelled the Jews in 1290 and kept them out for 300 years until Oliver Cromwell let them back in. The Jewish Dutch financiers, Manasseh ben Israel and Moses Carville, financed Cromwell's campaign to oust King Charles I. After King Charles was beheaded and Cromwell became Lord Protector of England, Cromwell opened England's doors to the Jews again. They quickly rose in power and in 1694 they created the Bank of England for the purpose of lending money to the Crown. Jews still control the Bank of England today. Even in countries where they were permitted to reside, they were usually subjected to sharp restrictions. For example, Jews could not own land in most European countries, belong to guilds or enter the universities. In Germany and Russia, they were not allowed to travel without special permission. In the worst cases over the centuries, they were periodically subjected to attacks and massacres. These expulsions and other measures taken against the Jews were actually defensive in nature, enacted to protect the host populations from exploitation by the Jews. Whenever such restrictions were eventually lifted, usually by some benevolent ruler who wanted to do the right thing, the Jews immediately took advantage and began their exploitative practices again, until the governments felt it necessary to impose new restrictions on them. Either that, or to expel them from their country entirely. The Nazi expulsion of the Jews from Germany, beginning in 1934, was by no means a unique event in history, and it was done for the same reasons as all the other expulsions. Their most recent expulsion was from all of the Middle Eastern countries in 1948 as a result of the creation of the Jewish state in Palestine and the Arab/Israeli conflict that followed. The most recent exodus of the Jews has been the flight from Russia to Israel and the United States, beginning in 1960 to the present. The exodus from Russia was the result of having lost their power under Stalin, after which the Russian people turned on them. There has got to be a reason that so many disparate peoples have turned against the Jews. Virtually everywhere in the world Jews have lived. This cannot be attributed to simple bigotry, xenophobia, or to mindless prejudice. Obviously, the Jews bring it on themselves. In his book, L'Antisemitisme son history et ses causes, published in France in 1894, noted Jewish author, Bernard Lazare, reaches the following conclusion: if this hostility, even aversion, had only been shown towards the Jews at one period and in one country, it would be easy to unravel the limited causes of this anger. But this race has been on the contrary an object of hatred to all the peoples among whom it has established itself. It must be therefore, since the enemies of the Jews belong to the most diverse races, since they lived in countries very distant from each other, since they were ruled by very different laws, governed by opposite principles, since they had neither the same morals, nor the same customs, since they were animated by unlike dispositions which did not permit them to judge of anything in the same way, it must be therefore that the general cause of anti-Semitism has always resided in Israel, the Jewish people, and not in those who have fought against Israel. Professor Jesse H. Holmes, writing in The American Hebrew, stated the following with regard to these expulsions of Jews: it can hardly be an accident that antagonism directed against the Jews is to be found pretty much everywhere in the world where Jews and non-Jews are associated. And as the Jews are the common element of the situation, it would seem probable, on the face of it, that the cause will be found in them, rather than in the widely varying groups which feel this antagonism. It is only common sense that for a people to be so universally hated, in whatever society they live, consistently throughout history, they are doing something to provoke it. The two centers of Jewish world power are now the United States, with approximately 5.2 million Jews, and Israel, with approximately 5.8 million Jews. Previously, Russia was the center of Jewish power, from which Jews tried spreading their communist ideology around the world using the power of the Russian army. Today, they use the economic and military power of the United States to spread their slightly modified ideology, now of democracy, around the world, which is the reason the United States has been involved in endless war for the past several decades. The new Jewish ideology in the United States, which is behind our interventionist foreign policy, is the so-called neoconservative movement. Neoconservatism is not conservative at all, but has its roots in the same old Jewish ideology of communism. The neoconservative movement in America is a replication of the Russian Comintern, which attempted to spread communism throughout Western civilization, and indeed, the world. Both movements, that is the Comintern and neoconservatism, are Jewish movements. Jews control America today, as they controlled the Soviet Union in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. Since the creation of the Jewish state of Israel, Jews have become more powerful than ever in the world. They now have a state of their own from which to fulfill the interests of the international Jewish nation. They have infiltrated every branch of the American government to the extent that they literally control this country, and they use the power of the United States to further the interests of the international nation of Israel, including funneling billions of American taxpayer dollars into Israeli coffers. Chapter 8: Jews in Weimar Germany. After the 1848 revolution that swept Europe, most of the traditional restrictions placed on Jews were lifted. Germany was particularly generous to the Jews, giving them the same rights as all other citizens. With all restrictions lifted, Jews began to prosper in Germany at a rapid rate. In the rising prosperity that followed Germany's consolidation into a single state in 1871, Jews prospered to a far higher degree than other Germans. Their remarkable ability to work together for the achievement of all Jews at the expense of the Gentile host population, gave them a strong competitive edge. Kaiser Wilhelm kept them out of government for the most part, so they did not acquire significant political power under the Kaiser. That was to change with the advent of the Weimar Republic, which followed World War I and the Kaiser's abdication, when restrictions barring Jews from civil service jobs were removed. East European Jews also began to flood into Germany at this time as the result of the turmoil in that region caused by the war, the Russian Revolution that followed, and the Russian Civil War following that. Large numbers of people wanted to move out of those dangerous areas and cross over into Germany through East Prussia, which bordered Russia. The head of German immigration and naturalization in the early period of the Weimar Republic happened to be Jewish, Herr Batt, who gave preference to Jews wanting to immigrate into Germany. At that same time, other European countries were still maintaining strict limits on Jewish immigration. These newcomers pouring over the East Prussian border spread out and joined other Jewish communities which tended to locate in Germany's larger cities. With the Kaiser now gone, and all bars against them lifted, Jews flooded into all government offices of the Weimar Republic. They also systematically invaded the professions and German institutions. Jews stick together as a race and always pull and shove each other up the ranks of institutions and organizations, and pull strings to ensure that members of their race are given first priority at student openings in major universities, and so forth. While Western Christians generally apply the test of ability in hiring and promotions, with considerations for ethnicity or religion being secondary, or of no consideration whatever, Jews choose their associates and subordinates primarily based on their being Jewish, and if they happen to have ability at the same time, well, that's okay too. In Jewish-controlled organizations in the Weimar Republic, the Gentile did not have a chance in competition for jobs or promotions. Jews always chose other Jews. This intense in-group cooperation and mutual assistance among Jews facilitated their rapid infiltration of every institution in Germany. The pattern has always been the same. Once a Jew obtains a position, he brings other Jews in, and in the process, gradually pushes the non-Jews out. It was not long until Jews dominated Weimar Germany. That same process is occurring in the United States today. Sir Arthur Bryant, a respected British historian, explained in his book, Unfinished Victory, 1940, that although Jews comprised less than 1% of the German population, they controlled 57% of the metal trade, 22% of grain, and 39% of the textile trade. More than 50% of the Berlin Chamber of Commerce was Jewish, as were an amazing 1,200 of the 1,474 members of the German Stock Exchange. German banking and finance was under the total control of Jews. It was estimated that during the Weimar Republic, the average income of Jews was 3 times that of non-Jews. In 1928 it was revealed that just 15 Jews had occupied 718 board positions between them. Of leading positions in industry there were 2 Jews for every non-Jew. Below is a comparison of the percentage of top positions in commerce held by Jews in various German cities during the Weimar period with the low percentage of Jews in blue-collar jobs. Percentage of Jews in top positions in commerce: Berlin 49.4%, Frankfurt 48.9%, Cologne 49.6%, Breslau 57.1%. Percentage of Jews in blue-collar jobs: 2.4%, 1.9%, 2.9%, 1.8%. The political influence of the Jews in the Weimar Republic was enormously out of proportion to their numbers in the population. Of the Social Democratic Party's 39 representatives, 38 were Jews. The membership of the Workers' Educational Institutes were 81% Jewish. Of the 29 legitimate theaters in Berlin, 23 had Jewish directors. In 1931, of 144 film scripts made into movies, 119 were written by Jews, and 77 were produced by Jews. Not less than 75% of all plays were written by Jews. Joseph E. Bell wrote in the journal Sneer Zukunft, on February 3, 1929, "The share of Jews in the film industry is so decisive that a very slight percentage is left available for non-Jewish undertakings. It gets worse. Of university teachers, in Berlin, in the field of medicine, 45% were Jewish, in Göttingen, 34% of mathematics professors were Jewish, 34% of medical professors were Jewish, 40% in the arts were Jewish, and 47% in law were Jews. In Breslau, in medicine, 45% Jewish, in law, 48% Jewish, in arts, 25% Jewish, in Königsberg, in arts, 7% Jewish, in law 14% Jewish, in medicine, 25% Jewish." In 1928, the percentages of lawyers who were Jewish, in Dartmouth 29%, Hamburg 26%, Stuttgart 26%, Düsseldorf 33%, Karlsruhe 36%, Büchen 60%, Frankfurt 64%, Stettin 36%, Berlin 66%. Percentage of doctors in private practice who were Jewish, 1,928, Wiesbaden 20%, Karlsruhe 26%, Cologne 27%, Mainz 30%, Gotha 31%, Büchen 36%, Berlin 52%. Percentage of doctors in Berlin hospitals who were Jewish, Mobit Hospital 56%, Friedrichshain Hospital 63%, and Nürnberg Hospital 52%. In his book Mein Leben als Deutscher, My Life as a German Jew, 1980, Dr. Nahum Goldman describes the phenomenal rise of German Jewry as follows. German Jewry, which found its temporary end during the Nazi period, was one of the most interesting and for modern Jewish history most influential centers of European Jewry. During the era of emancipation, that is in the second half of the 19th and in the early 20th century, it had experienced a meteoric rise. It had fully participated in the rapid industrial rise of Imperial Germany, made a substantial contribution to it and acquired a renowned position in German economic life. Seen from the economic point of view, no Jewish minority in any other country, not even that in America, could possibly compete with the German Jews. They were involved in large-scale banking, a situation unparalleled elsewhere, and, by way of high finance, they had also penetrated German industry. A considerable portion of the wholesale trade was Jewish. They controlled even such branches of industry which is in general not in Jewish hands. Examples are shipping or the electrical industry, and names such as Bern and Rathenau do confirm this statement. I hardly know of any other branch of emancipated Jewry in Europe or the American continent that was as deeply rooted in the general economy as was German Jewry. American Jews of today are absolutely as well as relatively richer than the German Jews were at the time, it is true. But even in America with its unlimited possibilities, the Jews have not succeeded in penetrating into the central spheres of industry, steel, iron, heavy industry, high finance, shipping, as was the case in Germany. Their position in the intellectual life of the country was equally unique. In literature, they were represented by illustrious names. The theatre was largely in their hands. The daily press, above all its internationally influential sector, was essentially owned by Jews or controlled by them. As paradoxical as this may sound today, after the Hitler era, I have no hesitation to say that hardly any section of the Jewish people has made such extensive use of the emancipation offered to them in the 19th century as the German Jews. In short, the history of the Jews in Germany from 1870 to 1933 is probably the most glorious rise that has ever been achieved by any branch of the Jewish people. Dr. Nahum Goldman further, according to Goldman, the majority of the German Jews were never fully assimilated and were much more Jewish than the Jews in other West European countries. What Goldman revealed, perhaps inadvertently, was that, precisely as the Nazis were saying, the Jews had taken control of most of Germany's institutions. Yet, they numbered less than 1% of the German population, and as Goldman also points out, they were never fully assimilated. This tiny elite were seen by the German people as aliens and not even German, yet, they literally ran the country. From this perspective, the rise of Hitler and the Nazi movement and its strong anti-Jewish sentiments become much easier to understand. Jewish propagandists today deny that the Jews were so powerful in Germany at that time. Dr. Nahum Goldman was an ardent Zionist who was denounced by the Nazis as a secret communist agent shortly after the Beer Hall Putsch. He was stripped of his German citizenship in 1935 and later emigrated to the United States. He helped Rabbi Stephen Wise establish the World Jewish Congress and became one of the more active purveyors of sensational, but false, tales of Nazi atrocities against the Jews. Jews undermine German culture. The Jews in Weimar Germany used their dominance in theater, film and newspapers to ridicule traditional German culture and German ideals. Christianity was also targeted for ridicule. That process is now occurring in the United States. This was a period when Berlin gained an international reputation for decadence, debauchery and pornography, as depicted in the Broadway musical and later movie, Cabaret, for example. Germany during the Weimar Republic underwent a virtually. The movie Cabaret typified the decadent life of Weimar Berlin, unparalleled period of social and cultural upheaval, to a great extent, a result of the disillusionment over losing the war and the unjust peace treaty which followed. Germans began to question the meaning of life. In Weimar's early years, Germany was a society which had been cut loose from its traditional cultural moorings and set adrift. The old norms and the old rules of social behavior didn't seem to apply anymore. The war also produced a similar result in England and America, though to a much lesser extent, causing a sort of social malaise, as manifested in the so-called lost generation. The Jews used this climate of cultural uncertainty and loss of confidence among the German people to undermine and destroy what remained of the traditional German culture. Homosexuality and lesbianism were openly flaunted during the Weimar years. Debauchery in Weimar Germany. To make matters worse, Germany experienced a runaway inflation in 1923 which nearly destroyed the German economy. During the inflation, a loaf of bread cost 4 billion marks. The middle class was wiped out, their life savings gone. People starved. Murder and violence were rampant, including sexual murder, or lustmord, which became a sensation in Weimar's tabloids. Women from once respectable families could be seen prostituting themselves, their daughters, and even their sons on the streets of Berlin in order to survive. In the eyes of the world, Weimar Berlin became the epitome of decadence. Women dressed like men and flaunted their lesbian lovers. Nudity was everywhere. The very word Weimar conjured up images of cabarets, cross-dressers, open homosexuality and prostitution. Berlin, with other German cities not far behind, became a mecca of scandal, moral degradation and nudity. Jewish control of the news, information, and entertainment industries was the perceived cause of this breakdown in public morals. It was well established that Jews controlled prostitution and pornography, as well as the white slave trade, during the Weimar years. To use the language of today, the Nazis were socially conservative, even puritanical in outlook, and saw themselves as the defenders of traditional, conservative, Christian, Volkish German values. They denounced the licentiousness which had taken root in the country, and attributed it to Jewish influences. Mild debauchery was the principal cause of the Nazi crackdown that followed. Adolf Hitler wrote about it in Mein Kampf. One needed only to look at the posters announcing the hideous productions of the cinema and theater, and study the names of the authors who were highly lauded there in order to become permanently adamant on Jewish questions. Here was a pestilence, a moral pestilence from which the public was being infected. It was worse than the Black Plague of long ago. And in what mighty doses this poison was manufactured and distributed. Naturally, the lower the moral and intellectual level of such an author of artistic products, the more inexhaustible his fecundity. Sometimes it went so far that one of these fellows, acting like a sewage pump, would shoot his filth directly in the face of other members of the human race. It was a terrible thought, and yet it could not be avoided, that the greater number of Jews seemed specially designed by nature to play this shameful part. The fact that 9/10 of all the smutty literature, artistic tripe and theatrical banalities, had to be charged to the account of people who formed scarcely 1% of the nation, that fact could not be gainsaid. It was there. It had to be admitted. The Jewish influence in all of this civil discord in Germany was plain for anyone to see. A great majority of the Jews were communists, which posed a mortal threat to the average German. The German people were fully aware of what had been happening in Russia at the hands of the Bolshevik Jews. Additionally, due to the rampant inflation, for it literally did take a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread, the only people who were able to buy either property or goods were those who could obtain money from outside the country, which, in most cases meant the Jews. In 1914, a German mark was valued at around 25 cents of American money. In 1923, 4 million marks equaled 25 cents. During this period many German families were forced to sell everything they had in order to survive. Upper-class Jews with foreign financial connections were able to buy up much of Germany's material wealth for incredibly low prices. So-called Jewish carpetbaggers were everywhere, consuming the nation like parasites consume a cadaver. All classes of Jews in Germany advanced themselves during the war years while the economic condition of ethnic Germans steeply declined. Germany had narrowly avoided a Bolshevik takeover of the country similar to that which had occurred in Russia, saved from this fate, as it were, by the Freikorps, or private militias comprised of soldiers and officers who had recently returned from the front. Nevertheless, from the beginning of the Weimar Republic, a tense bifurcation of political power existed between the communists on the one hand, and right-wing political parties on the other, including the National Socialists. As Germany staggered under the weight of economic chaos, that is, inflation, followed by depression, the Jewish communists made a relentless, concerted effort to take political control. Under the banner of communism and through control of finance, two heads of the same dragon, the Jews threatened to take complete control of the country. An editorial in the Daily Mail of London of July 10, 1933 stated, "The German nation was rapidly falling under the control of its alien elements." In the days of the pre-Hitler regime there were 20 times as many Jewish government officials in Germany as has existed before the war. Why? Israelites of international attachments were insinuating themselves into key positions in the German administrative machine. Adolf Hitler said, if the question is still asked why National Socialism combats the Jewish element in Germany so fanatically, the answer can only be, because National Socialism wishes to establish a real community of the people. Since we are National Socialists, we cannot permit an alien race to impose itself upon our working people as their leaders. Chapter 9 Hitler and National Socialists Rise to Power. After World War I, Adolf Hitler, still an army corporal, joined the German Workers' Party, DAP, in Munich. Though young and inexperienced, he proved himself a mesmerizing public speaker with a mature grasp of the issues of the day, and soon became the party's chairman. Hitler burned with indignation and anger over Germany's humiliation in losing the war and over the vindictive and merciless Versailles Treaty imposed upon Germany afterwards. He dedicated his life to resurrecting Germany's position in the world. Hitler worked hard to build up the party and saw it as a means of acquiring political power. By now, he had become convinced that the Jews were the primary cause of most of Germany's troubles. Opposition to communism and to Jewish control of Germany became part of the German Workers' Party's political platform. In a speech at a public meeting on February 24, 1919, Hitler laid out his 25 points for the reclamation of Germany for the German people. These 25 points became, and remained, the platform, or goals, of the National Socialist Party. As can be seen, the platform was both nationalistic and socialistic in nature, hence National Socialism, with the goal of strengthening Germany and resurrecting the German people again. Hitler stressed the principle that the common weal comes before individual welfare. Hitler, seated on the right, and fellow soldiers during World War I. The dog was named Fuchs and was actually Hitler's pet during the war. The 25 points of the National Socialist Party. 1. The unity of all German-speaking peoples in one country. 2. The abolition of the Treaty of Versailles. 3. Land and colonies to feed Germany's population, Lebensraum. 4. Only Germans can be citizens. No Jew can be a German citizen. 5. People in Germany who are not citizens, that is Jews, must obey special laws for foreigners. 6. Only German citizens can vote, be employed or hold public office. 7. Citizens, that is ethnic Germans, are entitled to a job and a decent standard of living. If this cannot be achieved, foreigners, with no rights as citizens, should be expelled. 8. No further immigration of non-Germans must be allowed. All non-German foreigners, which included the Jews, who have come to Germany since 1914 must be expelled. 9. All citizens have equal rights and duties. 10. The first duty of a citizen is to work. 11. All payments to unemployed people should end. 12. All profits made by profiteers during the war must be confiscated, a swipe at the Jews. 13. Nationalization of trusts. Meaning, the big corporations. 14. Large companies must institute profit-sharing plans with their employees. 15. Old age pensions must be increased. 16. Public help for small businesses, large department stores must be closed down, another swipe at the Jews. 17. Property reform to give small farmers their land. 18. An all-out battle against criminals, profiteers, etc. who must be punished by death. 19. Reform of the law to make it more German. 20. Improve education so that all Germans can get a job. 21. Improve people's health by making a law for people to participate in sports. 22. Abolition of the professional army, and a new people's army in its place. 23. German newspapers must be free of foreign, Jewish, influence. 24. Freedom of religion. 25. Strong central government with unrestricted authority. Among the 25 points was a demand for scrapping the Versailles Treaty and the return to Germany of territories taken away by the treaty. Germany had no moral obligation to abide by the treaty, because it had been imposed upon Germany by coercion, by force. Any two men will agree that if one man forces another man into slavery by threat of violence or death, the enslaved man has no moral obligation to remain a slave. Anyone would agree that as soon as the enslaved man has the power or the means of escaping his enslavement, he has a moral right to do so. This same moral right also applies to nations. Germany had no moral or legal obligation to remain enslaved by the Versailles Treaty. Hitler demanded the right of self-determination for all Germans, according to President Wilson's 14 points, which meant the right of Germans outside Germany to be incorporated into the German Reich. This would include the Sudeten Germans, as well as the return of the city of Danzig, and the annexation of Austria, all of whom wished to join Germany. He called for the restoration of equal rights for Germans as compared to those of other European peoples. Hitler also demanded the right of Germany to acquire land for Germany's surplus populations, referred to in other speeches and writings as Lebensraum. Britain had solved her surplus population problem by emigration to the colonies, that is North America, Australasia, and South Africa. Germany faced the same problem and desperately needed more space for her dense population. The 25 points also set the goal of wresting control of German institutions back from the Jews and of sidelining the Jews as a force of power and control in Germany. Toward the goal of creating a German state for the German people, Hitler called for the revocation of the citizenship of all those who did not have German blood, meaning the Jews primarily, and actually expelling all the East European Jews who had entered the country since the war. Revoking the citizenship of Jews would have the effect of sharply limiting the rights of Jews and subsequently, the power of Jews. The East European Jews who had entered Germany beginning in November 1914 were conspicuously non-German aliens, and almost all of them were revolutionary communists and the primary troublemakers in Germany. Yet, with the help of German Jews, they had quickly insinuated themselves into influential positions throughout Germany. Hitler also called for the destruction of Germany's bondage of interest, which was another swipe at the Jews. He wanted to create for Germany a new financial system, which, in fact, he did after becoming Chancellor later on. In this landmark speech, Hitler also announced that the National Socialist Party, DAP, would be renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party NSDAP, or Nazi, as the acronym would appear in German. Thereafter, criticism of the Jews became a regular feature of Hitler's speeches. He blamed them for the inflation, the unemployment, the political instability, and for losing the war. But more significantly, he tied the Jews in Germany to internationalism, accusing them of placing their first loyalty to international Jewry. The largest communist party in Europe was in Germany, which had a 78% Jewish membership. Germany was under the greatest threat of any European country of succumbing to Jewish, Bolshevik domination and control, and had, in fact, been specifically targeted by the Comintern as the next domino to fall. Had that come to pass, a bloody red terror similar to that which was still going on in Russia would surely have followed. It was against this background that Hitler and the National Socialists launched their program to push Jews out of controlling position in Germany. The Jews were not only in complete control of Russia, they were also very powerful in Britain, France, and the United States, as well as in Germany. They controlled international banking and finance, they controlled the press and the information media, and they controlled movie making. Throughout Europe, especially in Germany, as well as in Britain and the United States, the Jews saw the upstart Hitler and his fledgling National Socialist Party as a developing threat to their power and control in Germany. After Hitler's speech during which he presented his 25 points, the Jews began a virulent, international propaganda war against him and the Nazi Party. This propaganda campaign continued relentlessly, growing ever more vitriolic, throughout the Nazi reign. Moreover, it continues even to this day, though the Nazis are long gone. The Nazi Party continued to grow and attract new members. At a public rally held in Munich on October 30, 1923, Hitler called for an end of the leftist Weimar Republic, which he declared was under the control of the Jews. During this rally, he called for a march on Berlin to rid the government of communism and the Jews. A few days later, on November 8, 1923, Hitler held a rally at a Munich beer hall and proclaimed a revolution. The following day he led 2,000 armed brown shirts in an attempt to take over the Bavarian government in Munich. He was joined by a hero of the First World War, General Erich Ludendorff, along with Ludendorff's conservative nationalistic followers. Once they had taken Munich, Hitler and Ludendorff planned to use the Bavarian capital as a base of operations against the national government in Berlin. It turned out that their ambitions exceeded their power and the attempted putsch was easily put down by the police. Hitler and Ludendorff were then arrested for treason, though Ludendorff was immediately acquitted due to his reputation as a war hero, but Hitler went on to trial. The judge in the trial, as it turned out, was sympathetic to Hitler's views, and he permitted Hitler to use the trial as a propaganda forum, which Hitler took full advantage of. Though Hitler was convicted, he received a light sentence of 5 years, to be served at Landsberg prison in comfortable conditions. He only served 8 months as it turned out, and he used those 8 months very profitably. During his stay at Landsberg, with the help of Rudolf Hess, Hitler wrote his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book eventually sold 10 million copies and made Hitler a wealthy man. In Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out his views for the future of the German people. He blamed the Jews for Germany's troubles, and also for most of the troubles in the world, as manifested by the murderous regime in Russia, their leadership in the unsuccessful German Communist Revolution of 1918-19, and also the Jewish communist takeover of Hungary in 1919. Hitler made it plain that he considered the Jews to be the German nation's true enemy. They had no culture of their own, he averred, but perverted existing cultures such as Germany's with their parasitism. As such, he said, they were not a race, but an anti-race. Another main idea put forward in Mein Kampf, an idea previously presented in his 25 points, was that if Germany was to survive as a state it must acquire Lebensraum, or living space, for its overcrowded population. This, he said, would be found in the East, that is, in Russia and the Ukraine, which was now ruled by Jewish communists. Without consideration of traditions and prejudices, he wrote, Germany, must find the courage to gather our people and their strength for an advance along the road that will lead this people from its present restricted living space to new land and soil, and hence also free it from the danger of vanishing from the earth or of serving others as a slave nation. The geopolitical concept of Lebensraum, living space, was not original with Hitler. It had been advocated by others in Germany long before Adolf Hitler came to power, including Karl Hochhofer, Sir Harford Mackinder of Britain, and Friedrich Ratzel. It was Ratzel who coined the term Lebensraum. In 1871, Lebensraum was a popular political slogan during the unification of Germany as a single nation-state. At that time, Lebensraum usually meant finding additional living space by adding colonies, following the examples of the British and French empires. But Germany's colonies had been taken away after the Great War by the Versailles Treaty, and without colonies to which excess populations could be exported, Germany would have to consider other possibilities. Germany was one of the most densely populated countries in Europe and its population was increasing rapidly. Finding Lebensraum was seen as a necessity. The obvious territory for Germany to expand into was always in the East, as Hitler explained in Mein Kampf. In an era when the earth is gradually being divided up among states, some of which embrace almost entire continents, we cannot speak of the world power in connection with a formation whose political mother country is limited to the absurd area of 500,000 square kilometers. The East was thinly populated compared to the rest of Europe, and Germans, as well as the rest of Europe, thought about it somewhat as Americans thought about the Wild West. In 1926, Hans Grimm's book Volkan Roma, People Without Space, was published. This book became a classic on Germany's need for space, and the book's title soon became a popular National Socialist slogan. Neither Hitler nor anyone else in Germany ever considered expansion into Western Europe. Hitler explains the logic of finding Lebensraum in the East in order to enlarge Germany within Europe, rather than to seek colonies elsewhere. For it is not in colonial acquisitions that we must see the solution of this problem, but exclusively in the acquisition of a territory for settlement, which will enhance the area of the mother country, and hence not only keep the new settlers in the most intimate community with the land of their origin, but secure for the total area those advantages which lie in its unified magnitude. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. Hitler justified a German expansion into Russian territory by pointing out that the Soviet Union was now run by Jews who had killed Russia's best people, the majority of whom were of German blood. The Tsars of Russia were of German blood, as were most of the aristocracy. For centuries Russia drew nourishment from this Germanic nucleus of its upper leading strata. Today it can be regarded as almost totally exterminated and extinguished. It has been replaced by the Jew. Impossible as it is for the Russian by himself to shake off the yoke of the Jew by his own resources, it is equally impossible for the Jew to maintain the mighty empire forever. He himself is no element of organization, but a ferment of decomposition. And the end of Jewish rule in Russia will also be the end of Russia as a state. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. Lebensraum, in Nazi ideology, meant the settlement of German farmers in the area east of Germany. The Slavic population was to be pushed out as German farmers moved in. This was to be a reprise of America's expansion to the west, during which the Indians had been pushed out. It also parallels modern-day Israel's Jewish settlement of Palestine, where the Palestinian owners of the land are pushed out to make way for Jewish settlers. The Nazi theory of Lebensraum became Germany's foreign policy during the Third Reich. Once released from prison, Hitler decided that the best way to take power was by constitutional means, that is, by winning elections. A coup or putsch, similar to the one he had just been imprisoned for, was impracticable, he decided. He began to campaign throughout the country, during which he was received enthusiastically by the German people. As the campaign progressed, he drew larger and larger crowds. With his spellbinding oratory, he called for the German people to resist the yoke of the Jews and communism, and to create a new Germany for the German people. He asserted that the Jews were Germany's biggest enemy, accusing them of trying to take over the country to turn it into another Soviet Union, as they had done in Russia, in Hungary briefly, and as they had tried to do in Germany. In one speech, he said, the Jews' ultimate goal is the denaturalization, the promiscuous bastardization of other peoples, the lowering of the racial level of the highest peoples as well as the domination of his racial mishmash through the extirpation of the Volkisch intelligentsia and its replacement by the members of his own people. It is the Jews in America today who are behind multiculturalism, open immigration, racial mixing, the denial of the right to freedom of association, etc. Their intent today is to undermine the once dominant position of white, European Americans, and to reduce them to an ethnic minority in their own country. Hitler's words above is a description of what is going on in America today. In campaigning for votes, Hitler deliberately appealed to farmers and white-collar voters in small towns who were conservative and nationalistic by nature. They were the demographic group who were most antagonistic towards the leftist Weimar Republic. In the election held in September 1930, the Nazi Party won 18% of the votes cast. Suddenly the Nazis were a force to be reckoned with. In 1932, Hitler ran for president and won 30% of the national vote, forcing a runoff election between himself and Paul von Hindenburg. Von Hindenburg won the runoff election, but Hitler was not far behind in votes cast. Hitler agreed to enter a coalition government, and in January 1933, von Hindenburg, who was president of Germany, appointed Hitler to be the chancellor. This election put an end to the Jewish-controlled Weimar Republic, and marked the beginning of the Third Reich. The election also marked the beginning of a virulent Jewish propaganda war against Germany and the Nazi leadership, and against Adolf Hitler in particular. As a result of this relentless smear campaign, no man in history has been so mischaracterized as Hitler. Despite his impressive accomplishments, he is held up today as the very personification of evil, a madman and a psychopath, demonically intent upon conquering. President Paul von Hindenburg appoints Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933. The world. As the decades have passed, this characterization has grown to mythic proportions, to the extent that for some he now serves as a modern surrogate for the devil of medieval times. But this image of Hitler does not square with the way in which he was described by international statesmen, reporters and other prominent people at that time, at least up until the beginning of World War II. Hitler was not only extremely popular with the German people, he was widely admired by political leaders throughout the world. Hitler received high praise from every quarter for all he was able to accomplish for Germany. When Hitler was elected Chancellor in 1933, he became the leader of a starving, defeated and demoralized people, the result of losing World War I, and almost miraculously raised them up again into a prosperous, well-fed, highly motivated, industriously advanced and highly successful nation. Moreover, he was able to do this in the short span of only 5 years. Franklin D. Roosevelt became President of the United States in 1933, at the same time that Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany. The economic problems FDR had to deal with in the United States were mild compared to those in Germany. Yet, by 1938, while Germany under Hitler was booming, the depression in the United States continued unchanged, with an unemployment rate that remained at 19%. The depression in the United States only ended when the war began. The German people adored Hitler and saw him as their redeemer. His unprecedented accomplishments also astonished the world. Hitler provided real leadership for the German nation after a long period of social malaise, and he motivated the German people to unprecedented heights of achievement in every field of endeavor. German industrial production grew spectacularly. Under his leadership Germany became a transformed nation wherein the German people were no longer the humiliated and broken mass he had inherited. An infectious feeling of excitement and expectancy had permeated the country, which extended even to Germans living outside the Reich. Ethnic Germans of Austria, Sudetenland, Danzig, etc. all wanted to join Germany and become a part of Third Reich. These amazing changes did not go unnoticed by prominent visitors to Germany. After a tour through the country in 1936, former Prime Minister of England David Lloyd George wrote an article for the London Daily Express, in which he said, "I have never met a happier people than the Germans, and Hitler is one of the greatest men. The old trust him, the young idolize him. It is the worship of a national hero who has saved his country." Another British leader, Viscount Rothermere, in Warnings and Predictions, March 1939, wrote this about Hitler: "He has a supreme intellect. I have known only to other men to whom I could apply such distinction, Lord Northcliffe and Lloyd George. If one puts a question to Hitler, he gives an immediate, brilliant clear answer. There is no human being living whose promise on important matters I would trust more readily. He believes that Germany has a divine calling and that the German people are destined to save Europe from the revolutionary attacks of communism. He values family life very highly, whereas communism is its worst enemy. He has thoroughly cleansed the moral, ethical life of Germany, forbidden publication of obscene books, and performance of questionable plays and films. No words can describe his politeness. He disarms men as well as women and can win both at any time with his conciliatory, pleasant smile. He is a man of rare culture. His knowledge of music, the arts and architecture is profound." Theodor Heuss, a liberal German politician who later served as President of the Federal Republic of Germany after World War II, said in the late 1930s, "He, Hitler, moved souls, the will to sacrifice, and great devotion, enthralling and enthusiastically inspiring everyone by his appearance." Even after the end of World War II, there were still those who could speak objectively of Hitler. Immediately after the war, future President of the United States, John F. Kennedy was hired by the Hearst newspaper chain and sent to Germany to travel around and report back on conditions there. Kennedy kept a diary which was recently published. In one diary entry he wrote, After visiting these two places, Berchtesgaden and the Eagle's Lair on Obersalzberg, you can easily understand how that within a few years Hitler will emerge from the hatred that surrounds him now as one of the most significant figures who ever lived. He had boundless ambitions for his country which rendered him a menace to the peace of the world, but he had a mystery about him in the way that he lived and in the manner of his death that will live and grow after him. He had in him the stuff of which legends are made. John F. Kennedy Prelude to Leadership, The European Diary of John F. Kennedy, Summer, 1945. No public figure could get away with expressing such sentiments. Today, General Leon de Grelle of the Waffen-SS was a highly educated Belgian political leader who joined the SS to help save Europe from communism, which he saw as an existential threat to Western, Christian civilization. The Waffen-SS was an all-volunteer force, made up of members from every European country. 1 million foreigners from all over Europe voluntarily joined the SS simply because they believed in what Hitler was trying to achieve. The Waffen-SS was the first truly European army ever to exist, and it came into being to save Europe from the communist menace. De Grelle was an intellectual, a natural leader, a devout Catholic and a prolific writer, and before the war, he had been personally acquainted with all the heads of state in Europe. He believed that Europe had a unique destiny and that it must unite. He also did all he could to avert a war in Europe. But once the war began, he became a soldier in the life and death struggle against the communist enemy, the USSR. He joined the Waffen-SS as a private, but due to his remarkable abilities he was promoted rank by rank up to the rank of general. De Grelle had only the greatest admiration for Hitler. He wrote after the war from his refuge in Spain, "Hitler was the greatest statesman Europe has ever known. History will prove that when whipped-up emotions have died down. He was more matter-of-fact, generally more unfolded than Napoleon. Napoleon was more of a vanquishing, empire-founding Frenchman than a true European. Hitler, in his being a man of his time, dreamed of an enduring, just, honest Europe, unified by the initiative of the victor. A Europe, however, in which each ethnic group could develop according to their merits and accomplishments. The proof of this is that he offered Pétain his hand. Just as Bismarck knew how to outgrow Prussia and become a German, so Hitler soon changed from being a German to being a European. At an early stage he disconnected himself from imperialistic ambition. SS General de Grelle. Without any difficulty he began to think of himself as a European and initiated the creation of a Europe in which Germany, like Prussia in Bismarck's time, was to be the foundation stone. Some comrades of the Führer might still have been short-sighted pan-Germanists. But Hitler had the genius, the right scale, the absence of bias and the necessary vision to accomplish the terrific task. He had an authority, not to be found a second time in the history of the continent. His success would have established wealth and civilization of Europe for centuries, probably forever. Hitler's plans for Europe would have meant a blessing for us all. Chapter 10 National Socialism versus Communism. German National Socialism has usually been characterized as a right-wing ideology while communism is said to occupy the extreme left of the socio-political spectrum. This is the traditional view. But there are those today who say that Hitler's obsessive hatred of communism was disingenuous because German National Socialism was essentially no different from communism. Both were totalitarian socialist creeds. But this is a superficial observation, and the terms, right and left, are insufficient to describe the two systems. It is true that National Socialism contained aspects of socialism, as its name implied, but the differences between National Socialism and communism were profound. The most obvious difference was that National Socialism supported the concept of private property and a market economy, while communism abolished private property and the government controlled the economy through central planning. Under National Socialism the means of production was for the most part in private hands, albeit guided by the state. Under communism all private property, including farmland, manufacturing, or the means of production, and even private housing, were seized by the state. The only similarity between the two systems was that both were totalitarian in nature, though, between the two, National Socialism was considerably more benign. Under National Socialism, the private rights of citizens were respected and protected, while under communism there were no private rights. Hitler had this to say about the meaning of socialism for Germany, as printed in an article in the UK's Guardian, Sunday Express, December 28, 1938. Socialist I define from the word, social meaning in the main social equity. A socialist is one who serves the common good without giving up his individuality or personality or the product of his personal efficiency. Our adopted term socialist has nothing to do with Marxian socialism. Marxism is anti-property, true socialism is not. Marxism places no value on the individual, or individual effort, or efficiency. True socialism values the individual and encourages him in individual efficiency, at the same time holding that his interests as an individual must be in consonance with those of the community. All great inventions, discoveries, achievements were first the product of an individual brain. It is charged against me that I am against property, that I am an atheist. Both charges are false. Adolf Hitler. The two systems were also different in their aims. National Socialism under Adolf Hitler was a revolutionary movement in defense of Western, Christian civilization, while communism was a revolutionary movement dedicated to its destruction. Harold Cox, Member of Parliament in Britain at the time, and a classical liberal scholar, wrote, What socialists, communists, want is not progress in the world as we know it, but the destruction of that world as a prelude to the creation of a new world of their own imagining. Their ethical outlook is the direct reverse of that which has inspired all great religions of the world. And they deliberately make their appeal to the passions of envy, hatred and malice. Harold Cox. The communist Jews who took control of Russia did their utmost to destroy the traditional Christian culture of Russia, and they murdered upwards of 40 million of Russia's best people. It has been said that the average IQ for Russia was lowered several points by this slaughter of the intelligentsia and all the other successful, achieving people in Russia. Through their communist international Comintern, they intended to do the same to all of Europe. The long-term goal of international Jewish communism, which had established its base in Russia, was to destroy the existing political regimes throughout Europe, and replace them, one by one, with Soviet republics on the Russian model. Once in power, they intended the obliteration of the possessing classes, that is, to kill them, as they had done in Russia. Europe had every reason to shudder in horror at the prospect of a communist takeover. National Socialism, Nazism, developed after 1918 as a counter-movement to the Bolshevik Revolution, and to a lesser extent, against the democratic parliamentary system, as manifested in the Weimar Republic. In an article in the Nazi newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, May 11, 1933, soon after becoming Chancellor, Hitler wrote, "For 14 or 15 years I have continually proclaimed to the German nation that I regard it as my task before posterity to destroy Marxism, and that is no empty phrase but a solemn oath which I shall follow as long as I live. I have made this confession of faith, the confession of faith of a single man, that of a mighty organization, National Socialism. I know now that even if fate were to remove me, the fight would be fought to the end. This movement is the guarantee for that. This for us is not a fight which can be finished by compromise. We see in Marxism the enemy of our people which we will root out and destroy without mercy. We must then fight to the very end those tendencies which have eaten into the soul of the German nation in the last 17 years, which have done us such incalculable damage and which, if they had not been vanquished, would have destroyed Germany. Bismarck told us that liberalism was the base maker of social democracy. I need not say here that social democracy is the base maker of communism. And communism is the forerunner of death, of national destruction, and extinction. We have joined battle with it and will fight it to the death. National Socialism. National Socialism did not spring fully formed out of Adolf Hitler's head alone, though he made enormous contributions to its formation. Its detractors, Jewish propagandists, characterized Nazi ideology as the shallow fantasies of bigoted psychopaths, but in fact, National Socialism was a coherent, well-grounded social philosophy worked out by highly regarded thinkers and scholars. Contrary to his popular image, Hitler, himself, was a thinker and a philosopher of first rank. History professor Lawrence Birkin of Ball State University in Indiana claims that Adolf Hitler was the most philosophical of all historical leaders. Hitler had a gift for presenting his message in an attractive, accessible form. Writes Birkin, the most attractive feature of Hitler's ideology was thus its optimism. It was not merely his mood but his message that carried an infectious excitement. He was a secular messiah proclaiming a Germanic version of the good news. The possibility of class reconciliation, the plans for a national revival, the identification of a universal enemy whose elimination would usher in the millennium, all stirred his audiences to the very depths. Hitler spoke the language of their Enlightenment philosophers, a language that had almost passed out of existence in the rarefied strata of the grand intelligentsia. National Socialism's intellectual roots grew out of the philosophical ideas of a variety of popular writers and thinkers of the 19th and early 20th centuries, including the following: Friedrich Nietzsche's theory of will to power, the components of which were achievement, ambition, and striving to reach the highest possible position in life. Nietzsche believed that will to power was the main driving force in man. Arthur de Gobineau's racialist theory of the Aryan master race. Gobineau was a French aristocrat, novelist, and man of letters who became famous for developing the racialist theory of the Aryan master race in his book, An Essay on the Inequalities of the Human Races 1855. Gobineau believed that the white race was superior to other races, manifested by its achievements in developing a civilized culture and in maintaining ordered government. He believed that race mixing would result in decline and chaos. Gobineau's views were by no means unusual at the time. They were generally shared by the entire white race. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, British author of books on political philosophy and natural science, Chamberlain generally supported Gobineau's ideas on the superiority of the Aryan race and also became an advocate of racial purity. He believed that the Teutonic peoples had profoundly influenced Western civilization, but that other European peoples had also done so. He included not just Germans, but Celts, Slavs, Greeks, Latins, and even Berbers from North Africa into the Aryan race. Richard Wagner's faith in destiny. Wagner, a friend of Nietzsche, developed the idea that the German people should have faith in their destiny for greatness. He also saw the Jew as a parasite on the host populations they lived amongst and the natural enemy of Germany. Gregor Johann Mendel's theory of genetics and heredity. Mendel was an Austrian scientist and Augustinian friar who was the founder of the science of genetics. He demonstrated that inheritance of certain traits in pea plants follow particular patterns. He developed the laws of inherited traits by experimenting on plants, which was then extrapolated to work the same in human beings. Alfred Plotz and Harvard professor Lothar Stoddard both espoused social Darwinism, which led to the development of the science of eugenics, or race cleansing. Eugenics was widely popular in the early decades of the 20th century, both in the United States and in Europe. The first International Congress of Eugenics in 1912 was supported by many prominent people, including its president Leonard Darwin, the son of Charles Darwin, honorary Vice President Winston Churchill, Alexander Graham Bell, et al., Karl Hochhofer,